In the capital of Arzia, the starting point of his great success was unfolding. Amanith Academy was a general education institution. It had been founded by the great Emperor Amanith in the past. It boasted an excellent faculty and efficient curriculum. All of it matched the institution's grand scale and the impressive buildings on site. Due to its long-standing history, many noble children wished to attend the academy, and to think that he, the second son of a rural noble, had become a teacher there. He was also expected to constantly build connections and eventually bring his family along. But just as he was thinking about all that, someone suddenly called him from behind. There was a group of workers making deliveries, asking where they should place the items. They saw the new teacher as just another rookie who was taking too long to move the luggage. Before he could say he was a teacher, they just threw the boxes into his arms and told him to place them somewhere else in the room, ignoring his protests the entire time. Once he finished organizing the teacher's desk, he could head to the next room. He couldn't understand why he was suddenly being forced to do labor on his very first day. On the way, he asked the men if the academy was undergoing renovations or something, and ended up finding out that the academy director's investment had failed. She had lost all her money there and the institution had gone bankrupt. This completely caught him off guard, as he hadn't heard anything about it despite working there. He explained that it was the first time he heard of this since being hired. Still, it didn't make sense to expect a day laborer to know every single detail. Before he could finally say he was a teacher, he hesitated again. That was because he saw someone who looked like a beggar lying on the school grounds. Judging by how no one said anything, he could even be a staff member. If that were the case, he'd just hand him the items and leave quickly. He approached the man and told him he should be lying around there. The man suddenly woke up and shouted when he saw the box in the protagonist's hands. That was because the book inside the box belonged to him, which left the protagonist confused. Both were stunned as the beggar turned out to be a teacher, but he just shouted that he was being robbed and made another man shout as well, because to them the newcomer had suddenly gone crazy, even though he wasn't a thief or a worker there. Even so, the men yelled at him, claiming he was stealing instead of doing his job. They had given him the box to carry, not to loot its contents. The teacher shouted for his book to be returned, even as the protagonist denied being a thief. After all, he was there to be a teacher, above all else. Eventually, the misunderstanding was somehow resolved. They said the announcement about the academy's suspension had been sent through the teleportation portal. There was no way a rural estate could have a teleportation portal like that. It had taken him half a month to get there after all. In any case, the royal family had recommended halting operations, so most of the students and teachers had ended up leaving. Still, there was no need to worry too much about these things. Some people remained, and it wasn't like everyone had gone bankrupt. Even so, looking at that teacher who resembled a beggar gave the opposite impression. He guided him to the teacher's office, which was a mess and reeked. The interior was basic, and the protagonist realized the bad smell was all that other teacher's fault. He hadn't even planned to steal anything, especially since everything there stank anyway. Still, he seemed pretty discouraged by the current state of the academy. Doing that to the teacher's office was a bit too much. The teacher didn't understand at first until he mentioned it was about the alcohol, and he said he was only drinking because it tasted good after all. That made the protagonist angry enough to smack the other teacher on the head. The teacher was shocked as he got hit so hard he looked like a lunatic. The house of Baron Drake, deep in the countryside, was only a barony in name. Even though it was technically a territory, it was nothing more than a small village. And it was rough land owned by a desperate and poor family. He had mobilized all of his connections and gone through many hardships to get the position. The contract period was about 3 years in total. If the terms weren't fulfilled, they would have to pay a massive penalty. This matter was extremely important for the survival of House Drake. That's why the protagonist now knew he was in trouble, especially regarding his father, as the school had gone bankrupt overnight. Or rather, the protagonist still wanted to believe there was hope. There were only 2 students and 2 other teachers left there now. Now that things had reached this point, he had to worry about the students. Maybe an heir from a prominent noble family had remained there. If that were the case, he might be able to build good connections with the students somehow. But contrary to that determination, the 2 students turned out not to be viable targets. The first student of the academy, Boris, had nowhere to return to. His village had vanished about 2 years ago. He was the son of a commoner. The other girl came from the kingdom of Aran to study abroad. Her name was Chloe. But that nation had fallen after last year's war, and now she was there. So this was how his life was meant to be, and the protagonist asked them not to worry. After all, he was a new teacher and wanted to show support during hard times. They didn't have anywhere else to go anyway, and at the very least, he could offer them a hug. Still, he grew curious about what they were working on. There was a kind of giant caterpillar on the table that they seemed to be raising, and they explained that it was their fencing teacher who was sleeping. At that moment, the teacher sat up and said that the headmistress was looking for the protagonist, and the children should return if the self-study period was over. He couldn't even believe he was truly a teacher with that kind of attitude, and wondered how the headmistress had hired such crazy people. At the very least, he could take a look with his own eyes and verify everything. He then finally met headmistress Anarel when he went to speak with her. The protagonist introduced himself as Aemon from the Drake Barony. He was going to assume the role of teacher, but he was a bit surprised by the headmistress. After all, she seemed rather normal even though she was an elf. But Anarel appeared to be reading in an uncommon language. It was the Elven language. Then she asked whether he thought it was better to find George or to steal slugs. Aemon was completely lost with the sudden question. He replied that stealing slugs, and she noted down 10 gold coins on slug clothes, to which the protagonist didn't know if this was some sort of bet, and Anarel denied it, saying that a noble elf would never take part in something so barbaric. Aemon laughed, thinking he was mistaken, but she confessed it was a slug race. Apparently, he had never heard of it, but it was gaining popularity among the elves. It was a special race where giant slugs climbed the world tree. They said they would host a competition, and she wanted to find a place to invest. At that moment, a few thoughts crossed Aemon's mind. The headmistress's investment had failed and she lost all her money and went bankrupt. Now the protagonist understood that she had placed all the operational expenses into the game. Anarel got flustered but claimed she could win and pay everything back. He snatched her magazine, questioning what exactly she was doing. Using the academy's operational funds to gamble was absurd. She didn't even deserve to be called headmistress, and yet Anarel was addicted to slug theft. If she could steal slugs and win, she earned 50 times the amount in cash. They said his chances of winning were low, but one couldn't judge the potential of a player after all. He could think about the future of the slug, but to Ammon, it was all just shocking. He didn't even try to think about the academy. If she wanted to gamble, she could do it with her own money. Instead, he crushed the magazine, shocking NRL, and asked her to give it up, saying he wouldn't tolerate her using the expenses on betting. NRL said she needed to win to investigate, and Ammon asked what she was talking about. She said it was about a dragon banana orchard. Dragon bananas were considered one of the highest quality crops. They took 3 years to sprout and 12 years to bear fruit. So cultivating those bananas required a great deal of time. That was by human standards, but if one waited just 15 years, they could offer more. NRL would earn 10 times the Academy's operational expenses. The average lifespan of elves was 1,000 years, which left Ammon frozen in shock. And he screamed that she truly was an idiot elf. Now he was certain he would escape that madness they called an academy, even if it meant ruining it. On another day, the protagonist visited the headmistress again in her office. She asked him what business he had with that idiot elf. Ammon realized she was still upset about the way he yelled at her, and said he had been thinking about the investment she had mentioned before. As headmistress of a prestigious academy, she couldn't have spent that much on racing, especially for her personal entertainment, but if she had put all that in, it must have been for a reason. Surely for the academy's future, and he hoped he was right about that. Anarel says yes, to which Ammon bowed and apologized, saying he had been foolish and hadn't realized it. She decided to let it slide this time as long as he would be more careful from now on. Ammon mentioned that he was somewhat intrigued by this so-called snail race. Since it was popular among wise elves who lived for so long, it must be important. Perhaps it was an elite form of culture that had been classified as art. That made Anarel quite happy, as they could watch a race together. Ammon didn't understand her sudden excitement, but ended up being dragged along. Elves were known as a sacred and beautiful race who lived in the forests, especially in the forest where the world tree was located. That image might have just been a rumor spread without knowing the truth, because the real elves were ridiculous gamblers who shouted and cursed. They didn't feel like elves at all. Ammon thought they were just crazy mountain bettas. Even Anarel was yelling, cheering for the snail she had bet on. So the protagonist asked when it would start, and she replied it had already begun. He didn't see any difference from the start, which left her offended. That was because from the elves' perspective, the snails were giving their all in the race. The race had already taken off, but from a human's point of view, Ammon was just lost. The elves were still screaming for the snails to hurry up. While he just wanted to go home and forget all of this. The participants all seemed to be in good condition that day. It was impossible to predict who would win. It looked like a constant battle. But even the narration sounded absurd from Ammon's point of view. He felt that in this match, no one could foresee what would happen. That was because they were so slow, he wasn't even sure the race would end that day. The elves were excited to see their participants showing the fruits of their training. The snail contestant Hana seemed different at the start and began falling behind. Some were cheering for her victory, but Ammon could only feel tired. A few hours earlier, Anarel had shown the protagonist the supermom who had won the previous time. Her glamorous appearance when she climbed the world tree was still fresh in his mind. Ammon asked if Anarel had won, and she went quiet, which made the answer obvious. After all, she had bet on a different snail this time. Even so, he now understood who the race participants were. Those numbers must have represented the betting odds. Anarel pointed out the thief snail and Jujiju, asking if he knew why she was watching them. But Ammon had no clue and just agreed with whatever she said. Even so, he mentioned that he liked another snail, and Anarel sighed. Because that one was a bad snail, it was the weakest in the race. And the protagonist said he should bet on it because it was sad being the weakest. Snail Hana was also a professional who had entered the world tree. That was after going through a pretty rigorous training, but she was still looked down on just for being the weakest. The reason she couldn't achieve good results was due to psychological factors. Therefore, Ammon believed that slowness could be overcome with hope and confidence. That would come directly from them, and with faith, they could make Hana a proud winner. On top of that, the odds were 500 to 1. If she really was a member of the Great Forest race, she had to place a big bet. And Anarel ended up agreeing that he was right. She decided she would bet on him that day. Suddenly, Ammon snapped back to the race. He heard people crying in frustration because they had such bad luck. Anarel was also crying, which made him worried. If she was that upset, it meant everything the school had was now gone. Ammon felt that everything was going according to plan anyway. Once the academy went bankrupt, he could return home without any obligations. He told the headmistress to calm down. There was no problem since things had ended like this. They would return to the academy and discuss future matters. But then it was announced that the winner of the race was indeed Snail Hana. That completely shocked him. Apparently only one person had predicted the victory. That's why Hana asked to shake hands with the one who believed in her. Whoever bet on Snail Hana could approach the world tree. Ammon let out a scream of shock, not understanding why the snail won a handshake. Still, Anarel acknowledged that it was a great honor to receive a handshake and a hug from the winner. The protagonist asked if she wasn't curious about the expression elves who die young, and she ended up brushing it aside so she wouldn't get too caught up in the conversation. Then Ammon asked what she would do with the 5,000 gold she had won. She replied that it should be used for operational expenses, which was good because he thought she was going to gamble again. After all, Anarol was still the headmistress of the prestigious Amonith Academy, and she asked if he really thought she was a gambling addict, to which Amon agreed. She wanted to make the current declining academy return to its former glory. Now that the support from the imperial family had been cut, they had to raise the operational funds, all with their own money to attract students and teachers. She hoped he could understand what she meant. Amon realized she was talking about investing the money again, which only made him scream that she truly was a crazy idiot elf, and she was shocked to be insulted once again. Amon agreed that the academy couldn't be rebuilt through conventional methods. Her investment idea wasn't wrong. What mattered was where to invest. They had to be careful this time, and then her dream could become reality. Then she presented the Bleton Temple construction project. She asked if it looked good enough, and he refused because it wasn't. Pointing to where the temple was built, there was a lack of infrastructure. Newly developed territories came with these kinds of problems. The pagans could become uncontrollable, and there might be opposition from the natives. She stammered, saying she understood, as expected from someone smart like him. Amon replied that he was flattered, but now needed to go to the bathroom. After stepping out, the protagonist went to invest 2 gold coins into the construction project. The current value of all Amon's possessions was a total of 3 gold coins. Even if the return was small for now, it was an investment for a promising future. There were many believers there, and since it was a temple dedicated to the god of war, the benefits would be abundant. Amon wasn't sure if she knew this, but he couldn't let her succeed. Enarel felt that he had hurried, but when he returned, he seemed better. And he laughed, saying it was just a little, but she quickly changed the subject. Since she couldn't understand, no matter how much she looked, it was better for him to handle it. Enarel handed something to Amon, saying this opportunity wouldn't exist if not for him. That was why she decided to entrust this to the professor. So apparently he would have to give her a chance to go bankrupt. Amon ended up pointing to a location he thought was good, and she was surprised. After all, it was about the king mango, and she asked if he even knew what that was. After calling her an idiot, he said it was a high-quality crop, just like the dragon banana, and he understood it took 2 years for the sprouts to grow, and 5 more years to bear fruit, but she still didn't understand what he meant. Regardless, Amon told her to think more about it, asking if the imperial family would really want a decaying academy to stay running. Since she hesitated, Amon said that was why he was against the dragon bananas. 15 years was too risky to put into practice. On the other hand, it took only 7 years for the king mango to grow. That was less than half the time it took for dragon bananas. They would only have to endure the pressure of the royal family for 7 years. Enarel had heard that 7 years was a long time for humans, and Amon agreed, which confused her, since he would suffer through it as well. Even so, Amon wondered if he would use this opportunity for that. After all, what he truly wanted was to leave that academy. Still, he hoped Enarel would protect it until the end. So this investment would be for her sake and the academy's as its director. That moved her emotionally, but Amon decided they should split the investment amount. They could invest 4,900 gold coins and keep 100 gold coins for costs. In total, the funds would be 5,000 gold coins as expected, and Amon clapped his hands while laughing. It was just as expected from the headmistress. In the end, it seemed like she had completely fallen for the words he said. At the King Mango farm, even the producers were surprised because they had heard about it. The next morning, in front of Amonith Academy, they found several letters. They were addressed to the investor of the temple construction project and the King Mango farm. Sometime later, the drunk teacher was wandering through the streets. As expected, the owner of the bar he visited was very good at picking drinks, until suddenly he stopped, not knowing why there was a dog sleeping there. He tossed some treats on the ground, which were actually just some papers, and he simply continued walking to the school all happy because he earned 10 good deed points. Now he could drink a bit more than before and still be seen as respectable. A little later, Enarel showed up to check on Amon, who was lying on the ground. She grew worried because for some reason he was sleeping on the floor. The elf couldn't understand why there were also rotten seafood lying around, and she started to think he might be starving. A little earlier, Amon had received 2 boxes in the mail. One included a letter from the head of the Royal Mango Farm to the investor. They thanked him for showing interest in the Royal Mango through a generous donation. They had developed a new cultivation method that allowed them to shorten the growth period. As a result, they planned to transfer a portion of the profits from the next 10 years to him. They wished to offer a sample of the Royal Mango that had been produced as a prototype. First and foremost, they were offering it to their generous investor. They hoped the brightest lights would illuminate the path ahead. The other letter was an announcement for investors in the Bleton Temple construction project. Due to a rebellion by opposing followers and widespread unrest in the territories, the construction of the temple had been canceled and the company responsible had gone bankrupt. They ended up apologizing to all the investors who had participated. Amon was shocked because the investment he hoped would succeed had failed, and the one that should have failed had succeeded. The protagonist collapsed in shock over his poor, lost money. A little while later, Enarel brought him a drink made from royal mango. It was made in the style of the elves using the prototype that had just arrived. Amon thanked her, even though he was a bit confused by what he was hearing. She just wished he had said he was hungry this whole time. Still, she handed him the drink, trying to make him feel better. After drinking it, Amon was amazed because it was actually delicious. He couldn't believe the royal mango business was on the verge of bankruptcy too. It had been a terrible mistake. His life really was falling apart after all. Then she said she would offer him a gold coin as a special bonus. He had played an important role in the snail race not long ago, and was also responsible for the success of the royal mango investment. Amon smiled and thanked her for the deposit. Enarel said that if it were up to her alone, she'd love to offer even more. But she couldn't spend the Academy's operating funds however she pleased. That was a shocking statement from someone who had dropped 10 gold on a single race. Either way, it wouldn't be easy to ruin the academy now that funding was secured. Aemon was stuck there for about 3 years anyway, so saving the academy at this point should be better than abandoning it. And he wondered how he would do that when none of the staff were mentally stable. A headmistress addicted to gambling, a drunk professor, and a lazy one. Aemon went out for a drink and sighed, not believing things had gotten to that point. The owner asked what brought a young man there in the middle of the day. He grumbled that he had barely secured the position, only to end up in trouble. His boss and even his coworkers were all absolute lunatics. The road ahead would be deeply complicated. That's when suddenly the drunk professor appeared and recognized Aemon. The protagonist was surprised because they had randomly met at the bar, and he hoped the man hadn't heard what he just said about them. The professor asked if he could sit with him for a while, assuming it was fine to sit next to someone who called him a lunatic. Now Aemon was sure he had heard everything from the start, so he commented that they hadn't even had the chance to properly introduce themselves. Aemon shook his hand and introduced himself, and the professor began to do the same. He was in charge of the magic class, but didn't even finish saying his name, Mario. That's because the protagonist had squeezed his hand so hard he pulled back with a scream. He couldn't believe his hand was almost crushed, even if Aemon hated him that much. Aemon didn't know what to say. He had just shaken his hand normally. Then he asked his full name, and he replied it was Mario Rumdum. That made the protagonist realize he heard that name somewhere before. Mario asked why he was sighing so much, and Aemon said it was complicated. The future of their academy was now dark and uncertain. Even so, Mario threw an arm over his shoulders and asked what he thought the role of the academy was. He replied it was to teach the students, and the professor agreed because that was exactly it. As long as there were students, the academy's future wouldn't be dark. Even if there were only 2 left now, and Aemon reflected on what he had heard. Mario could speak well about things, even while that drunk. But Aemon still sighed because it was hard to keep the academy running the way it was. Without support from the royal family, it was extremely difficult to manage everything. And Mario asked what he was complaining about so much. After all, he was treating this like a competition. At their age, they only thought about such things for the sake of His Majesty and the Emperor. That was when Aemon stopped to think about what they were discussing. The biggest challenge facing Amonith Academy at the moment was the recommendation from the Imperial family, because they wanted to suspend operations and all activities. But if they could achieve a good performance in the management competition hosted by the Emperor himself, maybe they could turn the situation around. He might even withdraw the recommendation to shut everything down. That's when Aemon saw them try and take the poster off the wall and ran to grab it. While the staff were finishing closing the bar, the protagonist left. There was still some time left before the competition would begin, so he decided he would attend some classes with his fellow professors. In the first period, there was a fencing class in the training field. Aemon approached to watch the lesson, but the teacher just wanted to sleep. The protagonist introduced himself to the lazy professor, who was off on a tour, and asked for their name, to which they replied it was Slothfield. When he stopped to hear that, Aemon realized he knew Field from somewhere. The head of the family was a great swordsman, and the family was famous for producing sword masters. It seems Sloth came from an amazing family, but was in that state, and he asked the teacher if they even knew class was starting now, waking them up. It's not like she would get paid by a ruined academy. So she didn't want to work. She complained because the protagonist woke her a bit abruptly. Aemon then realized the teacher was actually a woman. Even so, he didn't understand why they weren't being paid, and he offered her a sack of money. That was her weekly salary, and with that, she became more motivated. Surprisingly, Sloth's teaching skills weren't bad at all. Sloth guided Boris to apply the right force with his steps so he could move properly, and told Chloe to relax her wrist because it was too stiff. Still, Aemon wondered why she always carried that sleeping bag. It seemed like she was hiding something inside it to carry it around all the time. She had heard that the protagonist still didn't have a subject to teach, and he agreed. The headmistress said it would be good to observe the situation for now. She asked if there was any subject he was interested in. Aemon replied that personally he would like to teach history. He had always loved history since he was young, so that would be his personal choice. Hearing this, the teacher realized that general studies suited him well. He didn't look imposing and had a rather average physique. Judging by the way he walked and his posture, he didn't seem to have trained in martial arts. She could tell he had never learned fencing, and Aemon was surprised she knew that. Then she suggested he give it a try to see how he would do in class, and Aemon grew tense. It seemed like she was trying to dump all the tasks onto him somehow, but he'd be happy to learn a little, at least after getting smacked on the head, and she believed that was how it should be. She was excited to make it work. Learning fencing from someone of the Field family would be a great help, but Sloth was thinking that her newbie was pretty rude. She would teach and scold him so she could later hand her classes over to him. Then she told him to come at her with everything, which left Aemon a bit surprised. After all, she was going to conduct this training while still holding her sleeping bag. She replied that this was just a light sparring match and she didn't mind, but she planned to win using only one hand against a weakling like him. That's when Aemon suddenly surprised her because he was quite fast. She didn't even feel traces of mana, and their wooden swords clashed. Even so, Sloth knew he was a fast beginner swordsman. There was no need to be startled over something like that. She put the sleeping bag aside, but then ended up being caught off guard again. She tripped on her sleeping bag while dodging and fell. At the same moment, Sloth called for a timeout so Aemon wouldn't approach. But he pointed his sword at her, mentioning she should have stored her sleeping bag. That made her angry. She didn't want to use sword aura against a civilian. But now that things had reached this point, she'd take the coward's path. And for that, she would use sword aura, which made the protagonist curious. It looked like an aura blade, a skill exclusive to sword masters. She retorted that it was actually sword aura, which made him laugh. It was the first time he had seen this in real life, so he didn't know. Sloth was impressed because this was his first time witnessing something like that. He said he came from the Drake territory in the Arma Mountains. That surprised her. The Arma Mountains were at the end of the continent. She didn't even know there was a territory in that direction. Eamon replied that it wasn't the end of the continent. There was a plain beyond the mountains. Even so, she was surprised. It was called the Garden of Silence. It was because of that name that people believed it marked the end of the continent. So he had walked the entire way from the mountains to here. Eamon agreed, saying it had taken about 2 weeks on foot. Sloth froze. Normally, it would take much longer than that even on horseback. She figured that path must be full of monsters. And he sighed. His mouth hurt every time he talked about it. It was a huge headache because they destroyed the potato field fences every day. There were ogres, trolls, draconic men, all sorts of monsters. Sloth asked what they did about it, and Eamon said they killed them. That still left her curious, since this was the first time he had seen sword aura. It didn't seem like there were any knights in that territory, yet they still killed monsters. The protagonist didn't understand why they necessarily needed knights. After all, they die when cut with an axe, which impressed her. Eamon wondered if he had said something wrong because she had been staring at him for a while. He didn't know why, but he still asked her to teach him a bit more about swordsmanship. However, Sloth refused and told the kids to go back to class. The protagonist didn't understand what her problem was or why she was acting that way. Time passed the second period, Mario's magical theory class. Eamon went to check on Mario's class and ended up surprised by what he saw. After all, he was strangely good as a teacher and knew how to talk to the students. Even drunk, he explained about the magic circle and how he would count the classes. But instead of explaining, he would demonstrate because it would be easier to understand. That surprised Eamon because he could use magic in that condition. At that moment, Mario began preparing his magic and the protagonist remembered something. His name had appeared in a newspaper once and now he recalled it. He was a mage who belonged to a famous magic tower. Someone who had single-handedly destroyed an enemy knight unit in the final battle. He was known as the war hero Mario Rundum. Eamon remembered those were the details in the article, but the image didn't match. His face looked a little like the portrait, but far from his prime. Even so, he was capable of teaching great classes even while intoxicated. It would be perfect if not for that drinking addiction that ruined everything. At that moment, a certain thought crossed Amon's mind. If he could teach that well while drunk, he might be even better while sober. The protagonist approached, asking to have a moment to talk. Mario didn't know why. His class was going just fine. Just from the look on his face, he could tell the protagonist was thinking something. Even while denying it, he was dragged outside to talk. It was for the sake of his dignity, even if it left Mario a bit shocked. After all, what was happening to him now was crossing the line of dignity. Eamon said he wouldn't find another rookie as sincere as him anywhere else. For now, he asked the kids to stick to their notes before coming back, until they were startled by a scream from Mario outside. He asked why he got punched out of nowhere, but things continued like that. Eamon said he wasn't that old to be complaining and the kids looked tense. Mario was still complaining that it would leave many scars. And the protagonist apologized, but it was to try to sober him up. The truth was Mario had never seen such a barbaric method in his life. Eamon apologized again. Everyone in his territory did that. He just followed suit. Mario didn't know who the madman was who came up with that, but it was a horrible method. The protagonist said his father had taught it, so it was at least a bit effective. After all, thanks to the punches he gave, Mario was now completely sober. With that, he decided to go back to class, and Eamon wanted to see how things would go now. But to their surprise, Mario's words were now a bit less clear. It seemed he could only teach well when he was drunk. The protagonist couldn't even understand what he was saying anymore. It was that incoherent. In any case, judging by the students' reactions, he decided to take a break to reorganize himself. Mario drank again, and Eamon wanted to scream from frustration. He was drinking in front of the children, which was totally unethical. Even so, it worked because that way he managed to return to teaching. It seemed he was a good teacher who knew how to teach, even in that state. After class, he drank again and was all happy because drinking afterward was nice too. So Eamon approached because he wanted to ask a question, which startled the professor, expecting to get punched in the stomach again. The protagonist assured him that this time was something important and very serious, and asked if he was the great Mario Rundum who fought in the Great War. He was surprised to be recognized by Eamon, who said he had heard a lot about him and apologized for being rude earlier. That made the man more convinced. He was a nice guy and he even forgot about it. But his head and stomach were still hurting for some reason. The protagonist wanted to say it was obviously because of the hangover, but he let that go so he could ask a question about the class he just saw. The reinforcement magic circle he had talked about was a mana circle developed by Yamagoto. The corners of the pentagram were the key, but if you follow the improved version by Jodo, the efficiency would be reduced by half because the mana flow was misaligned. It would be better to simplify the magic circle by making the vertices square-shaped, which would also fit into the improved design. Those words impressed Mario, who asked if he had learned magic before. Eamon said his father was a mage, so he had learned a bit of magical theory, but that was only when he was younger, nothing serious. Something like that could earn him a first-class medal at the Magic Tower. Mario knew he could spot errors just by looking, and he even managed to plan improvements after learning just a bit about it. Then he suddenly shouted at Eamon, who was startled by how angry he got all of a sudden. Instead of explaining, he just left, much to the protagonist's surprise. Eamon was left behind, not knowing what was wrong with those teachers. The fencing and magic classes each had their own merits, and they were satisfying. But those guys needed special training. Eamon hated to admit it, but the kids' skills were lower than the teachers. At this rate, no one was going to win. They'd be lucky to earn a participation prize. Anyway, he went out to eat at the Academy's restaurant. It was a place with an amazing kitchen. He never imagined he'd have a meal like that. And on top of that, for such a low price, so he looked for empty seats. It happened to be at the table where Sloth and Mario were, but they turned their faces away. Eamon didn't understand why he had to go through such things at his job. He wanted to be able to socialize with his fellow teachers, but didn't seem possible. The two of them were actually talking about the protagonist, Sloth said that Ammon claimed he could kill high-risk monsters, even though he had never learned fencing or even how to use mana. So if he learned fencing or how to use mana, he would be potentially dangerous. Mario agreed a little magical theory he learned from his father could earn him a medal. If he learned to use real magic, they'd be in serious danger. Their meager job stability would be at risk. The two of them agreed on that. That was the moment when the Do Not Teach Ammon alliance was born. They would prohibit passing on any technique to him, no matter what. Instead, the protagonist went to sit with the kids, asking if he could join them. They agreed, and Ammon commented that they had worked hard that morning. They thanked him for the compliment, saying he had done the same. The protagonist almost got emotional because they were the only ones who noticed his efforts. Ammon asked if they knew a competition would be starting soon. They did, but were surprised when he asked if they wanted to participate. Ammon said it would be a good learning experience, something that lasts a lifetime, and suggested they could earn a little money, or rather, experience together. Boris immediately said he didn't want to participate. There was no chance a commoner like him could win and compete against nobles. Ammon replied that there were many nobles in the empire with commoner backgrounds, and that's exactly what made them so impressive, and the teacher hesitated. He realized he had said the wrong thing because Boris was frustrated, not knowing what a mere useless commoner like him could ever do. He never imagined the person he thought would be the most reasonable thoughts so little of himself. Ammon approached and held his hand, saying that when he was younger, he had a nickname. He was called Ammon, the Cowardly Chicken. Actually, his real name was Ammon the Hot Fist, and all the villagers treated him well. That was because he was always using his fists to defeat monsters. But now he had become a teacher at that academy. Not just anyone could become a teacher at an academy like that. Given the current circumstances, though, anyone could become a teacher there. Even so, Boris pointed out that the protagonist descended from a noble family, and Ammon replied that just being there should be all that mattered. Besides, if he participated in the competition and worked hard, he could become a noble too. In that case, he could eat good food every day and have meat every single day. In truth, Ammon only ate potatoes in his territory, but he wouldn't say that. That made Boris think, while the protagonist asked if he wasn't interested, and he finally agreed that he'd like to eat meat every day. Ammon knew he was a dedicated and quite ambitious student. He was happy that Boris was clinging to the goal he had when coming to the academy. Now Boris didn't have class in the afternoon, so he'd give him a special lesson. He would teach history and general studies from time to time as well. Boris got excited, and Ammon agreed in exchange for him working hard. The boy agreed to do his best, and turned around to talk to Chloe. And Ammon noticed she was cowering. Boris said she was scared. That was because Chloe had a fear of crowds in particular. There would be hundreds, or rather thousands of spectators at the competition. It would be better to just give up, and Ammon commented that she didn't have to push herself. But to his surprise, Chloe said she also wanted to participate. That was because Chloe wanted the strength to overcome that weak part of herself. Ammon smiled on the outside since they could meet afterward to continue their studies. But on the inside, he was celebrating. She would become another step toward his success. Up to that moment, Chloe and Boris had no idea what awaited them. Since then, the three of them began exercising and running to build healthy bodies. Seeing this, a sloth wondered how many laps they had done so far, and Mario replied that it was probably almost 90. After some time, they collapsed on the ground from sheer exhaustion. Ammon saw they were struggling and realized it was worse than he thought, but he said they could rest a bit and then go to magical theory class. Later, he offered them a history lesson, even though they were still confused. In fact, the two of them said it was hard to understand, and he was surprised because it was basic magic theory, but the kids apologized. Even Mario complained that this wasn't how classes were supposed to be taught. Ammon was surprised because that was how he learned as a child. It felt odd. So he suggested they return to the training room once more to clear their heads. They kept running as exercise, and Ammon followed them. The whole time, the protagonist kept reminding them they had to give it their all. After a point, they collapsed to the floor in exhaustion, and Ammon was stunned. Kids these days were way too weak for just a bit of effort. At that moment, the other teachers approached to ask what he was doing. The protagonist finally realized they had actually shown up despite being irresponsible. He explained that he was helping the students train their stamina to become stronger. Sloth asked if he had made them run 100 laps around the training hall, and Ammon asked how she knew that, but that was at least the bare minimum. They should be able to run 100 laps. The training room was quite small, so running just 10 laps and getting tired wouldn't do any good in the end. He also taught them some magic theory, and Mario asked who was etheriology. The protagonist confirmed it was the basics, and he reviewed some fundamentals with them. Both teachers were furious because Ammon had trained the kids like Spartans. Those kinds of things were normally hard even for adults to handle. They needed to stop him at all costs, since it was clear Boris and Chloe were exhausted. Ammon said they could continue the lesson now, but he was interrupted. That was because the teacher suggested several changes to the training methods. To begin with, if even 10 laps was hard, setting a goal of 100 made no sense. Ammon explained that since the Arma Mountains were behind his village, he had gone there since he was young. Sloth reminded him that he couldn't judge people based on his own standards of stamina. Besides, it seemed like he would have to relearn magic from the basics. And she asked who it was that had taught him such incorrect magical knowledge. Ammon replied that his father used to read him books before bed, fairy tales. Now even Mario could see he was a bit detached from reality. Not everyone had a powerful mage for a father. That was the academy, a place where students with different experiences came together. And he was educating the two of them based on his own standards and personal methods. Mario asked if that could really be called proper education. First, one needed to learn the standards of the world before being able to teach them. Mario felt amazing after saying that, but Ammon only felt he was being annoying. But even though he hated to admit it, it was true that they were right. The curriculum of Ammon's special class for the competition had changed. Mario would teach magic, and Ammon would review what the students had learned. He would also work on developing their stamina, and Sloth would teach fencing based on that. The teachers were irritated because Ammon was teaching more systematically than expected. Sloth agreed, saying he kept pushing them to their limits all the time, and then immediately made them wield a sword as if they were already strong. It was perfect for building their stamina. Before that, all the students were noble hares. So many parents also protested against their children being disciplined like that, involving physical punishments like running, saying it was disgraceful. So they never would have considered such methods. Mario said he wanted to say that Ammon was teaching based on Boris and Chloe's experiences, but Sloth imagined a noble wouldn't behave like this to begin with. Even Boris had to agree that the idiot Ammon was always hitting him. But at that point, he was just playing around with the kids. That way, after many days of physical fitness training, something happened. The protagonist would begin real combat training, and the two students had become such fierce beasts that they even bit Ammon. A bit later, Mario met with Mr. Tomato, or rather, Tomath. Ammon was surprised to learn that Mario had once been a viscount. They had come there for the educational benefit of their students. Tomath saw the identification from the field marquisate, confirming their presence at the site. Tomath let them in, and they met a man named Brad Fitt. He was a city guard, and they were going to teach practical dueling against the soldiers. They were the pride of the city, and Boris quickly said he wanted to go first. Ammon agreed he had that competitive spirit, as expected. So the protagonist asked Fitt to be careful with them, and he promised he would hold back when facing Boris. In truth, Ammon was asking Fitt to be careful of Boris himself, because he charged at him immediately without hesitation. That was exactly what the protagonist had wanted to see from him from the start. The acceleration from his lower body after running dozens of laps. The fencing from the field marquisate, taught by Sloth herself. The main technique was still missing, but his performance was admirable. Even Fitt was shocked that the boy could move like that. He wondered if it was because of his small frame, but he was far more agile. At some point, he saw the perfect opening to move in. But once again, it was just a plan by Boris to deceive his opponent, which caught Fitt off guard as he saw him closing in. And he landed a clean hit on his head, who yelled at him to stop because it hurt. But Boris kept hitting him on the head without stopping, to the point of destroying all respect. After being beaten on the head until nearly bald, Fitt admitted defeat. Now everyone was admiring Boris for being so cool and strong, while the guards laughed at Fitt because he couldn't even be called a soldier like that. Even he was surprised he had beaten a real adult. Ammon was proud because his training had been truly flawless. Then he encouraged Chloe because it was her turn now and he wanted her to do well. But when she stepped in front of everyone, she froze and fell to her knees in nervousness. The soldiers asked what exactly the little girl was so afraid of. But as expected, Chloe couldn't move because there were too many eyes on her. She was terrified because everyone was looking directly at them. So Ammon approached asking if she was okay, comforting her so she could feel more at ease now. People would judge and talk about her either way, whether she fought or not, especially since it would be her first time fighting. It was part of life to be watched. But she could think of the strange people as familiar faces with funny expressions, and he offered the example of the potatoes from his hometown, which he knew well. She could imagine them all just like they were potatoes. She started imagining that and muttered to herself to try to convince herself. Ammon had no idea what she was talking about, but it seemed to have motivated her a little. Now she had regained the confidence to try again, and Chloe continued her mantra. The soldier in front of her asked if she didn't intend to fight and if he could strike first. The people watching saw the timid Chloe facing off against a stranger. Even Mario was impressed and asked the protagonist what he had told her. Ammon was proud and smiled as he answered that it wasn't anything in particular. It was probably just because he was a natural-born educator, after all. That immediately made Mario take back his words and his compliments. Chloe kept attacking, which made the soldier laugh because she was both cute and scary. But to his surprise, even though she missed, she moved in and struck his bones hard. And on top of that, she kept hitting the same spot over and over without stopping. Finally, Chloe won with that strange smile on her face. All the teachers celebrated her victory, and Ammon was full of pride. They truly were the Academy's saviors after all. From that day on, the students had a duel against the guards every day. And to the shock of absolutely no one, the two kept defeating their opponents. As they grew stronger and more confident, their skills improved day by day. Before they could realize it, the day of the first competition had arrived. Ammon said that night they could eat something delicious since they had worked hard. They both got really happy with the idea, and Boris asked if it would be some kind of meat. Instead, the protagonist explained that they'd be going to the arena. Only the winners could enjoy a delicious meal. Immediately, their happiness died, and they stared at the protagonist, who had been that cruel with his words. But even so, they went to the place. Several people were betting gold on their favorite fighters to win. Boris threatened to tell Sloth that Ammon had brought them there after it was over, and he replied that even Sloth had actually given her approval for it. In any case, he intended to explain the rules to the two kids. Actually, the only rule was that they had to fight barehanded without their swords. Hitting vital points, poking eyes, biting, anything was allowed. Boris argued that they had barely learned swordsmanship and were thrown in here. Ammon countered that if they lost their sword, they couldn't just accept defeat. Even in their future competitions, there was no guarantee that it would be a fair fight. Then the protagonist placed his hand on his head, asking him not to worry too much. They could trust what they had learned and believe in themselves. Boris wanted to say that not even Ammon believed in the things he taught them, but instead they gave in to the words of their enthusiastic teacher. In the distance, a man watched the group talking and wondered if they were students. Aside from Viscount Mario, who was accompanying them, he had never seen any of the others before. They were all idiots. That was no place to bring children. Even so, Boris went into the arena to fight someone called Egg Crusher. The boy froze when he saw his opponent, who was gigantic and clearly strong. The man laughed, asking what a brat like him was doing there. He said he would use all his strength, even when facing younger children. Ammon reminded the two that they really weren't that strong yet. They were still at an immature stage when it came to mana control, and also in sword fighting, so he would teach them a very special technique. If their opponent was so strong that there seemed to be no chance of victory, they should just focus on striking the vital points without hesitation. And that's how Boris crushed the eggs of the egg crusher in just a few seconds. The teachers watched while flinching slightly, just imagining the pain. But Ammon advised Chloe to do the same thing, because it would work. Everything would be fine. They were rooting for her and even placed another bet on her. Other spectators watched irritated because their betting plans had been ruined. And all because of two kids. One of them called for the troublemaker Dexon. There would be no connection between Dexon and the Viscount, so there'd be no problem. Even Mario wouldn't be able to do anything against them now. That was when he found out that Dexon had decided to take a day off precisely that day. Meanwhile, in the arena, everyone was frozen in shock at what they saw. After all, Chloe was nearly beating her opponent senseless and seemed way too skilled. Mario said that even if she had learned swordsmanship, Chloe fought really well barehanded. Ammon replied that he heard Marcus Field created swordsmanship with hand-to-hand combat in mind. If you used a certain stance with your fists, you could deliver a bone-breaking punch. But if you made a different move with a sword, it would become a charging strike. Now Mario could understand why Ammon seemed to know so much, and asked if Ammon had been learning swordsmanship from the professor recently. He replied no, even when he asked politely, Sloth had refused, which made Mario laugh. It seemed their alliance was still going strong. After the kids finished the fight, Ammon decided they should celebrate. And to do that, he would pay for something to eat for everyone. Even Mario got excited, even though the protagonist refused to pay for someone with a better salary. A spectator who had placed bets was trembling with rage. Those brats actually won, and he wanted revenge if they ever returned to the arena. It didn't take long before Ammon paid for the meals and became broke. Those brats ate so much they emptied his wallet like that. He wanted to save some money for the competition with the headmistress. That's when he heard a loud scream and barged into Anarel's office asking what happened. She was whining about her King Mango. That was because there was only one left, but Ammon was confused. After all, maybe a thief had shown up to steal the King Mangoes. And he realized he might receive a reward from the headmistress if he caught them. Even during a crisis like that, the protagonist only thought about rewards. Then Ammon told Anarel to stay calm from now on, because he would personally take care of the thief immediately. And at that moment, he charged at the man inside the room, believing him to be the thief. The headmistress pleaded for him to wait, trying to explain who the man was. But he landed a clean kick before the man could introduce himself. That man was actually Bless, the vice headmistress of Amonith Academy. Ammon grumbled because he thought he was going to get a reward, but he let it go and apologized to the vice headmistress for not recognizing her. Bless accepted his apology because it was natural for him not to know. She never imagined she'd experience so many different things now that she was back. She was going to lose her job just for taking a vacation. That would be the result. She had been doing her best to manage things while trying to prevent that road. But Anarel had been hit hard, and Ammon was confused about what she meant, and asked if Bless had been working at the academy alone until now. She answered yes, she could never trust that idea of Anarel. Anarel tried to object, saying she wasn't that stupid, but the two ignored her. Then Bless menacingly asked what that entry in the ledger was. A temporary income of 5,000 gold coins that made her furious. Anarel stuttered, trying to explain it was from a slug race. Bless stammered back that it was at least good they had temporary income after all. But it could have gone wrong. She should be aware of her position as headmistress. Anarel apologized while Ammon remained silent, neither defending nor being defended. Bless understood, but she said they should focus on investing in the King Mango farm. Ammon didn't understand why they needed to invest in a farm, and Bless replied it was just about considering the letter from the farm's leader. That investment had a guaranteed return rate. The reduction of staff in the academy's cafeteria was quite critical, so she ordered the headmistress to sign the staff documents. Ammon asked her to wait a moment. There were only 3 teachers and 2 students at the academy, so he didn't understand why they needed to add more staff now. And he snatched the paper so the headmistress wouldn't sign it. Instead, Bless said low-quality meals would be a problem. It would only cause the morale of those left to keep declining. They should raise morale by increasing the quality of the meals. Ammon didn't understand what kind of nonsense she was talking about. But now that he thought about it, all her proposals were related to the cafeteria. Bless also complained about their current meat supplier, saying he was awful. They needed to find someone new, but then the protagonist interrupted her because he wanted her to participate as the lead teacher in the competition, the one that would be hosted by the Emperor starting the next day. The vice headmistress got annoyed, not understanding why she had to be told that. Ammon knew that if she stayed, the academy would keep getting involved in trouble, and it would turn into one big cafeteria instead of focusing on studies. And he replied that if she appeared as their representative, the Emperor would surely approve. Bless argued that Anarel would be better, but the protagonist kept begging. He was ready to throw himself off the balcony until Bless just accepted out of desperation, which brought Anarel to tears. She didn't know he would go that far for the school. Thus, time passed until the long-awaited day of the Imperial competition. On that day, the protagonist met the Emperor, known as the Democratic Ruler. He was all excited to finally get the competition started. This man was Sandro Argia Amonith, also known as Amonith XVI. Boris approached the protagonist, looking nervous, but didn't say what was bothering him. Ammon ended up agreeing with him and looked at the fireworks they spent so much money on, and wondered if this was how they used his taxes, for useless things like that. The group decided to walk around eating some things and enjoying the festival. Everything was delicious, but also absurdly expensive. When Chloe offered a bite, it suddenly fell to the ground, and Ammon shouted in shock. It was so expensive it almost made him cry. He wanted to use the 3-second rule. Chloe said it was fine, but got irritated at the person who made him drop it. Boris asked where Mario and Bless had gone, since they had vanished. Eamon, after picking up the skewer from the ground anyway, said he didn't know. They had been with them during the opening ceremony but ended up disappearing. However, the protagonist remembered that many dark elves were obsessed with a certain thing. She must have been starving during her break. She was worse off than before. It didn't take long for Eamon to find Mario and Bless eating and drinking way more than they should. After the professor gave them a big scolding, he punished them on the spot. It was nearly insubordination considering the positions they were in. But the protagonist couldn't care less, and now his students wouldn't get a proper meal. It was all thanks to the two of them spending all their money at once. Eamon reminded them that every commander with a bad reputation among his men ends up dead, even at the hands of their own men who mutiny. Since he couldn't kill them, he could at least beat them up a bit so they'd learn. At that point, Bless asked if he knew there was a private betting pool inside the competition. He had bet 6 silver coins, each on Boris and Chloe, to win their first fight. The vendor confirmed it and offered a confirmation ticket, thanking him for the purchase. Even so, the protagonist didn't believe it would really happen again. The two had won against adults before. Eamon wanted to believe they'd win the bet. Then the first category of the competition was sword skills. They called the participants, including Boris and Chloe, into the arena. Eamon was really counting on the kids and trusting them to make it work. They'd go hungry for the rest of their lives if they lost. He'd also need to walk home after all the money that was spent. Boris was feeling a bit of pain in his shoulder but tried not to let it show. The special results of the protagonist's sword training led to Chloe's great victory. The competition began with her first win, while Boris had a rough time. He had a fierce fight against a student from a renowned academy. The spectators were surprised because the commoner boy was working hard and doing well. But the truth was that Boris's shoulder was hurting more and more. That money the protagonist had invested was the easiest he ever earned. He thanked Chloe in his mind because she won and Boris's value would be worth it too. Eamon was counting on the boy to win, and he remembered the expectations. He had overheard his parents saying things would be better with him gone. He didn't want to disappoint his parents when he went to the academy, but he realized something quickly if he wanted to be average. To make that happen, Boris would have to work 10 times harder than normal. Eamon had seen the boy training late at night several times. Watching him put in the effort also gave the protagonist a bit more motivation. So after a break, the boy asked the professor a question. He wanted to know the reason he had asked him to join the competition. Eamon hesitated to answer it wasn't just because he trained late. It was because he believed the boy had the potential to win. Boris was still in pain as he moved while facing his opponent. At that moment, Eamon wondered why he suddenly started retreating. Boris's opponent didn't understand either and asked if the commoner had reached his limit. When Boris tried to move, the shoulder locked up and he couldn't swing his sword anymore. At that moment, he was hit directly by the noble's blade as the noble mocked him. He told them to go home immediately, and Boris knew he had lost. The winner of the match was the boy Extra Leda. Eamon couldn't believe he had lost his 6 silver coins on that bet. Others commented that the commoner boy was still amazing. He managed to show great defense against the heir of the Lada family. Even as a commoner, they were still eager to see him in the future. A bit later, Boris found Eamon looking really disappointed. He apologized for losing right in the first round, but Eamon assured him it was okay because he had worked hard. Still, he wanted to know why he hadn't said anything about the pain in his shoulder earlier. Boris replied that if he had, he wouldn't have been allowed to participate in the competition. He had wanted to win, so Eamon placed a hand on his head and asked about the special lessons. The boy said they were hard, but also really fun. The protagonist agreed. Besides, they helped him gain the confidence to do things he thought were impossible. The results weren't the most important part. It was the process to get there. Many other opportunities would still arise for him in the future. He could gain experience and use it as a base to work harder and do even better. Boris agreed, and Eamon asked him to speak up if he was in pain from now on. A little later, the fencing division of that competition reached its final stages. Many young people across the empire had shown their talent, especially the participant Chloe, who arrived like a comet and quickly achieved great results. Everyone was excited to see her performance in the next match. The final match would be between Chloe and Raymond. The name Raymond reminded the protagonist of something as he looked at his file. He was just a commoner who didn't belong to any academy. Even his skills were only barely enough to pass. Then the two participants entered and Chloe thought she could win easily. But Eamon froze when he saw the person standing before him. Raymond had been told by his grandfather to hide his abilities as much as possible. He wondered how he could learn anything in a competition like that. Raymond, the hidden grandson of the Empire's greatest swordsman, the king of the celestial blade, Renbelt. Raymond greeted Chloe without any respect, and she grumbled that he was annoying. The others weren't even looking at the field, completely uninterested in the match. That took the fun out of it. She wanted to end it quickly. Raymond agreed a competition of such low level wasn't fun. He intended to show just a bit of his skills to her. The match began, and Eamon judged the boy's movements to be far from ordinary. It was like watching a wild bear attacking. Raymond took the initiative with heavy movements toward his opponent. Chloe acknowledged that he was too fast. She had to block somehow. He was the first to score in the battle, and he mocked her, asking if things had finally gotten a little fun now. Chloe responded that it hadn't even started yet when voices reached her ears. There were the spectators mocking her because she was terrible. They thought she was good, but in the end, she wasn't anything special. She hadn't been like this before. Watching her get hit without counterattacking was boring. They wanted to see something impressive from Chloe. She should just fight properly. She had thought she'd overcome all of that, but she was still afraid. She'd heard people talking about her nonstop every day at school, saying she acted like she was something, even though she was worthless. They mocked her in every possible way and called her a coward. Chloe didn't even want to do this, and then she heard from her father that she'd be sent to another continent. Her father sent her against her will. If she wanted success, she had to do this. And she couldn't stay in that academy. a royal with no right to the throne. That was her fate she had no choice but to accept. Chloe asked Jason the pig how she should live from then on. Even though she was abandoned and sent abroad, it was too much. Losing her dignity as royalty was something she could never accept, even if it meant her death. The award for the bravest child of the year was going to Chloe, and they called her to the stage. But for some reason, the other students never liked anything about her. After her country fell, their constant bullying began. Since then, Chloe had become afraid of people's stares. At that moment, everyone commented that she had frozen in the middle of the arena, unable to move. She would be disqualified if things continued like that, and they wondered if she could go on. Eamon thought it was indeed very dangerous. If Chloe won the match, they'd be guaranteed at least 1 gold and 50 silvers. Suddenly, he shouted at Chloe because she couldn't forget what he had taught her. She had learned it during special training, how to deal with strangers, to consider strangers as familiar people with funny faces. Raymond turned, wondering if that guy was her teacher, and then got hit on the head, scoring a point for Chloe. Les realized that she actually remembered Chloe as a student from the Kingdom of Iran. Their pork was truly a great delicacy. What a shame. Mario said the Kingdom of Iran was renowned for raising pigs. Their roads used to be completely blocked by them in the past. Normally, people referred to them using not-so-polite terms, and Chloe was doing the same thing now on the battlefield. Eamon remembered he had told her to think of everyone as tomatoes or something like that. In fact, that had turned her into a true monster in battle. Suddenly, Raymond was being overwhelmed by Chloe, who was using Aura Blade, which in fact was something that should have been banned in the duel. Still, it was shocking that she gained a power boost like that so suddenly. Chloe asked where he was looking, calling him a ridiculous pig. It was on that day that Raymond realized something thanks to what happened. He had been a frog stuck in a well all this time compared to her. The match ended and Chloe was declared the winner, which made Eamon celebrate with pride. In fact, he loved seeing that. It should be enough to cover the expenses. But then everyone noticed Chloe collapse after the battle ended. At that moment, the Emperor came to congratulate the winners of the contest, praising the sword fights. They had all been very satisfying to watch. Obviously, seeing such a magnificent performance from the children was incredible. They would be the future leaders of the nation. Sandro couldn't be more pleased. Then he called the winner of the swordsman competition. Chloe ended up losing to Raymond after collapsing at the end of the fight. Eamon and she were both a little frustrated with everything, but there was nothing they could do. According to the rules of the competition, the match ended when one of them stepped out of the arena. That was the code of knighthood and the rules of the battlefield. Thus, Raymond won because she fell and lifted both feet off the ground. Eamon knew they weren't exactly wrong in saying that, but even so, it made him furious for some reason. Suddenly, they paused to call another person who had performed greatly in the competition. They called for Chloe to come up to the podium to be acknowledged. Sandro expressed his sincere gratitude to all of them for making the event shine. As a reward, he would offer each of the children 10 gold coins. Then he asked Chloe if she was from Aaron. He knew she must have gone through a lot. He had met her father a few times. It was all his fault. Chloe still felt that it was fine because the pigsty of that kingdom deserved to fall. But the Emperor felt it must have been really difficult, judging by her reasoning. Eamon was even moved because the fall of the Iran kingdom had nothing to do with Amonith. Even so, he apologized so sincerely that he truly seemed like a saint. Then Sandro asked if the one who had shouted earlier for her was her teacher. He seemed like a very interesting young man, and the protagonist was confused. Suddenly, he was called to the podium as well for a conversation. Eamon had never expected something like this to happen to him, honestly. The path to success always starts with the first step. And as he approached, he greeted the Emperor, who smiled at the protagonist. After all, he was a capable young man with quite the student. He would be rewarded with gold coins. Eamon thanked him while pretending to be humble, even though he was celebrating inside. In truth, the Emperor recognized his face because it looked familiar. When he heard his name, Sandro froze at the surname Drake, and suddenly shouted at the protagonist for calling him Majesty. After all, it was no wonder his ugly face was full of greed. He was a damn member of the Drake family, and Eamon bowed, asking for forgiveness. Even without knowing why he was apologizing, Sandro clearly held a grudge against his family. His greed alone was proof enough that he was part of the Drakes. The protagonist didn't understand why. He was the one who offered the duel in the first place. Even so, he handed the money to the protagonist, who thanked him, until he realized the Emperor had just been messing with him. He offered the money only to snatch it back afterward to mock him. Eamon wondered if this was supposed to be the holy emperor among emperors. He would just endure it. His family's reputation would get even worse after this, especially if he said something or complained. He could only pretend he had made a mistake. Suddenly, Sandro's wife hit him, asking what on earth he thought he was doing. As emperor, he should demonstrate dignity befitting his position. After the empress pressured him, he laughed, admitting he had let emotions take over. In the end, it was a victory for the empress, and she herself approached Eamon. She knew he was from the Drake family, seemed like he didn't know about the conflict between the families. Eamon had no idea what she was talking about after all, but there was a reason the emperor had been acting that way just now. It wasn't Eamon's fault in particular, so he was forgiven for now. In the end, the protagonist didn't even receive the money. He was only called up to the podium to be humiliated for nothing. Raymond returned to tell his grandfather that he had won the competition, and the old man asked if he had won while hiding his skills as he had said he would. He was the Empire's great swordsman, the king of the blue sword, Raymond. Given a lack of response, Raymond understood that he hadn't hidden them, and he asked if he really thought the world was such a hard place to live in. Raymond had to agree. Many masters were hiding out there. Once Raymond was called a talented swordsman and earned the title King of the Blue Sword, but he was sure there were people out there far stronger than he was, and he wouldn't even have a chance of defeating them. What he was trying to say was that arrogance could be a poison, and he asked Raymond who was the talented person that made him reveal his skills. He answered that it was Chloe Aran. She attends Amonith Academy. a survivor of the royal family of Iran, which was far from ordinary. Raymond said that for his dear student to show his skills like that, her teacher must be quite the professional. Meanwhile, a new crisis was unfolding at Amonith Academy. Anirul was crying while Ammon was in shock, not understanding what he had just heard. In response to the disrespect shown toward the emperor, they recommended Ammon be dismissed. They didn't know what kind of crime he had committed against the emperor, but it was concerning. He should be grateful the emperor only recommended it instead of outright firing him. In truth, they had done their part for now. That was completely unexpected, really. Ammon couldn't believe he had received a dismissal recommendation. If he had known this would happen, he would have just been happy to meet the emperor. Anirul was moved, seeing how unjust he felt the situation was. But the protagonist was actually satisfied that he could leave the academy easily and without a fine, and wondered how he ended up choosing such a painful path when there were easier ways out. The headmistress asked what exactly had happened, and even he wasn't sure. It seemed his family and Sandra's had some kind of bad history. Apparently, the emperor was angry at him for some unknown reason. Anirul couldn't believe he was being fired for something so trivial. Truth be told, Ammon had to agree that a lot had happened. He secured funding for the academy, organized special training, and even put an end to the vice headmistress's ambitions. He had created many precious memories there, but there was nothing he could do about it. He thanked the headmistress for everything, and she sighed, saying there was nothing they could do. Anirul just wanted to ignore the emperor's recommendation, shocking Ammon. That was because the academy had received a foreclosure recommendation. A recommendation was just a recommendation. As she saw it, they were doing just fine on their own. Even if they ignored one more recommendation, nothing would happen. As the school's headmistress, Anirul found this completely unacceptable. She couldn't stand by and do nothing while a great teacher like him left the school. This went far beyond her pride. It struck at her core beliefs as an educator. Ammon now understood, but he still preferred to be fired. She still thought it was too early, even though he believed giving up was a good idea. A little later, the vice headmistress ended up hearing about everything, and Ammon was practically begging to be fired now. But she couldn't do that. They could never throw away such a skilled professional. Even if it was a recommendation from the emperor, she wouldn't go through with it. The truth was, Ammon knew she was doing all of this on purpose because he wanted to be fired. Right then, Mario showed up, asking if all of that was really true. A talented teacher like him being dismissed seemed like a joke. He said he'd request an audience with the emperor through Marcus Williams. They all wanted to do something to prevent his dismissal, even if Ammon didn't want that. If they didn't intend to fire him, they could at least offer him a break. That was how the protagonist finally gave up on his plan to run away from the academy. Ammon returned to his homeland, the Drake estate in the Arma Mountains. But everyone came with him. Anirul was excited because it was her first time there. She knew the edge of the continent Mario wanted to drink, and Bless was hungry. He was accompanied by all those shameful and chaotic people. The day before, they had all made that decision together. Since it had been 3 months since Ammon arrived, he had 3 vacation days to use. The protagonist would still take 15 days to reach the estate. The academy didn't allow more than 1 month of leave to be accumulated. There was time to negotiate, and Ammon explained that his homeland was in the Arma Mountains. Anirul suggested letting him take another day off since it was so far away. He asked if he could take his vacation days in advance, and she refused. It seemed like he was trying to cheat the rules somehow. So she said she could help him with teleportation magic. Just like they used for the slug race, it would work. Ammon thanked her, but didn't understand why she started packing her bags. She replied it was because she would have to bring him back, so she would accompany him. She got all excited because she had never been to the mountains before. But Ammon was clearly disappointed about being accompanied. She planned to share the news with all the other teachers and students, and the protagonist quickly asked her to wait since she was treating his home like a tourist spot. Anirul was confused. It seemed like he didn't plan to take his days off. But if that was the case, then he didn't need that paper, and even tore it up. The truth was, the protagonist wasn't sure if they all needed to go together. He wanted to go alone, but then the headmistress made another suggestion. He could wait his 4-day vacation with no teleportation, against using teleportation magic but taking everyone else with him. And that's how things ended up at that point. Ammon's father, Kame Drake, welcomed everyone with a big smile. Kame hoped they would all have a comfortable stay at his home. Anirul thanked him for the hospitality, and Kame replied it wasn't necessary. Mario brought a fine wine for them to enjoy, and his father was impressed. It seemed his son had great companions. Ammon hoped his father wouldn't be fooled. It was far more important what people were like on the inside than the outside. He had to get those guys away from his father before they got any closer. So the protagonist decided he had a question to ask his father, and asked about Emperor Sandro, since they had reacted strangely to Ammon. He asked Kame if there had been some feud between the families, which he confirmed, saying it was time for him to learn the truth. The Drake family was a distant bloodline descending from the Amonith family. Ammon was shocked by what he had just learned and asked why they were only barons. The emperor's relatives should have a higher title than that. Even Archduke Orca, who was related to the emperor, was recognized as such. Kame handed him a book so he could understand more about all this. These were records from the time of the empire's first emperor. It had been a long time, but they shared the blood of the first emperor. That's why they kept copying all of this over time. There were, of course, some records, but none from his father's era. Now Ammon had the chance to see the truth about their family. In the first year of the unified imperial era begins a dialogue between Gregory Area and Archduke Drake. Ammon wondered if their family really used to be one of Archduke's. A historian recorded the emperor recounting the situation. He said he wanted to beat the idiot guy up, which shocked Ammon. In year 3, the emperor got beaten and was bedridden after a fight. The emperor asked the historian not to write down those things. In year 6, he said it was impossible to get a message through to that damn Duke Drake. The Duke replied, "Long live the old emperor." which made the emperor flip the table in a fit of rage. Apparently, by then, he had already lost his Archduke title. On the same day, the emperor told the historian to stop writing and hit him. Aemon agreed he should have listened from the start. Amonith VII said that Marquis Drake was impossible to deal with. As time went on, the Drake family's situation became more disgraceful. Prince Sandro said Belian Drake stole his sausage and demoted him to Baron. That was nothing more than a childish fight escalating into a family feud. It eventually caused the two families to drift apart. Kaim agreed that it was shameful how they ended up as barons. Aemon was afraid it had been treason, but the situation was simply embarrassing, and he asked if anything had happened between his father and the current emperor. He denied it. He didn't even know him or had ever seen him in his life. Aemon's grandfather had a fight with the current emperor, but that was it. And the Great War had ended just a few years ago. Even if there was hostility, maybe that relationship was why their people hadn't been recruited. The protagonist asked if maybe they had just been forgotten. After all, they lived far away and the terrain was rough enough to remain hidden. In any case, it was ultra-secret information known only to the advisors. They could never let such information leak, not even to their successors. Aemon didn't understand why his father was telling him all this only now, and Kaim didn't understand why he was acting like he wouldn't do anything about it. The protagonist truly didn't intend to do anything, which was actually cruel. Still, someone approached asking who the dark elf was. When they turned to look, they were going to speak with Julia, the protagonist's mother, but they froze. Julia had arrived at the house, all happy to see her son, carrying Bless. She said she found her digging in the potato fields and hit her. Aemon explains that Bless was actually the vice principal of their academy. Meanwhile, everyone else was hiding after witnessing that. They couldn't believe the place was that violent and abrupt. They hid behind the bushes when they saw several people passing by. They were carrying a bunch of monsters and wondered how that was even possible. It didn't take long for one of them to notice Anarel, asking who she was since he had never seen her before. She let out a shocked scream when she realized she had been spotted. That's when Aemon finally appeared to see what was going on. He had heard a noise that sounded like a monster dying. It seemed like it had been Anarel's scream, and the protagonist commented that the hunt hadn't gone very well. Sloth was unsure how that was possible since there were still too many monsters. In truth, monsters have been strangely scarce lately. It was possible they weren't reproducing enough due to excessive hunting. Still, it was shocking that they had all been killed like that. Aemon introduced the principal, teachers, and students from where he had been working. The men remarked that he really had become a great teacher. They said he should keep working hard to become a principal someday. The protagonist thought he would just finish his contract in 3 years. Then he planned to leave, hoping they'd stop drawing so much attention. Instead, he told the others they should go bathe and rest now. Aemon sighed in relief because he could finally see everyone again after some time. But that place was far too noisy, and it was getting late. They should head inside. That's when he realized everyone was actually in shock from everything they had seen. A bit later, Anarel asked what he was eating, and Aemon replied that it was meat. However, she was certain it was monster meat, and yet they were still eating it. It might not seem like it, but it actually tasted really good, though she didn't seem interested. Anarel refused and decided to eat only potatoes. She just couldn't like meat. Even living with humans, she still had her priorities. And the protagonist realized it was true. As an elf, she couldn't eat it. Time passed as the group continued eating and enjoying their time there. Aemon felt that everything was unusually peaceful for the first time in ages, until suddenly, there was a loud noise along with an explosion. The protagonist stood up saying it was probably just a pest. They could handle it. Boris was confused, saying you don't deal with a pest using that kind of weapon. That's when they saw all the villagers had gathered with their weapons to fight, because the pest in question was actually a real monster. The group of humans ran to face the monsters without any fear. Aemon couldn't believe they had ruined their moment of peace, so they took advantage of it to attack and gather even more meat than before. The teachers watched in awe, and Mario felt his sense of normalcy shatter. It was the first time they'd seen such a wild fight. Aemon felt tired after moving so much for the first time in a while. Sloth reflected on how the protagonist hadn't even learned any combat techniques, and yet he could fight just fine using physical ability and instinct. As expected, it had been a good decision not to teach him anything serious before. When it was over, Aemon's sighed. It had been a while since he fought like that, so it had been tough. The others clapped, praising the protagonist for his abilities. They knew he could take care of the monsters on his own. Aemon sighed again. His body was all stiff, so he was pretty clumsy. That must have been the result of becoming too complacent while working as a teacher. Mario also came over to praise him for his efforts. The protagonist was surprised to see everyone there. It wasn't anything too important, but they should focus on resting. Mario asked if that had been the entire wave of monsters. Aemon agreed, but it looked like more had come that way. He said it was a drake, which confused Mario. After all, Drake was the name of his family, and the protagonist got annoyed because they were calling his family a monster. That's when Mario realized he was talking about the Drake subspecies of monsters. Aemon told them not to say things like that, not even as a joke, because otherwise he'd end up getting seriously scolded. Although Mario asked who would scold him, the protagonist changed the subject. That was because those monsters seemed to be fleeing from something else. He wondered what could be making monsters like those gather together. Ogres, draconic subspecies, and creatures that usually never teamed up were suddenly like that. Mario agreed. It was definitely a point worth thinking about. According to literary records, drakes were very distinctive. They had massive bodies resembling castle walls, and scales as hard as non-piercing steel armor. They were also so violent that they were compared to ogres. In addition, there was also the elder drake who stood out. It was said that if a guy like that showed up, the village's potato fields would become dead land. The teacher asked if that drake wasn't just a rare creature that only appeared in books, and Aemon agreed that it was true, but they did actually appear. It didn't take long before they showed up in the potato field, to Mario's shock. Les screamed because they devoured all the neighboring potatoes immediately. Never mind the fact that she was complaining because they ate her potatoes. The protagonist sighed, unable to believe he had been so careless in the face of a disaster. Mario asked the protagonist if he would believe him, a six-circle mage. They would be nothing but a pile of ashes after facing his fire magic. But before he could fire off his spell, the drake struck first. Mario barely dodged while Eamon could only watch that pitiful scene. Sloth also saw that creature her father had once killed in the past. She got ready to fight, but her sword snapped in two. The protagonist said if those weapons worked on them, he would have cut them down with his axe. There was no other choice now that things had reached this point, and he told everyone to gather their strength and exterminate those monsters. To the teacher's shock, everyone in the village grabbed the monsters with their bare hands. They held onto the tail with all their might, pulling from several directions. The monster tried to resist, still eating potatoes even in that situation. Suddenly, another person appeared asking what all the commotion was about. It was the Elder, who arrived flying, drawing a surprised look from Eamon. The Elder noticed those guys were causing trouble in the village, and the protagonist agreed, asking for help if he had any strength to spare. Then the Elder touched the drake's head and asked what kind of misbehavior that was, and told it to return immediately, and suddenly the monster started running away. Eamon thanked the Elder, who replied that it was no problem. He wanted to know if things were going well at work, and the protagonist gave a half-hearted confirmation, which made the Elder chuckle. He had been so small not long ago, but now he had grown and started teaching other kids, which was kind of shocking. He wanted to introduce his co-workers who were lying on the ground in shock. The Elder commented that they didn't look to be in good condition, but Eamon replied that they were always like that, so there was no need to worry. He also introduced the headmistress and deputy headmistress of the school, two very important elves. The Elder approached to shake their hands, introducing himself as Casella. However, Anarel froze to the Elder's surprise, who couldn't understand what was going on. She simply collapsed on the ground after all the chaos with the dragon. The truth was, she wanted to know why there was a black dragon living in a human village. Eamon told Anarel that he was just an elder from the neighborhood who wandered around. He had been around since Eamon was a child and was also quite close to his father. Anarel was surprised that the black dragon was just a local elder, and Casella also said he was old and sick, so he didn't go out much. He also said he didn't know any other dragons nearby, so visiting the property from time to time was his only relief. Eamon even whimpered at the thought that he might be a lonely elder. However, Anarel asked if he didn't think the dragon was more like a stray dog. After all, he was treating him like some kind of pet. The protagonist changed the subject, mentioning that the property was still chaotic, and for now the headmistress should return to the academy. He would take care of the mess. But in truth, Eamon wanted Anarel to stay a little longer, because he had heard that elves had a unique magic that helped crops grow. She was surprised that he knew something like that, and Eamon said that the owner of the King Mango farm wrote about it in a letter. He said that Anarel went there on her day off to cast a spell, and she complained because the man had promised to keep it a secret the whole time. Anarel said that if she stayed there, she'd end up going crazy and couldn't take it. Her hands were trembling non-stop from fear. Eamon pushed her a bit. After all, she'd been wandering around and causing chaos the whole time, and now she was trying to leave just when things started to get tough. At that, she laughed as if he thought she couldn't leave whenever she wanted. After all, she had teleportation magic and could go away whenever she pleased. She started saying to guide her back when a voice mentioned Casella, which made the elf scream in fright, and Eamon laughed because he was just teasing her. But he told her to relax. He said he'd go for a walk around the village. Suddenly, the Elder himself appeared and Anarel screamed, fainting. He asked when the protagonist planned to return to the estate again, and Eamon replied that he still wasn't sure. He thought he'd need a few more months to accumulate time off, but that was perfect for Casella, who said she'd have a gift ready for him by then. The protagonist grew curious, wondering if it was something made of gold, to which Casella replied it was something even more valuable than that. The sudden monster incident turned the excursion into an agricultural project. They focused on planting potatoes every day, but the outcome was clear. They were supposed to return to work the next day, and Amon was exhausted. Those days off had been anything but a real vacation. Truthfully, he had just wanted a chance to visit the estate, and to ask his father for advice before quitting his job as a teacher. The estate didn't end up in good hands. While he was away, the monster attacks had significantly decreased. Their income also ended up decreasing at the same proportion as before. Even with some income under his brother's name, it was nowhere near enough to recover the losses. At that rate, they couldn't even afford the penalty for breaking the contract. Eamon sighed, wondering if maybe he was a harbinger of disaster. Otherwise, there was no reason for so many monsters to attack the moment he arrived, and there was no explanation for a mythical elder drake to suddenly appear. He wondered if his first job, the academy, had turned into a mess because of him. But then Eamon remembered it wasn't his fault, it was the incompetent principals. He needed to succeed soon, but then he stopped when he heard a sound. He wondered if it was another monster, worried, and went to check, only to find that the person on the other side was Sloth, training with her sword. That must have been the true fencing style of the Field family. In fact, she hadn't helped with the farm work earlier. It looked like she had spent the whole time just swinging her sword alone. Eamon couldn't leave it at that. He intended to lecture her, but then he stopped when he saw that she had trained until her hands were bleeding. He wondered why she seemed so desperate during her training. Maybe it was because she always napped during the day, so she had been secretly practicing her swordsmanship at night this whole time. He still had a lot of questions, but for now he decided to pretend he hadn't seen anything. A few days later, back at Amonith Academy, things returned to normal. People came looking for the principal, wanted to speak with her. They wanted to know where Professor Eamon Drake was. It had only been a few days since he'd become a teacher at that academy. He always used to think only about how to escape that awful reality. But from now on, the protagonist planned to actually make things work. He would do his best to diligently teach the students like a real teacher. With their skills, it was obvious they'd become great individuals in the future. And when that happened, Ammon could benefit from it. That was just part of success. Follow the right connections and he'd go far. Suddenly, NRL appeared shouting and startled him into yelling too. She apologized but said she came running because a visitor had come to see him. Ammon went to check who it was and then recognized the person. It was Raymond, who shamelessly stole Chloe's victory in the competition. But not only him, Raymond, his grandfather, had also come to greet him. He was one of the 4 great sword masters of the Empire. The two shook hands with a tense smile in the air as they spoke. Ammon couldn't understand why someone of that status would come just to see him. But this would be the perfect opportunity to make a good impression on one of the big shots, and maybe finally get out of that lousy academy. The Sword King Raymond was a grand and very powerful man. He was a key pillar of the Empire, and he had come to visit a mere teacher like him. Raymond mentioned how amazing it was that Chloe had beaten his grandson. He wanted to see with his own eyes who her teacher was. Moreover, he still considered Ammon to be very important. It had to be like that after all. Ammon had been her teacher, or rather, hadn't done much at all. He replied that he was flattered, since he had helped guide her down the right path. Raymond laughed, saying Ammon was a humble man, and he had come to the right person. Seeing how well he taught his students, he must also be a good swordsman. The protagonist laughed because clearly there had been a misunderstanding. He hadn't been responsible for teaching swordsmanship. He had simply guided her. Raymond was visibly disappointed, commenting that that's not what his grandson had said. Still, Raymond was confused because Chloe had called him her teacher. At that moment, Raymond asked if he could even be called her instructor to begin with. Later on, Sloth introduced herself to him, greeting the king of the celestial sword. He was curious because she was from the Field family. If that were the case, she should be a good teacher. But even so, she seemed to be at most a sword specialist after all. He had heard that the Field family didn't allow any of its members to go adventuring, at least not before they became sword masters. Even so, her mana was quite similar to that of Marcus Field, whom he had met in the past, and he wondered if he could test her. He said that as someone who follows the path of the sword, he couldn't refuse a duel. Sloth agreed and decided to show him the training grounds then. But of course, Ammon wondered why he had expected anything different. He had completely failed to form a connection he could take advantage of. Raymond had completely defeated Sloth, wanting to know if that was all she had. She replied that it wasn't over yet, and he acknowledged she was merely a specialist after all, which made sense. The Field family didn't teach outsiders their secret techniques. So she had taught something special to Chloe after all. Instead, he intended to show one more move using only the branch before finishing. After performing a move that made her tense up, Sloth froze, and he told her to work even harder from now on. She simply thanked him before falling to her knees completely. At that moment, Raymond found Chloe, the one who had given his grandson trouble. Being someone from the Highlands Kingdom of Iran, she must have more stamina and vigor than normal. It wasn't really her training, but her innate talent that made the difference. Chloe got nervous under the swordsman's gaze, so she decided to leave. He wanted to tell the headmistress it had been a pleasure meeting her that day. Ammon agreed, thanking him for showing his incredible skill. Then he froze when he heard about his swordsmanship, and the protagonist agreed. To a normal person, it should have been just a few branch movements. So the swordsman asked what he had found so incredible about it, and Ammon replied that it was the change in trajectory in all 36 attacks. Even so, his center of gravity hadn't wavered at all, and yet he managed to finish. It was all beyond impressive. Right away, the swordsman ordered him to duel, leaving him confused. Ammon didn't understand why, since he could barely even use a sword, but Raymond assured him it would be a simple duel anyway. It was disappointing because he thought the boy might have exceptional talent. The protagonist reflected that if he had the courage to face a great sword master, then he would have left that miserable place a long time ago. Besides, his sword-wielding classmate was pretty pathetic, something Ammon couldn't entirely disagree with. He was starting to question the headmistress's judgment in reaching out to them, and the protagonist had to agree with that sort of criticism. But he wasn't the kind of person to fall for provocations, so he asked him to give up. Raymond laughed. He was sure even the students weren't anything special. Right then, the swordsman charged at the protagonist, who tensed up. He could let a lot of things slide, but not when it came to messing with his rewards. That's when the protagonist hit him on the head with the branch right away. Unable to believe that the king of the celestial sword had passed out just like that. That bastard definitely had to be a fraud, but the kids started panicking. Boris got worried because the swordsman might have died, but Ammon said it was fine. That guy was just a fake, but even so, they were concerned because he seemed to be dying. The protagonist said that dying or not, he was still a fraud. They were going to drag him out of there. Chloe mentioned that he was in even worse shape than someone hit normally should be. Even so, she thought maybe she could get a reward for capturing a fake swordsman. From a distance, Sloth simply watched them silently. But a little later, Anerol made Ammon assume a punishment position, and she yelled at him because the idiot managed to cause trouble for someone important. She told him to shut up before seeing Raymond sit up complaining about a headache. She apologized, saying she personally made sure Ammon would be punished. He replied that it was fine. It wasn't really anyone's fault. After all, he insisted on testing Ammon's skills personally, and that's what happened. Raymond told Ammon that he might not have experience with swordsmanship, but he still possessed great and pure physical strength, and Ammon thanked him for the praise. Even so, suddenly Ammon saw the aura blade that he had used. That was a technique exclusive to great sword masters. He was truly a king of the celestial sword. just as expected. Reinbent says that what the protagonist had was pure physical strength. Against Imperial knights who use mana and swordsmanship obtained through training, the protagonist would always end up at a disadvantage over time. So now he had a proposal to make. He wanted to know if Ammon might be interested in learning from him. The title of Disciple of the Celestial Sword King sounded incredible. If you managed to develop great skills and perform well on the battlefield, the protagonist would succeed and be served everything on a silver platter. He was excited about the training, and Ammon agreed immediately. Now he was thrilled because he would recite the Oath of Loyalty. The protagonist swore he would devote himself to the way of the sword, and also that he would abandon his material desires and worldly cravings. But then he froze, hesitating to keep saying those things. Ammon asked what all of that was, and Rainbent questioned whether he hadn't understood. It was about giving up material desires and worldly ambitions to focus on training. Hearing that, the protagonist hesitated and asked for some time to think about it. Things had been so chaotic until now that he hadn't even noticed anything strange. Ammon wondered why one of the 4 great knights of the Empire was so dirty. Just out of curiosity, he asked what Rainbent's title was, and he replied that it was all just for show. The Emperor once offered him the title of Marcus, but he immediately refused, which made Ammon almost shout, asking why on earth he refused something like that. And Earl asked him not to speak his thoughts out loud like that. Then Ammon questioned him about his supposed fortune. But Rainbent didn't understand the point of collecting lots of pieces of paper. A small piece of land to swing his sword and a cabin were enough for him. At that point, as his disciple, Ammon didn't even dare to keep such desires, which made Rainbent promise that he would kill him with a single strike for sure. Immediately, Ammon stopped to rethink all of these things. Then he noticed Raymond had eaten a lot and still wanted even more. The boy had been devouring cookies for quite a while. In truth, that old man didn't even have enough money to feed his grandson. Not only that, he was also dressed like a commoner during a competition. Even being the disciple of a great swordmaster, he was in that kind of situation. That led Ammon to conclude that nothing good would come from getting involved with people like them. So he excused himself and ran off, leaving the others behind. Along the way, his wallet fell, which he only discovered much later. So he had to return to the school to figure out where he had dropped it. It didn't take long before he ran into Rainman again, who returned his wallet. Ammon was shocked that he was still there, and he replied with something astonishing. He had started working as a guard at a Monmouth Academy. Ammon couldn't understand why, but the swordsman explained. The gatekeeper position at the main entrance was vacant, so he decided to take it for now. The protagonist exclaimed that he wasn't suited at all to be involved in the academic world, practically telling him to go back to the mountains where he came from. Instead, Raymond asked him not to worry and asked if he should take Ray back home. But Raymond was already a sword master now, so there was no need to watch over him. Besides, it was time for him to receive an education appropriate for his age. Ammon realized too late that Raymond was going to enroll in the school, but the tuition was very expensive, so he would work to pay it off, which made the protagonist let out a huge sigh of exhaustion. Even though he knew nothing about swordsmanship, he still had strong faith in education. So Raymond believed that Ammon would be able to teach his grandson well. Therefore, he was counting on his efforts from then on. He never would have imagined that teaching clothes so well would come back to haunt him like this. He decided to step out in the middle of the night to get some water and think about it. The history class would start the following week, and he heard a noise. Wondering who would be awake so late, he ran into Bless, who looked like a real monster. So much so that Ammon screamed in fright. He asked her why she was walking around at that hour of the night, and Bless replied that the smell of fresh potatoes was coming from his room. He must have had potatoes in there, and if he said no, she would break in immediately. The protagonist decided to hand them over, as long as Bless calmed down a bit. Ammon's mother had given him a bag of potatoes to bring when he returned home. To Ammon, this was his sanctuary in the middle of his exhausting life away from home. The protagonist couldn't believe he had to share that sanctuary with the person he liked the least. Now that they had 10 potatoes there, they could each eat 5. Suddenly, Mario showed up asking what they were doing. Ammon replied that they were there to eat a boiled potato as a late-night snack. Bless just got more irritated because she'd have to share her snack. That's when the headmistress, Boris, and Chloe also appeared out of nowhere. And Errol said she found the students wandering around at night, so she was about to scold them when she heard they were coming back from the training field. In the end, the fire there was just a potato party, and Bless got even more stressed. Sloth showed up a little later wanting to eat after a night training session. Even Bless was surprised because she was drooling from hunger. Finally, Rainbent and Raymond appeared after smelling the wonderful food. Bless screamed in frustration for Ammon to grab all the potatoes right away. The protagonist had thought it was strange that she'd been quiet. Now she was showing her true colors. Ignoring that, she shouted again for him to grab all the potatoes immediately. Even after an argument, the protagonist brought the whole sack of potatoes. Anyway, they eventually finished cooking and decided to eat them. Even Raymond and Rainbent were impressed by how delicious the potatoes were. Ammon said they were a specialty from his region. They were very proud of them. Now they could understand why the protagonist was so strong. It was only natural after eating such mana-dense food every day. His body had adapted to the mana, and the protagonist ended up agreeing. After all, his territory was full of strong people, but there was nothing special about that. Those potatoes were grown from seeds bought from a nearby city. Maybe the land in his territory really was that fertile. Ammon reflected that now it didn't matter, he would just focus on the potatoes. Sloth kept staring at him, and he asked what was with that look of disgust. Until suddenly, she told Ammon to marry her, making him spit out all the food. But she was completely serious about it, leaving him baffled. Mario immediately started laughing loudly, and Sloth couldn't believe it. In truth, she was too good for a guy like Ammon, and she wasn't the only one who thought so. After a while, the two went out for a walk, and Sloth asked him how much he knew about the Field family. The protagonist said their family was famous for their impressive swordsmanship, and that all direct heirs were sword masters. That was all he knew. Sloth mentioned that there was something else very important about that. Their family cared deeply about their reputation, so they didn't allow anyone to leave home before becoming sword masters. The protagonist thought that, based on her sword aura and the skills she had shown, at most she could be called a sword specialist. If it didn't let anyone below sword master level leave, it was still odd that Sloth was at school while only being at that level. And Eamon ended up getting caught red-handed with his rude thoughts. Then Sloth said her family had actually always treated her badly. Throughout her life, they had never cared about her. The protagonist was caught off guard. He had never seen her act that way before. When she asked why he was looking at her like that, he said it was nothing. Truthfully, it was like Sloth had told him about her past as if it meant nothing. And she agreed. It was fine because she had gotten used to it. No matter how much she tried, she couldn't become a sword master. And that was probably why they treated her so poorly. Then one day, her father, the patriarch, told her to go to a Monolith Academy. And Sloth understood what he meant by that. They would act as if she didn't exist. Even so, she tried to resist, saying she couldn't disobey the family's rules, and said she didn't need to worry about things like that. After they cast her out, they didn't even come looking for her. They didn't need someone as weak as Sloth, and they probably just wanted her to go live on her own. But while she was eating that potato, she had an epiphany, and thought that if she had more of that, maybe she could show her family her potential. Given her situation, she guessed they didn't care about her at all. Even if she ended up marrying someone like Ammon. Despite her situation being different from his, she could understand that sense of desolation. Only the eldest son could inherit the noble title, and as the second, you would get nothing. Ammon's family might even care about him, but that didn't change much. He was still just like her at the end of the day. He had to find his own way to survive. After all, that's how things were, and that's why he understood the proposal to marry her. Apparently, it was so he could eat the potatoes and become stronger through grace. A true marriage of convenience, just like all noble marriages. Aemon asked what he was supposed to gain from this, and she smiled, saying he just needed to think a little. First, he would gain a wife as beautiful as her. And Aemon smiled, since in truth he preferred character over beauty by far. Then, after eating the potatoes, he would become stronger and return to his family. He might even end up winning the fight for succession, after all. Aemon finally understood what she had been thinking, and Sloth asked if he really thought he could handle all the work of being the leader. But he didn't need to worry. Everything else would be completely on him. Apparently, Amon would take care of the finances and he'd be thrilled doing it. Poor management was the most beautiful word in his personal dictionary, and by becoming part of the family, he could simply learn swordsmanship. The power of a marquis, fortune, and swordsmanship. Those were the kinds of things involved. It was like hitting 3 birds with 1 stone. Aemon decided they should tell his new father-in-law about the marriage the next day. The following morning, he felt like the sun of his life was finally rising. Now he could say goodbye to his poor self. But in any case, waiting for Sloth took a while. She decided to go to the hair salon first before heading out. She usually slept in a sack, but suddenly went there out of nowhere. When she peeked through the window, the hairdresser wondered what was wrong with him. He was wearing a black suit, like he was going to a funeral. Sloth said she was with him, and the woman assumed he must be her servant. Aemon kept wondering what she was doing in there after 3 hours. The woman came outside to ask if there was a problem, and he asked what had happened to the blonde girl with bird hair and a dead face. However, Sloth asked who exactly he was talking about. She came out of the salon and asked him to wait a bit longer as she was almost done. Aemon was left wondering who that girl was out of nowhere, and then finally recognized her, which made Sloth laugh at his sudden reaction. But it made sense. She didn't usually take care of her appearance. But when she did, the difference it made was pretty big. They were all in the same boat now, and Aemon at least wanted to get along with her. Thinking about it, she had only done her hair and put on a little makeup. It wasn't surprising. She was naturally beautiful. Sloth felt very proud now that he must have finally understood the situation. Then the hairdresser told the servant to leave because she had to finish the job. Aemon was confused, and Sloth revealed that he was actually her fiancé, which shocked the woman, who immediately apologized. It was a bit shocking to the protagonist that she had just let that excuse slide. Sloth's villainous smile was now well marked in Aemon's memory. But it was obvious this would happen. Just because she looked pretty didn't mean her personality would improve. The city of Lingsley was under her father's rule, Batista Lingsley Field. She never thought that before being expelled from the family, she wouldn't get a chance to know this place. Aemon was impressed that her father ruled such a large city. It was all good, and he assured Sloth of that, because in the future, that city would be nothing more than a toy in his hands. But that made her frown, asking if he was only there for the money. Aemon replied that that's how marriages of convenience worked after all. At Marcus Field's mansion, Sloth advised the protagonist to stay quiet, at least when they were together with her father. When asked why, she said her father didn't listen to anyone. No matter how busy the family was, he continued holding meetings frequently. All 13 swords of the family had to be present. The 13 swords were the best swordsmen in her family. The patriarch was the first, and all the others were her older brothers in order. Aemon was impressed, not exactly understanding what she meant, or so he thought, until he felt all 13 pairs of eyes staring deeply at him. Faced with all that pressure, the protagonist found himself being stared at. They were the 13 swords of the Field family, and they didn't look friendly at all, especially Sloth's father, the one who would become his new father-in-law. One of the 4 great sword masters of the Batista Empire, Lingsley Field. Currently, the sword master was also the patriarch of the Marquis Field family. Sloth approached to greet her father as soon as she entered. She wanted to talk about something very important that day. While working as a teacher at a Monolith Academy, something had happened. She met someone with whom she wanted to build a future, and so she went to her father to share this news. Sloth introduced him. He was the son of Baron Drake, with whom she had built this relationship. And immediately, Aemon bowed as he introduced himself to the Marquis. Even though that marriage had not yet been approved, she wanted his blessing. But then Sloth noticed that the table had fallen into a deep silence, They didn't care at all about what she was saying. Then the words of the weak weren't even worth being heard. This made her wonder if she was truly that unwanted in this family. At that, she turned to leave, and Aman was confused about why. If she left so suddenly, he wouldn't be able to do anything alone. Then the patriarch paused to reflect on what he had just heard about Aemon, and soon ordered Lancelot forward, who stood up to attack immediately. The protagonist was confused, not understanding what was happening so suddenly. Aemon was dodging the attacks while Lancelot asked if this was his final wish. It was absolute madness. He was saying that to fulfill his own wish. Aemon wondered what he should do. He had come there for marriage approval, so hitting him could be a problem, but he acted in self-defense. Suddenly, Lancelot was immediately defeated with just one blow. The other side, because that guy was the weakest of them all anyway. Now the next to rise was Cancelot, again taken down with one strike. Next, the 11th sword was sent to fight, again defeated with a punch. They still believed that only the weak ones were being defeated. Next time, one of them suggested they should use their swords. But Batista refused. They couldn't show such a noble art to someone like him. Aemon smiled because even so, he was the fastest of them all there. Even the 9th sword ended up falling from the first strike he received. Suddenly, the protagonist felt a murderous presence coming his way. Batista asked how he dared defeat 4 of the family's elite knights like that, and asked if he was trying to die. Aemon didn't understand the reason for that. It seemed like this marriage was putting his life at risk, but it wasn't worth it. The patriarch continued, saying that if he had any final words, they would listen. Aemon felt pressured by the man's enormous presence and size, and asked why the Marquis was acting like this, just trying to understand. Batista asked back if he really didn't know what he had done wrong, and Aemon bowed in agreement, asking him to say it because he truly didn't understand. At that, the man asked how he dared deceive his beautiful and beloved daughter like that, with those nefarious schemes, and still claimed he didn't know anything. Right then, the protagonist froze in confusion over what he had heard. The others were equally furious that a scoundrel like him had done that, seducing his daughter, the small and delicate girl, into a life like that. And they cursed him as a useless, insolent wretch, not even comparable to her little sister. She might be his daughter, but she was so adorable every time they saw her. The brothers agreed, for they felt equally enchanted. Alman was shocked by what he was hearing. It could be that they were silent earlier because they froze in front of Sloth. It had been a while since they had last seen her. And the others agreed. She looked a lot like their mother. Aemon ended up frozen in shock. That family really adored Sloth. And suddenly, the girl herself returned, and the protagonist asked where she had been. In fact, she had heard everything they said from outside. Until then, she didn't know how they really felt about him. The whole family gathered and embraced, apologizing for the misunderstanding. Now they intended to do better so that Sloth would feel good, so that she wouldn't need to push herself and could stay healthy enough. Aemon just watched it all with tears in his eyes, happy that she had achieved that. Inside, he lamented because he had lost the chance to make money. The ambitious marriage proposal was forgotten after the family reunited. Sharing their loving feelings and thus reconciling, the protagonist had to return to his previous daily routine. When they left the house, the protagonist asked Sloth why she came back too. She could have just stayed at the Marquis estate all this time. Now there were no more misunderstandings, so everything should be fine. And Sloth replied that they used to say the path of the sword was the harshest and most vicious of all. Her father and brothers didn't want her to walk such a dangerous path. They let her go because they wanted her to live her own life freely. But even so, she wanted to continue forging her own path. At that, Sloth said that when she left, her younger brother gave her a letter. Aemon replied that he should have said it in person instead, which made the girl ask why he sounded so disappointed about that. And he shot back that his path to success had been completely annihilated. He couldn't be more miserable, and certainly not from the thought of not marrying her. They used to say that once a dragon shakes your heart, a lizard would do the same. Every time he saw her, he would feel like he had lost a shot at success, and that it had been completely torn away from him forever. Sloth pinched Aemon, who grumbled from the pain after talking so much. Meanwhile, Anarol wondered whether she should tell Aemon what she had discovered. A little later, the protagonist arrived at the headmistress's office to talk. He said they had gone to visit the Marquis in the countryside, and it was all a misunderstanding. That was why communication was so important. But then Aemon noticed that she seemed down for some reason. And then he found out with a shout that the King Mango farm had gone bankrupt. They had received a bankruptcy notice from the King Mango farm. Due to monsoons and unexpected floods, their investment project had failed. Because of that ritual they performed for a good harvest, a historic flood had occurred. And it was so bad that even the world's spirit had been affected by it. So he expected compensation for that and for his future as well. Anarel said it was still the same dance they did in her homeland. It worked very well there, but for some reason, that was the result this time. Aemon understood the situation a bit better now and asked how they would be compensated, and she smiled, replying that as for that, there was no problem. As long as there was no evidence linking that temporal phenomenon to the elves' traditional dance, the Imperial investigation team wouldn't act, and Aemon accused her of being shameless. She smiled, replying that even with the 400 gold coins they still had, they could use it to find another investment and reorganize. Aemon retorted that none of that compared to what they had when they started. They were supposed to have another 4,900 gold coins to use. She had a pretty good idea, and he told her to shut up because he didn't even want to hear it. He didn't even want to hear about that stupid snail race anymore. Anarel grumbled because he was saying those things again. She had already said snail races only happen once every 10 years. Aemon asked what it was then, and she said it was a unicorn race. He immediately flicked her forehead. After all, she never changed. She quickly suggested that they could invest in a new substance. It had been discovered recently, but Aemon looked away about it, as if digging something out of the ground was a big deal to begin with. Aemon asked how things would turn out. He'd end up being associated with all the businesses, especially once their value was assessed in the future. It was ridiculous, because they knew it was all nonsense. The business owner even gave it a bizarre name to make black oil sound good. The protagonist asked what kind of crap that petroleum was with such a horrible name. There wasn't a single decent investment there. She should try thinking better about that, instead of trying to inflate her earnings with things like that. They should focus on the main problem first before anything else. The academy was an educational institution that encouraged nurturing the empire's young blood. So every year they were supposed to provide generous financial support to the academy. And Arel replied that they were advised to shut down the academy, so they couldn't get any of that. And Ammon agreed, so he needed her help to make it work. He had heard that she was a friend of the emperor, and Anarel agreed. After all, it had only been about 50 years since then. There was only one way now, and it was simply to bribe the emperor. Anarel shouted not to joke about that and asked if he thought everyone was like that. Ammon replied that what really mattered was the intention. After all, she should know exactly what the emperor liked to begin with. Listening from the other side of the door was Raymond, not understanding anything that was happening. Now he had discovered that their academy might go bankrupt. Later, the headmistress went to present the famous dragon bananas to the emperor. He didn't understand the reason for offering such a valuable gift, and she replied that it was nothing special, since they were friends. But from her expression, it looked like she was hoping for something else. And he immediately asked if she wanted to negotiate the cancellation of the recommendation to suspend the academy's operations. And Earl stammered that the emperor was as sharp as always. Sandro didn't understand what there was to hide in their friendship. In fact, he said he was thinking of avoiding the suspension after all. But considering past incidents, he couldn't decide that on his own. That's when the emperor recognized the children she was accompanied by. They were the ones who had participated in the recent competition. They were all from Amonith Academy, and Sandro could understand things now. Considering the students' incredible achievements, he would speak with the prime minister, and thus try to cancel the suspension recommendation. Anarel was emotional because he had truly decided to do that, and he replied with a laugh that yes, and she deeply thanked him for it. Suddenly, Sandro smelled a familiar scent and immediately became alert. Outside, Amon was worried, wondering how things were going. That elf might not have much charisma, but she should be able to get the recommendation reversed, and thus get what she wanted as long as she could persist for a while. He might be a bit extreme when it came to family, but he was a wise king. As long as Sandro didn't meet Ammon, everything should be fine. It didn't take more than a few minutes for the protagonist to be found by the king. Ammon screamed in shock when Sandro appeared, furious to yell at him. Now he understood why he had been smelling the disgusting scent of the drakes. He must be the mastermind behind all of this until now. Ammon didn't understand, so the king wanted to know if he had pressured the princess, all to cancel the suspension recommendation by deceiving him. He didn't get it. He had only done his job as a teacher at the academy. Ammon asked him to leave his feelings out of business. The ignorance of the Drake family and the school issue had nothing to do with each other. They had shown in the competition that they had the necessary competence to be able to raise children who could be of his interest. But the academy's current situation was deplorable at this point. The children had to go hungry because of the academy's bankruptcy, and the lack of funds was destroying the academy's programming. They didn't even have the basics for teaching. But of course, that wasn't entirely true. Still, he used it as a speech because before being a member of the Drake family, their Amon was just an educator trying to help others. The fact that the academy's poverty forced the students to go hungry and had no access to education that deeply discouraged him. Therefore, he bowed, pleading from the bottom of his heart to be generous, and thus withdraw the recommendation to suspend the academy. Inside, Amon was quite proud. His speech had been perfect. The tears of pride, belief, and desperation of a teacher for his students. His opponent was an emperor who valued students and education. He gave a powerful speech about education and the students, so now Sandro should be moved and convinced to help. But when he looked around, everyone didn't care at all about what he said. The Drakes talked too much, and he just asked if he was finished. Ammon got irritated and told him to go easy because he was just annoying him. After all, he was being bothered over things he didn't even know about. Right then, Sandro laughed because Ammon was showing his true self. Hidden nearby, the queen asked Kai what he believed in, and Caius Amonith, the prince of the empire, replied that he believed in Ammon's victory. At that moment, the queen seemed frustrated and irritated, and the prince asked if she was talking about the withdrawal of the recommendation. When she agreed, it made him pause to reflect a bit. After hearing what Ammon had to say, the prince ended up concluding it would be better to withdraw the recommendation and see what would happen. Even though regrettable things had happened there in the past, they should be generous in supporting students who were that talented. The queen realized her son was thinking the same way. The Drake family must have really bothered Sandro for someone like him to act like that. It was obvious. He had only met Belial Drake twice back then and couldn't take it anymore. Belial Drake was Ammon's grandfather when Sandro was still a prince, and they had fought many times. But when looking at it that way, Ammon seemed far more decent compared to Belial. So Kai was determined to ensure there would be no more feuds between the two families. At least starting from his generation, he wanted to make it work. Hearing this from her son, she decided it was time to end the wild dog fight. Even though the bribe was a good offensive move, they couldn't revoke the recommendation because the emperor got beaten up and the empress asked them to leave. Ammon wondered when things had started going so wrong. In any case, he returned to the school so classes could resume. That's when he saw Raymond with a doll beside him for some reason. Boris said it wasn't a doll, and the protagonist asked what it was then, and Raymond hugged the doll, saying it was himself. Ammon didn't understand anything and left to talk to Raymond's father, who got all excited, asking if he was finally going to become his disciple. However, it was the protagonist who said that his grandson had gone mad. Raymond asked if that was how young people these days challenge someone to a duel, and the protagonist quickly denied it because Ray was acting crazy, hugging a doll, and still claiming it was himself for some reason. Now Raymond could understand the reason behind those questions. The truth was that Raymond had Prince syndrome. Ammon didn't understand what that even meant so suddenly, and asked why he wasn't carrying a mirror instead of a doll. Raymond replied that at first it was a mirror, just like expected. But someday he made a doll that was a perfect replica of himself. And then he started carrying it around, which surprised Ammon. And he agreed he even made a new one when he grew up. Raymond tried to take it gently, but Raymond screamed until he lost his voice. Ammon said that even so, he wasn't carrying anything during the competition. And the grandfather said he had told him to hide his skills and identity back then, to try and fix his condition, so he enrolled him there. All because Raymond had a little hope. The protagonist didn't understand, but the old man had hoped it was him. That's because Ammon had taken him down with a single strike despite being a sword master. He was a teacher capable of training a normal student like Chloe to become able to compete equally against Ray. He believed a great teacher like Ammon could put Ray on the right path. Sighing, the protagonist felt an unnecessary pressure being placed on his shoulders. Still remembering those words, Ammon hoped he could live up to it. He couldn't even manage the academy's finances. Suddenly, Raymond showed up and startled Ammon with his doll, saying not to just stick it in people's faces like that. And Raymond apologized for scaring him like that. Anyway, he asked the boy what exactly he wanted, and Raymond asked if the academy was perhaps facing difficulties. Ammon didn't know how he found that out, but assured him not to worry. The adults would take care of it. He should focus on his studies. But Raymond replied that he had an idea. It could open an exhibit for his doll. Ammon didn't get it, but Raymond was convinced it would draw crowds. Everyone would want to see his doll. There were several empty rooms around, so they could borrow one and invite even more people, and thus become famous while selling doll replicas. After hearing Ray's grand plan, Ammon was absolutely certain. After that day, Raymond began appearing at odd hours throughout his day, and began pressuring the protagonist for a favorable response. He never considered it seriously, but had no choice but to accept. Raven claimed he could do it with no money at all as long as he had a room, since he said that Ammon ended up approving a special exhibition for the academy. But the boy even made flyers to promote his event. He was taking the whole situation quite seriously despite everything. Anyway, half the academy's rooms were actually empty. No matter what Raymond did, Ammon at least wanted to see what he had prepared. Then he froze in shock at what he suddenly saw. It looked like some kind of cult with how dark that room was. Raymond started speaking, but Ammon ran away in desperation. The boy was left behind, a little hurt because he was called a ghost. In the city of Amber, rumors began to spread about an exhibition that was going to happen. People were curious to know more about the Great Legacy Academy. They couldn't wait to see the pieces that would be on display. It didn't take long before Raymond became confused, because suddenly dozens of people showed up to see the exhibition. Ammon also appeared, not knowing where all those people had come from. And Raymond himself said he wanted to know what was going on, because he had found the flyer while on duty at the guard post. After a while, the protagonist explained what had happened. Ammon didn't understand what they were supposed to do with all those people. There was no way to control them all with just the two of them. The old man asked where the other teachers were, and the protagonist sighed. All of them had left to enjoy life without caring about anything else. Even the vice director had quit everything, though she had never supported it anyway. After everything, even Anarel got angry at him. At that, Ammon asked where Raymond had gone, and his grandfather sighed. He had fallen ill since the day before after working too hard. And the protagonist realized they'd end up having to deal with all those people alone. And as soon as they saw the exhibition, they'd never want to come back. It was obvious everyone would run away screaming after seeing the dolls. Everyone would scream in shock, calling them uncultured people. No matter how ugly something is, there should always be meaning behind it. That really was a hellish sight, and no one understood what kind of art it was supposed to be. Because of the visitors' reactions, rumors spread everywhere. Among commoners and nobility alike, regardless of rank, everyone would end up hearing about it. The number of visitors only increased because they were curious. Ammon and Raymond had to manage the crowd and organize them into lines, but it was no use. Not everyone was listening, and the protagonist had to use his secret weapon. So he went to beg for help from the headmistress, the vice director, and the high staff. They needed help managing the crowd as things stood. With that, they all came to help and manage the lines more effectively. Everyone ended up impressed. Raymond had done all that in just a few days. Mario didn't understand anything about art, but he knew someone out there would see its value. Ammon sighed, hoping that might actually happen. Eventually, people began to leave and stopped visiting the exhibit. They began to wonder whether they should close it down now. Those dolls, all together like that, if looked at one by one, could even be cute. The piece seemed like a reflection of society trapped in false smiles. There was a certain charm to it that held your gaze in a strange way. Ammon approached a man to inform him they were about to close. The man wanted to know how much the doll in question cost, and the protagonist replied that it was worth 1 silver coin. The price was a bit high, but part of the money raised would go to the students, and it could help with their basic needs and the academy in general. A bit later, Mario asked how much money the exhibition had made. Ammon replied with a sigh that unfortunately, it hadn't made anything. An entrance fee or any sales could have brought in some money, but entry was free, and no one bought anything in the end. That's why Raymond must have been pretty upset. Ray was irritated because those idiots didn't understand his sophisticated art, and Ammon replied that it was obvious people lacked the intellect. Although the boy retorted that he couldn't talk since he also ran away when he saw it. This was his chance to spread his beauty to the world. Now he'd have to make another exhibition using 2 buildings this time. In the following days, Ammon saw Raymond prepare several of those dolls, and still, he didn't miss a single class. Besides that, the quality of each doll was quite impressive, not to mention those terrifying eyes. He hadn't paid much attention at first, thinking it was just because he was good with his hands. After all, he was a swordsman, but still, it was odd. Ammon wanted to understand the reason behind his fixation with the exhibition to that extent. He pushed himself until he collapsed from overwork, and still he was trying to keep up with his studies afterward. He could leave the academy's financial problems to the adults. He didn't need to push himself so hard. After all, he was just a student. And Raymond said this was the most comfortable life he had ever had. Because in the mountains, he always had to do everything alone. Whether it was food, clothes, or friends, he wanted to take care of everything by himself. From the life he had now, he wanted to be able to protect it. Thinking about it, Ammon realized that he just wanted the academy to fall apart. That was because he always had a home to return to, a place to go back to. But the children there weren't like that. Boris had no one to care for him. His village had completely disappeared 2 years ago. Chloe came from the kingdom of Aran to study. Her country had lost a war in the past. And Raymond wanted to protect the safe life he had finally found. In the midst of his thoughts, the protagonist froze until he heard Sloth. She had appeared carrying several items, donations from her family that had been sent. Suddenly, Anarel showed up all cheerful to share the news. The Emperor had agreed to withdraw the suspension recommendation, and their monthly financial support had also been reinstated. Rainbit was quite happy too, because the good news wasn't over yet. An elderly man had been moved by Raymond's exhibition the day before, so he would donate to the academy so that Ray could focus on his art. Ammon asked if the others also had good news, but both Bless and Mario were just there as usual with nothing extra. Still, everyone else wanted to thank the protagonist. It was all thanks to him. Now they could lift him up and show their gratitude. Ammon didn't understand exactly what he had done to earn such recognition. They said Amon was the one always standing strong through everything, and they tossed him into the air celebrating, for he was the great savior of the school. Somehow, he wanted to feel happy about it, even though there were some insults mixed in. The Amonith Academy was officially back after that. 6 months had passed since the protagonist had been appointed to the academy. The financial problems that once seemed impossible to solve had suddenly found their fix and were resolved. So Ammon could begin living a calmer life now. Or so he thought, until he suddenly received new news. He heard from Anarel about an upcoming exchange competition. The exchange competition was an event in which various academies participated. They were supervised by the royal family and competed across many fields. The academy would receive a trophy from the royal family. It was a new opportunity. Also, they could make their academies more well-known. The academies competed every year to expand. Mario agreed. The suspension recommendation had been successfully removed, and because of that, they could now join the exchange competition. Even so, Amon responded by asking the headmistress to think a little more about it. Now wasn't the right time to take on something like that. Unlike the previous tournament, the exchange competition had far more categories. Even the smallest academies had hundreds of students. They would end up being at a numerical disadvantage. They needed to think more carefully. Since it was supervised by the royal family, they couldn't back out if they didn't want to participate. But Anarel replied that they had already signed up, and Ammon froze, not understanding the point of this meeting if that was already the case. Mario held the protagonist back to calm him down. After all, it could be a good experience. But Ammon didn't believe that. It would probably be a golden opportunity to get beaten up. The teacher said their students had done well in the last tournament. They could at least manage something in the magic and sword categories. Sighing, the protagonist ended up being forced to accept it all. Still, a ruined academy reopening so soon felt like a joke. That was the opinion of the man from Bestrick Academy, the one known as the best in the Empire, bold enough to say it aloud. It was time for them to settle old disputes between schools. Time to break his personal record too. He was determined to make it happen. Meanwhile, Amon felt exhausted. It seemed like problems just kept piling up. Their academy would be competing against the best in the entire empire. Mario asked him to relax, but the protagonist couldn't do it. After all, the other academy had thousands of students and hundreds of teachers. And it wasn't just about numbers. All their graduates were standouts. They were high-level mages and knights from noble lineages, attracting attention wherever they went. Amon felt like it was eggs being thrown at rocks, hoping to cause damage. But Mario again asked him to relax a little. Even if there were rumors that their academy had just recently reopened, most people still thought they were all struggling. If they did well during the exchange competition, the result could be fantastic. Many people would want to join, and Ammon could somewhat see his point. If they were to win the exchange competition, the news would spread far and wide. They could return to their former glory, but it wasn't just a matter of time. Still, it helped him understand the headmistress's intentions. She wanted to revive the academy as quickly as possible. Ammon agreed they could make it work, and he smiled a little. After all, he wouldn't be the one suffering. He was giving all the kids hard lessons and making them read dissertations. He would make them all learn quickly, even if it was a bit too much. Boris was reminded that if he could endure the studies, he'd become rich and eat whatever he wanted. Ammon also pressured Chloe to focus even more than she already did. Even Raymond, even though they were all exhausted. But then the protagonist said that Ray could actually take it easy. Raymond asked if he was going to participate in the swordsman event, and Ammon denied it. In fact, it would be in a completely different category. But that didn't matter now. He just told him to keep reading as usual, especially Chloe and Boris. They weren't allowed to leave until they finished everything. Both were pressured, buried under things to read and study. The protagonist said that good knowledge fit well in a good mind, and he told them to repeat it with him about good knowledge, so they'd remember it properly. Thus began the nightmare of the exhibition tournament part 2 in their lives. Amonith Academy versus Bestrick Academy was about to begin. The day of the competition had arrived. Director Benjamin from Bestrick Academy greeted Anarel, saying how she hadn't changed all over the years, and she smiled, replying that it was because she was an elf. He must have thought she died of old age. Benjamin saw the students who would participate and thought it was a joke. They were all exhausted, and the teachers weren't much better either. Amonith Academy really had several talents, he laughed, saying he was envious. Anarel agreed. It seemed his wrinkled old eyes were good for something. The two continued to bicker, and the protagonist noticed their argument. Anerol didn't even hesitate to snap back. She didn't even seem like the director he knew. Then Mario recognized someone named Espadel Zanasir. He was a famous sword mage from the Magic Tower. Mario hadn't expected to see him there. Espadel introduced himself as the Imperial Supervisor and noted both academies were present. And so he announced the beginning of the interschool exchange competition. The first round would be on magical theory and magic circle construction. Unlike the exhibition tournament, they had only 4 days to prepare, all to make the exchange competition work. And Ammon had to go all in on preparation. But they were still a prestigious academy, so even their first opponent wasn't easy. Mario recognized the student from the Magic Tower and wondered what his deal was. After all, he was holding a flower in his mouth like it was nothing. Anerol said he was well known for both his beauty and magical skills. Not that it was any of their business, and soon the boy saw his first opponent. It was Boris, who looked exhausted. Magic was a discipline tied to talent and bloodline. But Boris looked like a nobody, a mere plebeian with no qualities. The boy introduced himself as Meyer Delman, and Boris introduced himself too. Meyer was surprised. He didn't even have a family name. Espadel announced that in this round they would have to build a magic circle, and then enter a discussion about each other's theories. Meyer decided to begin, confident that the plebeian should pay attention. He would show what real magic looked like, and Espadel watched carefully. He could construct a magic circle without any medium, even at such a young age. Then they asked Boris to analyze the magic circle he had made. Meyer thought it was far too advanced for someone like Boris. Only someone at the 4th circle level could use that spell. But then Boris explained it was actually an inefficient circle for a blindness spell, and pointed out Meyer's magic circle. If 2 of the outer lines were removed, mana would flow much better. Also, he questioned whether that lower line was really necessary. The hypothesis that mana required reinforcement lines had been disproven long ago. Meyer didn't understand anything Boris was saying. However, Espadel agreed because Boris had made a valid point. It seemed that even someone like him knew Jalame's obscure theory, and he asked Boris to now present his own magic circle. But since he paused, Meyer thought he was pathetic, unable to cast magic. He'd probably just draw a training circle or something basic. But then Meyer saw a magic circle he had never seen in his life. They recognized it as an 8th circle flame storm. Everyone was shocked. The boy had drawn such a complex circle in mere seconds. It was absurd to the other school. Even mid-level mages wouldn't do that easily. They wondered if he had just memorized the circle, and Ammon thought that was the case. After all, he had made Boris learn that just in the final minute. At the time, the protagonist introduced a secret tea recipe from Vice Director Blessed Tribe. Boris was worried it looked like poison just by glancing at it. But the protagonist explained it was an anti-sleep preparation. He also gave him a Remember the Pain spell written on a scroll. The next day, Boris was exhausted, but he finally read all the documents. Ammon was so proud, and the result was that Boris won the first round. Espadel promised he would remember his name after that. When he graduates, it is recommended that he look for Bryling from the Imperial Court. The boy was so shocked that he barely reacted to his own victory. Anerol gifted the boy with a reward, which made him give thanks. And Ammon says he truly felt very proud of him for his efforts. That's because this brooch was a symbol of recruitment by the court. He secured a position as an Imperial mage after graduation. Boris was impressed by the kind of gift he received, and Ammon strokes his head, commenting that he just had to hold on a little longer. He could eat all the meat he wanted as promised. Boris cries and hugs his teacher, happy with what he had achieved. But then he ends up fainting from exhaustion, and Ammon smiles, realizing he had given his all. When thinking about the Imperial mages, the protagonist decides to take the boy back to his room. He was really very lucky, almost felt jealous of him now. Anerol decides to let Ammon handle it, while he himself lamented. He was rotting away in that backwater school, and his student was chosen to be a mage. For some reason, he ended up feeling a bit jealous of his student. Meanwhile, Director Benjamin did not expect the commoner to surpass them, and he asks if there's anyone else at Amonith they should worry about. And a teacher responds that they had a student who came in first in the competition, both in swordsmanship and in that year's exhibition. The second round would be about history, and Espadel asked the participants to step forward. At least it seemed one of them was a sword expert. He would probably participate in the sword round. And they soon see that it was Raymond approaching, and the others whisper, recognizing that he was the boy who won the swordsmanship competition at the exhibition. Even so, it was strange for him to take part in the history round. Benjamin thinks that Elf Headmistress was truly a great fool. Sending a swordsman to a history competition seemed like madness. Their student had received offers to work as a politician and diplomat in various kingdoms. Benjamin's student understood a lot about history and was well prepared. The history round was a guaranteed victory for the Bestrick Academy. This test would be similar to the previous one. Each participant would present a topic, and this topic would then be discussed. So since the Amonith Academy won before, Raymond would be the one to present the discussion topic first, and he asks what the significance of the Marquis Manhwa's rebellion was. The others start laughing, not understanding what kind of topic that was, not believing he was even a student of the academy at that point. Ammon feels that Raymond was indeed a great fool. He began with such a simple topic in the round's questions, and immediately the boy responded with 100 things rapidly, and Espadel asks what Raymond had to say about that answer. Then, as the boy remains silent, the student John decided to silence him. John says that in the territories outside the Empire, where Duke Everglow and the Grand Duchy share a border, there was a recent incident. He would like to discuss the conflicts that arose from it. Mario realizes he had chosen a rather complicated subject, and Ammon agrees that incident involved many political factors. The Bestrick Academy had access to various resources and the latest news, On the other hand, Amonith, which had just overcome financial hardships, only had access to ancient history books and outdated documents. The difference in information quality was enormous, and Raymond acknowledged the difficulty and asks which specific incident he was referring to. After all, John mentioned a recent incident and asks if he was talking about the battle between the regular army and the mercenaries in the neutral zone, or it could be about the mysterious disappearance of the Archduke's escort. Even Amon was impressed because the boy knew so much information, and John responds that the intent was to discuss any incident, so it could be any of them, but he stammers as he speaks. After all, he knew he had never heard of any of those incidents. Amon was impressed. He thought the boy was only good with a sword, and Ray says they would discuss the conflict with the Grand Duchy caused by a strange incident that occurred on Boston Mountain in Duke Everglow's territory. In the end, Raymond was a master swordsman even in history. The suggestion made the boy nervous, and he stammered in response. After all, he had no idea what this topic was about, and John tells the supervisor that he hadn't even heard about such an incident. Aspedal replies that this thing happened about 2 years ago. It ended up worsening the conflict between the Grand Duchy and Duke Everglow. Aspedal thinks that both sides kept it secret, so the incident should have been buried. Even so, it was shocking that someone could know things like that. Raymond appears saying it was time for Ray to act, and the others are surprised. They didn't have any plan to show up now, but it was obvious. They wouldn't miss this for anything. His grandson was participating in a historic competition. Even Aspedal was impressed, recognizing the king of the divine sword. Knowing that Raymond was his grandson made things make much more sense, since Raymond lives in the Boston Mountains in Duke Everglow's territory. Raymond was the cause of the strange incident in the Boston Mountains, and that was what Raymond was trying to mention. Raymond was picking wild vegetables when a group of noble children from the duchy ended up mistaking him for a lost old man and played tricks on him. They just ended up being destroyed as a result. Such a pathetic incident triggering a political dispute was quite shameful, so both sides ended up keeping silent. Aspedal freezes when he notices the swordsman's gaze, wondering if he had been seen. Raymond thinks it was quite unnecessary for Ray to bring up that incident. He didn't want things to escalate, so he wanted Aspedal to let it go. The voice projection using an absurd amount of mana scared Aspedal. He really was very powerful. It was clearly visible. Aspedal declares that John didn't seem to have anything to discuss about the subject. The boy asks for time to speak, but Aspedal immediately ends the competition. Raymond was the winner of the second round, and Aemon celebrates. Benjamin shouts that the judge was a big thief. It was absurd, and he yells that the next match should be mathematics. They intended to wipe them out in the third round. Amon responds that they would forfeit, which left the other schools somewhat shocked. As far as Aemon knew, there was a forfeit system in exchange matches. Therefore, there was no problem using an existing rule. Still, Aspedal says that forfeiting a match was a huge disgrace. After all, it was organized by the imperial family itself to begin with. Amon responds that they only had 3 students participating. They couldn't use 2 students in 2 rounds each, nor use 1 student in 3 rounds. It would be too exhausting. This left Benjamin frustrated and disbelief. But the protagonist states that he was prioritizing his students above all else. The students were impressed, moved by what they saw. But obviously it was all a lie. Aemon didn't even have a math teacher to begin with. That's because they even tried to teach a little math to the kids. Aemon started by giving examples like having 5 apples, and Boris ate 3 of them. Then Raymond brought 3 more apples, and Chloe with Raymond each ate 1 of them. Then Boris ate 2 more of them after all that. Aemon then asked them how many apples were left. Chloe raises her hand and says they should kill Boris because he ate everything alone. The protagonist asks her to calm down and lower that murderous pen. Boris stammers because he didn't even like apples, and Ray replies that 3 were left. Aemon asks why, but he quickly changes it to 4 apples. In the end, none of them had any capacity to learn mathematics. Anyway, in the present, they forfeited the mathematics category, and Benjamin announces that the next would be science, one that Aemon also forfeits. Thus, both academies are left with a 2-2 tie. Enero laughs, asking where the director's smile had gone. Wasn't this the victory he had wanted so much from the start? That only infuriates him more. That idiotic elf had done all this so far. They didn't earn that victory. It felt like it was just handed to them. It was the same emptiness from when the Amonith Academy closed its doors. All this because of the suspension recommendation. It had no merit at all. Benjamin had spent the whole night crafting the duel plan, but he sighs. Now it made no sense to fuss over all of it. They were going to be the winners anyway. He couldn't complain now. The final match would be in the sword category, and so they call their competitors. Chloe would face Oliver Basket from the other academy, a sword master and prodigy. Oliver thought that Raymond would be the only one worthy of being his opponent, but ended up fleeing in that sleepy-looking way. Besides, he would now have to fight against one of those annoying kids. In the audience, they shout to throw the brat away with a single strike. She would be crushed with 1 move, unable to withstand even a single sword blow. The headmistress is worried because they didn't send Raymond. Ivanov, who was a sword master and they were to Chloe, might get hurt. Aemon assures that there was no need to worry now. This wouldn't be a real battle, it was just a match. Oliver charges at Chloe, asking her not to take it personally. He intended to finish her off quickly, with just a single blow. It was when Oliver was caught off guard by the swordswoman's movement. She vanished before his eyes and reappeared behind him in the blink of an eye. Upon striking, Chloe earned a point, while Oliver hadn't even understood what had happened. Chloe realized that Aemon had truly been right with his advice. When she imagined her surroundings as pigs, she wasn't afraid of them. Oliver asks what she was thinking, being that distracted, and she agrees it was true that this one was right in front of her now, and he was just a damn pig she didn't need to fear at all. It didn't take long before Chloe managed to land all 4 of her points cleanly. It was a complete shock to everyone watching the match from the stands. Oliver asks if she had fun just getting lucky to earn all those points, but she didn't even care, telling a filthy pig like him to speak like a human. With that, she earned 4 points total, and even Oliver couldn't turn the score. Anerel was surprised, just now realizing she was that skilled in fencing, and Ammon replies that she practically beat Raymond in the exhibition competition. It just so happened that the rules made the results a little more ambiguous. Even when asked, Raymond remained quiet upon hearing this. But beyond that, Sloth had recently taught Chloe more things, and that included the special fencing style of the Field family. Chloe had always been at the top in terms of potential as a swordswoman. If she could learn the Field family's fencing and add it to her arsenal, then this potential would surpass all possible limits. Oliver found an opening and charged at her to attack. Sloth's special training focused on one particular thing, and that was making her fly like a mosquito. Chloe even made the buzzing sound herself now. This confused her opponent, not understanding what that was all of a sudden, and she would bite like a mosquito too, striking her opponent in the back. Even Benjamin couldn't understand what was happening before his eyes. Ammon explains that above all, they couldn't use battle aura in this fight. This was a match purely based on sword skill, and she was proving her worth. There was no way she would lose in a match like this. That's when the protagonist paused to notice the way she was holding her sword, and Oliver wonders what it was she was trying to do now. Anerel was confused when she saw Amon stop speaking and saw him disappear. Then came a scream, and everyone noticed Amon was in the middle of the arena. And on top of that, he was holding Oliver, interrupting the duel, furious. Squeezing his neck, the director shouted in shock at what he saw, questioning how a teacher could interfere in a student duel. He orders the supervisor to remove him immediately, but Espadel also refuses because Oliver had just cheated. He had tried to use an aura blade against his opponent moments ago, and those were dangerous weapons that could take a person's life. To use such a dangerous weapon in a duel meant to promote friendship. Oliver from the Bestrick Academy was eventually disqualified, and so Espadel announced that the winner of the competition was the Amonith Academy. Oliver fell to the ground after being dropped by Ammon, wondering who that guy was. The protagonist went to check if Chloe was safe as the duel came to an end. With a score of 3-2, Amonith Academy secured the victory. Anerel laughed at Benjamin because apparently they had won this time. Or maybe she should say they had won this time again. Benjamin never thought he'd face such humiliation, losing to a crumbling academy. And the elf replies that he should feel quite honored, not humiliated. While Anerel was proud of herself, Ammon thought she was being amazing too. She could keep smiling and shamelessly humiliating the other director. However, to his surprise, Anerel said it didn't feel right to end it just like that. Perhaps they could deepen the friendship between teachers too. And soon they began thinking of ways to make them compete. Ammon wanted to calm them down again because they were getting excited. They probably wanted to go into a magical or sword duel between teachers. But when he looked at the other teachers, none of them seemed fit. Sloth was sleeping, Mario wanted to leave, and Ammon wasn't feeling up to it. So they called the protagonist to the front, and the duel between schools continued. This time, it would begin with a battle between the teachers. But one Ammon would face was Alfred Beers, the fencing instructor from the academy. The protagonist didn't understand why he was called, since he wasn't even a fencing teacher, and Alfred responds that now wasn't the time to be playing around. The way he moved in the middle of the duel was not that of a weakling. Ammon still tried to convince his opponent otherwise, but it was complicated. As expected from Amonith Academy, he lied the moment he opened his mouth. Alfred claimed he was just as dirty as his headmistress. That provoked him enough to accept the duel against his opponent. And Alfred was confused because Ammon suddenly threw away his sword, even though it was supposed to be a duel between swordsmen to begin with. Anerel watched emotionally, thinking Oman was angry because of the insults toward her. But in truth, he was irritated because he'd been put in the same category as the elf. Still, Alfred was ready to accept it and went all out against him. It didn't take more than a second before he found himself on the ground. He was confused about what happened, why he had lost consciousness. Now he could remember. Just as he was about to strike, Ammon punched first. And it was right then that he felt the killing aura coming from the teacher, something he had never felt in his life. Ammon looked like a demon in Alfred's eyes. But even as Ammon approached to check if he was okay, the teacher just ran away in desperation, crying for help. Benjamin couldn't believe Alfred simply lost to a guy like that. He ran off scared, which completely enraged the director. And Anerel asks how Benjamin felt now seeing the difference in their levels. Even her teachers would do anything for the academy, unlike a certain professor who ran away with his tail between his legs in fear. And the director asks why this supposedly honorable school was falling apart. Maybe it was because the headmistress was a true gambler. Then he speaks to Ammon, saying his skills seem of high caliber, and suggests that he could work at Bestrick Academy, which would better suit his role. He would pay the penalty for breaking the contract immediately. Bestrick Academy was the best academy in the entire empire now, compared to Amonith Academy, the ruined school that barely managed to rise again. In truth, this academy might be falling apart now, but in a way, he'd grown attached to the place. It was his workplace. This was an offer he couldn't refuse after all. Ammon responded by thanking him, saying he'd be eager to work there. And Benjamin smiled because, as expected, he had good taste. Besides, it would be better for all the other Amonith students. They seemed to have great potential and talent to study in a better environment. Meanwhile, the other teachers were just garbage, which shocked them. Sloth said he was truly cruel, leaving his beautiful wife behind. Ammon retorted that they didn't even have a relationship to begin with. Mario asked about all the days they'd spent together, and the protagonist couldn't care less. After all, he was always drunk the entire time. He didn't even bother mentioning Bless, who had always been rude to him. Anyway, the protagonist said they could leave now. Annarelle trembled as she called for Amon, while Benjamin was smiling, wanting to know if she had anything to say. They all said it was those dirty tricks he pulled that made her reject his love confession. Everyone froze, staring at Benjamin in shock at the huge truth that came out. Amon thought that now a few things were starting to make more sense. Unlike the Amonith headmistress, who seemed pretty relaxed during the entire event, they, or rather the Bestrick Academy, were always anxious to prove themselves. It was like there was a desperate need to do so at all costs. Benjamin grumbles that it was all in the past now and didn't matter. Annarelle replies that she's an elf, and for her, something from 30 years ago was like yesterday. He had confessed to her in front of the academy gates, in front of everyone. Then he got drunk and started saying a bunch of stupid things. After that, he suddenly started singing at the pub about his love for her, and said a bunch of other nonsense during the date. Thanks to that, Annarelle had funny drinking stories for a whole year, and she said it many times, but he simply wasn't her type. Now that he was driving her teacher into this, he was being dirtier than ever. Amon tenses up. At this rate, he might lose his job at the new academy. He whispers to Benjamin to calm down, he couldn't fall for the elf's tricks, and asks how she could even understand such pure feelings. Then Benjamin asks if Amon, by any chance, had no feelings for Annarelle. Suddenly, the protagonist realizes he had just thrown himself into the middle of this competition, with the director questioning him in an intimidating way about his relationship with her. Amon replies that she was just his superior, nothing more. Annarelle cries, asking about all the promises he made about their future. Obviously, she meant the future glory of the academy and nothing else. But Benjamin misunderstood and shouted at the protagonist for being so fake. Amon tried to explain himself, but the director told him not to call him director. Then he got on his knees and took Annarelle's hands, begging her to forget that man. To be with him instead. He wasn't the same as before. He was ready to devote his coming years entirely to her. But Annarelle simply knocked him down with a martial arts blow, shocking everyone who was watching that chaotic scene. Once again, she rejected his proposal for a relationship and engagement. The director of Bestrick Academy fainted from the shock of his broken heart, and Amon's transfer was also canceled during all this. Above all, Amonith Academy had won the inter-school competition, and the protagonist felt he was truly overwhelmed with problems. When he turned to his coworkers, they were all furious. Mario said he really should look for a better way to live his life. Sloth claimed even bats were more loyal than Amon. Bless added that the only reason he had been fired was because of the potatoes from his homeland. The team decided to go out for dinner together and left the rude traitor behind. While Amon was still begging them to wait, they didn't listen to his words. Even the students looked at him with disdain, since they no longer had to transfer schools. The protagonist wanted to explain that academy wasn't good just for learning. It was a place for their social lives to grow as well. He only wanted to offer them the chance to see a world bigger than the one they knew, so they could gain more knowledge and connections. And of course, Amonith Academy was good too, but there was so much more. Only Chloe was touched because Amon had been thinking about them. But the other two walked away, not believing that excuse for a second. Annarelle expected that Amon had made himself the villain in front of Benjamin on purpose. It must have all been intentional. And Amon smiled, knowing she understood perfectly. At least he was relieved that Annarelle hadn't seen the truth. She was convinced that Amon did everything for the academy and would never betray them. Speaking of which, she asked about his preparations for obtaining the certification exam. And Amon was confused until she said she wanted to promote him to head instructor. After all, he had worked very hard and it would be a waste to keep him just as a teacher. Amon asked if, by passing the exam, he would immediately become the head instructor. When she agreed, the protagonist reflected on it. He would end up being promoted to something greater in just a few steps. He'd be far above regular teachers like Mario and Sloth. Amon was convinced he could achieve that right away, and thus, blinded by power, he only came to understand the true essence of the academy much later. One day after the inter-school duel, they returned to Amonith Academy. At the gates, Rainbow encountered someone who was about to enter. Meanwhile, Kai had made his final decision and went to inform the king. Still, the king asked why it had to be Amonith Academy of all places. There were many other academies where he could pursue teaching. The prince replied that it was a good way to address old grudges. He felt the need to do so after hearing Sandro and Amon last time. Before being a member of the Drake family, the protagonist had declared himself an educator. Amon had a talent that couldn't be wasted by the mistakes of earlier generations. His attitude of prioritizing students was clearly a worthy representation. In particular, it was the essence of an educator fit for this empire. Sandro really didn't want to get involved with the Drake family again, but they couldn't keep passing such a burden on to future generations, and so he agreed to respect his son's decision and wouldn't stop him. Kai thanked him for that, but then heard that his father had one condition. In fact, the prince had gone to Amonith Academy in disguise. He used magic to hide his true face, and only Rainbow recognized him. Kai smiled because, as expected, Rainbow had seen through his identity immediately. His father's condition was that he would conceal both his identity and abilities. Kai explained that for certain reasons, he would be hiding within the school. As long as he fulfilled his duties, he would remain that way. Rainbow was surprised to hear that the prince wanted to become a teacher, and he agreed since he had discussed this with the king a long time ago. So Rainbow agreed to take him to meet the headmistress. Then, Annarelle heard that he was Kai, from the house of Viscount Stroh. That would be Kai's cover while working at the school as a teacher. At least Kai was relieved that they couldn't see through his disguise. NRL asked why he wanted to teach there, and he replied that this was an academy with a long and prestigious history. Kai had always wanted to be able to teach at that school for a long time. The headmistress asked if he hadn't heard the rumors about the academy's recent victory. Apparently, that news had reached the crown prince, and NRL sighed upon realizing that no one had received those updates. Alman mentioned that even so, they had a new member on staff, and that was important. He asked Kai if there was any particular subject he wanted to teach. Kai replied that he had extensive knowledge on many subjects, including fencing, magic, history, and mathematics. He could do anything. Alman was impressed, realizing that was basically an invitation for a lot of work. He replied it was impressive. Maybe Kai really could teach any class. NRL agreed it was a good idea. Many teaching positions were vacant. Ammon grew tense, thinking she didn't need to reveal that much. But Kai got excited, saying he liked knowing there was room for growth. That almost shocked the protagonist. He was starting to act a little crazy. But NRL assured them that Kai was the perfect type for their academy and that he was hired. Kai was caught off guard, asking if they didn't need to assess his skills first. The protagonist explained that their academy was having staff problems. Kai was motivated enough. They couldn't worry about small things. Even if he lacked something, the others could always support and grow together. After all, that was the right mindset an educator should have. Kai agreed, almost moved by how much latent potential they had. They shook hands, officially greeting each other as two teachers. Kai thought Aemon was truly a man of great talent, and the protagonist was content enough. Another newcomer had joined and would share the workload. Amonith Academy had successfully acquired a new recruit. NRL was looking forward to Kai working with them, since he also seemed very motivated to make it all work. She said he could always learn a lot from Aemon. He was an incredible person who always helped others learn and grow. At that, Kai was impressed that Aemon could be so capable despite being so young. And the protagonist asked if there was a subject he wanted to start teaching right away. Kai thought he couldn't teach fencing or magic, since those were family secrets. But as heir to the Empire, there must be something he could do. So he said he'd like to teach history. Aemon replied that that was his subject, inwardly annoyed, wanting to fight over it. So Kai settled for teaching mathematics, and the protagonist agreed. Until his formal classes began, Aemon would show him around the classes and students. The first swordsman class featured sloth asleep and a whole lot of nothing. Aemon would have loved to sit in too, but he was too busy. Kai figured it made sense. He must be swamped with work. Still, he wondered where the fencing teacher for the class even was. The students approached, wanting to know who the new adult was. Kai introduced himself as the new history teacher, and the children introduced themselves too. The prince was surprised to hear the surname Raymond Nemark. Now they understood why the Sword of Azure's presence had made sense here. Anyway, Kai asked where their teacher was, and they pointed toward the desk. He turned, shocked to see the thing on the floor being recognized as a teacher. Sloth yawned and said they could start class, finally noticing Kai. She didn't understand who he was until he introduced himself as the new math teacher. Sloth was still a little stunned that a newcomer had shown up at the school but introduced herself anyway. Meanwhile, Kai wondered if she was truly a swordswoman from the Field family. Regardless, she decided to start the class immediately. But even the swordsmanship lessons left him confused by the mess. He approached and asked what exactly was going on, and asked if there was some kind of structure or sequence she followed in her teaching. Sloth explained that Boris had already chosen magic as his career path, so he learned the basics of sword lessons and spent his free time studying on his own. Even so, Kai believed physical training required consistent practice. Raven belonged to a sword school with its own training methods, and he was even better than Sloth, his own instructor. Kai didn't understand why there still weren't formal lessons being held. That kind of application class was careless and unbalanced. Sloth asked whether he was a commoner or a noble. Even knowing he was the prince, he replied that he was a noble from a viscount's family. Then she asked if he knew how big potato seeds should be. He answered that he didn't know, and Sloth said that's how it worked. You only learned what you needed for your daily life. Anyway, Kai remembered Ammon and acknowledged that he was a worthy role model as a teacher. But Sloth believed it was better to stay away from that piece of trash. Kai didn't understand how she could say such rude things, and Sloth decided to explain, listing all the bad things Ammon had done. Even so, Kai wrote everything down in his notebook as if it were Sloth's fault. And he didn't seem even slightly concerned about Ammon's lack of conduct. Sloth kept ranting about how much she hated him, slandering him to the max. A bit later, Ammon asked how the swordsmanship lessons went, and Kai felt like his ears were bleeding after hearing so many bad things about him. Still, he hoped there would be something meaningful to say about it all, and he replied that it wasn't anything special. There wasn't even anything to praise to begin with. Aemon asked if, by any chance, the instructor had badmouthed him again. He couldn't really blame them. It was his own fault for leaving himself open to criticism. Kai ended up impressed because the mindset he saw in Sloth as an educator and her reputation for skill were actually hiding such a foul mouth. He couldn't believe that such a loud, lazy teacher could be that kind of person. But maybe the magic teacher would be different. At least that's what he wanted to believe. So Kai knocked on the door to introduce himself to Mario, saying he came to observe the class. Mario Rundum was a viscount and a hero from the old war. He was a famous man from a prestigious magic tower, and his extensive military experience should have given him great judgment of character. That's when he caught Mario cursing Aemon as the true scum of the earth, and he wondered if this guy was even qualified to be a teacher. After all, he was drunk in front of the students and used vulgar language. The day before, he couldn't even tell if Aemon was human or a bat. Kai asked the kids if what Mario was saying was true. Kalila thought that if it had been yesterday, it was actually Amon's own decision. She explained that Aemon was a wise teacher who cared for his students. That made Kai genuinely happy to hear. It was exactly what he hoped for from Aemon. Chloe looked at the teacher proudly, thinking he was kind of weird. Despite Mario being a drunk, foul-mouthed man who constantly badmouthed Ammon, his lessons were flawless, and Kai could see he had real potential as an educator. It wasn't the best for the Empire's official curriculum, but they were excellent classes. For Boris, who aspired to be a mage, he focused on theoretical studies. For Chloe and Raymond, who aspired to be knights, he taught basic principles, also that their performance in magic combat could be improved. If Mario could teach well while drunk, he'd be even better sober. Now things started to make a bit more sense to Kai. The two relatively incompetent teachers were simply jealous of Ammon and mocked him. Ammon wasn't someone who deserved to be underestimated by either of them. As previously mentioned, their evaluations were quite low in Kai's view. The last classes of the day were history, taught by Ammon himself. During those lessons, Kai found himself crying from excitement and admiration. He was following the Imperial curriculum perfectly, just as expected. And all the students were actively engaged in the lessons and learning. A true educator like Ammon was just being unfairly criticized. Kai felt he should use his crown prince status to fix this injustice. But he stopped himself. He had to completely hide his identity and abilities. For now, he was just Professor Kai of House Stroh. He couldn't just use his royal status whenever he wanted. Instead, he would fix the school's corruption through his own efforts. Even though he was getting all this attention, Ammon was feeling chills for some strange reason. And so, a week passed since he became a new teacher at the academy. Ammon, determined to secure his position, was studying intensely, all in preparation for his upcoming certification exam for head instructor. While doing so, he was convinced he would pass without issue. The other teachers hadn't even spoken to him in the past few days. Even the headmistress hadn't called on him for any trivial matters since then. So now, Ammon had all the time in the world to focus on his studies. However, he was caught off guard by a visit from Chloe and Mario. He didn't understand why this was happening, especially so late at night. The two wanted to offer a gift of alcohol and desserts to wish him good luck. Ammon couldn't figure out what this was. Maybe they were poisoned? He almost worried they had gone so far off the edge from exhaustion that they lost it. But they seemed just as weird and annoying as usual. Sloth got annoyed and kicked him, to which Ammon responded that them acting strange was stranger. Mario said they just wanted to clear up all the misunderstandings the right way. And Sloth agreed, because they realized they'd been too harsh on him. They felt bad for ignoring him all this time while he was helping the academy. They simply left Ammon on the floor as they apologized and walked away. The protagonist just watched it all, completely confused because it happened so suddenly. There was no way they had suddenly reflected on their actions just because of the school duel, especially not people like Sloth and Mario, who were so stubborn. So he wondered if they were trying to gain Ammon's favor, all because he was about to get promoted, and they wanted to stay on good terms with their future superior. That made him laugh, realizing this must be what power tasted like. Sloth sighed, still unable to believe someone worse than Ammon had joined the academy. And Mario agreed, because Ammon would soon find out the truth about that lunatic new professor and his bizarre thoughts. The next day, the protagonist felt it was a special day. If he failed, he'd end up in serious trouble. But with all the studying he'd done, he was confident he'd pass at the top of the class. Even so, for some reason, he felt uneasy about all of it, as if some kind of reluctance had built up in him ever since Mario and Sloth's visit. That morning, even the headmistress seemed a little down, because no one had applied to join the school in the week following the competition, even though they'd resin with victory and straightened out their paperwork. Even the students were asking for Ammon to teach the next day's classes. It was clear something strange had been going on while he was away. When he finished his exams, everyone was complaining that the classes were too hard. At this rate, they'd end up repeating the year and not even get a chance to take the test. But Ammon was confident. He'd prepared in advance, expecting this very situation. Smiling, he knew it was only a matter of time before his brilliant future arrived. After going out to eat and returning to the school, the protagonist was in a good mood. At least until he ran into Kai, who was extremely happy to see him, and asked if he could eat with him at the same table. Ammon allowed it, thinking that since he'd soon be the supervisor, it was a chance to build rapport. He should listen to the new teacher's struggles or whatever else came up. Ammon mentioned that it had been a week since Kai arrived and asked how things were going. Kai replied that there was just one thing which made the protagonist tense. It seemed like newcomers these days didn't have any sense at all. Still, Ammon asked what was bothering him. He wanted to hear it. And Kai said there was no need to worry him with something like that now. Still, Ammon felt like he was just being toyed with a little here. But he commented that it was natural to face difficulties in the first week. Some challenges were just part of starting a new life at the school. He'd get used to it soon. Kai thanked him for the advice and Ammon nodded, saying he was planning to visit Kai's class the next day to see how things were going. That made Kai very happy, as it would be an honor to have him in his classroom. However, the protagonist noticed that Kai was only eating sausages. Kai tried to answer, but Ammon commented that he seemed like the picky eater type. But there was no helping it. Since his junior wasn't eating everything, he helped out, and he just took one of the sausages from Kai's plate to eat it for him. He happily munched away while Kai remained silent, just watching. Kai's opinion of Ammon dropped, just because he ate his sausage. The next day, during the swordsmanship lessons, the protagonist went to check things out, and witnessed something unbelievable, because the lazy teacher was actually doing something. She was running around the whole training field while singing the Imperial Anthem. Kai was shouting at her to keep going, faster, better, with more energy. Ammon approached and asked what was going on, and how exactly Kai had convinced her to suddenly start trying so hard. Kai replied that he had threatened to report her to the education department for negligence. He was caught off guard, but even so, it was a bit extreme. Sloth agreed, nearly crying from how desperate she'd become. Since Amon was there, she hoped he'd rescue her from that insane routine. But the protagonist agreed that even that wasn't enough. They should probably strap weights to her limbs so she could push herself harder. And Kai agreed, prompting Sloth to growl that she was an idiot for counting on Amon. Still, Amon was surprised because the teacher was doing well. There wasn't anything wrong with the way the class looked at that moment. Then the students arrived and Amon smiled, because the lesson could now begin. But when the classes began, he then noticed that something was wrong. They were all learning the same fencing with the same subjects. Sloth, on top of it, was being quite strict in her teachings. The training in the students' arena was quite eye-catching for various reasons. In sync with the shout of their voices, the wooden swords were raised in the air. It was just another peaceful day of classes at the academy. However, it was completely different in Amon's eyes, who couldn't understand this chaos. Raymond was clearly training with the Azure Sword style, and he didn't even understand why he was moving in that way. He didn't understand the reason for having to train a technique from another family. Boris on his own didn't even know what he was doing and barely had any strength. Kai said he should use more stamina and told him to run 10 laps after class. Amon questions what was happening in these classes because even Sloth was exhausted. After all, Boris wasn't a good swordsman, and they had agreed to focus on his strengths. But Kai then said that none of that was the correct method. All students deserved to train with equal opportunities. Even if their careers were different, as long as they were in the same school, they would receive the same education. He had heard that it was Amon who suggested focusing on each of their strengths, but he didn't believe any of that was right. As a teacher who devoted himself to the Empire's teachings, and an exceptional one, there was no way someone like him would oppose that kind of attitude. Amon was visibly irritated, to Kai's surprise. He asked Raymond to return to his original training. He could forget about the field family techniques. Mixing the two would only confuse him. Boris could take a break and read his magic books as usual, and Sloth maybe should go back to her sleeping bag, which caught her off guard. But Amon said she couldn't teach if she was that tired. Chloe should agree, but Sloth didn't understand what his problem was. Maybe he really did care about his coworkers. She got a little emotional and decided to go back to rest, all happy. Chloe would also need to take a break after working so hard. Kai then questioned what the protagonist was doing now, but Amon himself asked what Kai thought he was doing there. He tried to explain that this was equal teaching, but it didn't seem like it at all. Kai stated that all students deserve the same opportunities, but Amon laughed at those words and the excuse he was giving. If people were all different, teaching them the same things wouldn't help at all. And he asked if he could really teach a frog to fly just because a bird did. Education shouldn't be about equality, but rather about being fair. Kai said that imperial education had guidelines that differed from that. Only equal education could guarantee the Empire's future. Amon then said they should play a little game about equality between them. The rules would be quite simple. They would take turns attacking each other, and they would use the wooden sword to make it work. They couldn't dodge or anything like that. With their skills, it should be easy. Kai wondered how a simple person could know about his magical power. But one more thing, Amon mentioned that battle aura was banned, which surprised him, but Amon said it was because he was a common person, and that he couldn't use it, therefore it wouldn't be fair to use in a duel. No magic either, none of that could be involved. Kai replied that none of that made any sense to begin with, but Amon asked how that was any different from his teaching method. After all, Boris had problems with fencing during Chloe and Raymond's training, but Kai still forced him to match the others, as if it were possible. And now he was saying he didn't want to match because it was unfair. Kai ended up just agreeing because Amon was an ordinary person, and so he rushed at him without any regret for what he was about to do. Still, Kai stopped because he felt something about this was irritating him. Amon had never taught anything about warp before to begin with, never answered his questions, and just stole his lunch. Even ignored him for an entire week without even talking properly to him, and now was suddenly demanding these things from him. Amon fell, complaining about shoulder pain, while Kai asked if he was okay, even though inside he was happy because he made him suffer a little. Kai apologized because he thought he accidentally used too much strength. Amon thought that he really wanted to play, even though he had suggested the game in the first place. And now it was his turn to land an attack on him, and Kai also felt the pain. The protagonist teased him because he went easy, but he was still complaining. Kai was unsure if this guy was really just an ordinary person. Either way, he intended to hit even harder than before. Kai charged at him to attack when it was his turn. That's when Chloe stepped in front and Kai asked what she was doing. She asked why the teachers were fighting in the middle of class. And Kai said they weren't fighting, it was actually all for the good of their students. But if it was for the good, they shouldn't be doing this in the first place. Chloe explained how they were always making her learn the field family's fencing, but the style she had now made the most sense for her. So she had been practicing at her own pace, but was constantly interrupted. And the other two were just stalling and making the classes slower. And recently, the teacher hadn't even been paying attention to her movements. And she asked Kai to do something about it. They couldn't keep changing how the classes worked before. Equality and justice, at first glance, seemed very similar, but were different. Equality was impartial, given without advantage to any side. Justice, however, involved judgment. Equality could be important when dealing with students. Equal opportunities to lead each of them to their own dreams, but not to force them to learn to fit into the same educational mold. That was why education for each student had to be fair. Kai reflected on this. Maybe he had been thinking about it the wrong way this whole time. Growing up under the imperial education system, he wondered if he had forgotten the outside world. If Kai wanted to become a wise ruler like his father, he needed to understand the struggles of each person. So Kai thanked Amon for giving him such a valuable lesson despite his ignorance. And Amon smiled, replying that it would be that way as long as he could understand. He should never try to rise above his own authority. He thought he understood what kind of feelings Mario must have at times like this. Meanwhile, Mario thought it was time to start his final lesson. When people started acting out of character, it made others worry about their well-being. For example, a lazy person suddenly full of energy running around. A person who was always drunk suddenly stopping drinking overnight. And that's why, when Mario was sober, he gave very demotivated lessons. Aemon wondered if that guy had really been that sad to begin with, and whispered to Boris asking if he had really stopped drinking or something like that. And he replied that it wasn't really the teacher. He could look closely. Looking carefully, Mario even cried with sadness when he saw a bottle. Aemon saw the horrid scene of him tearing up a book and licking the paper, shocking the others. And Aemon asked Kai if that by chance was also his fault. He replied that, according to the article, a teacher's conduct must be dignified, and engaging in education under the influence of anything in body or mind was wrong. Aemon smacked him on the head because he still hadn't learned his lesson. Kai replied that it was still different from before. Teachers could vary, but their conduct in class should be proper and upright. Aemon replied that that teacher was useless if he wasn't drunk, and questioned if he intended to make him give bad lessons just to follow the law. Instead, he intended to take care of it. He'd just let the kids study on their own. Kai wondered what exactly he intended to do to take care of it by himself. Meanwhile, Mario was complaining about the taste of the paper he had tried to eat, and Aemon asked if he could have a moment to talk to him. Immediately, Mario screamed in desperation with a deja vu that he would get punched, especially because he was being dragged out of the room even though he wasn't drunk. Instead, the protagonist offered him a drink to make him feel better. Mario was so touched he cried at what he was seeing, not sure if it was really okay to do something like that. And Aemon agreed because Kai had approved him going back to drinking. He almost got worried that the drink might be poison for Aemon to be so generous, but Mario drank it in one gulp and immediately felt good, full of energy. But even so, he asked what Kai's problem was. First, he started by threatening to report to the education department, and Aemon understood that Kai must have threatened the other teacher the same way he did Sloth. Aemon said that Mario always did his best in class when he was drunk, and he just thought it was the right thing to do while receiving qualified education. Mario believed he was a good teacher even without being drunk. But the protagonist retorted that he should never do that again in his life. After a moment, Mario smiled and said he was thinking of leaving the academy. Aemon was caught by surprise, not understanding the reason for it, and he replied that it was because Kai had recently joined them, and he thought he could take a step back and let new talent emerge. Aemon hadn't realized he had such feelings to begin with, but deep down, he had no intention of letting him leave at all. After all, he would have to take care of all the paperwork alone afterward. It was only because Kai had definitely forced him to stop drinking that he wanted to leave. So he reminded him that one day Mario had said something important. As long as there were students, the future of the academy would never fail. Not even Mario remembered saying something like that, but agreed nonetheless. And that applied to their own teachers as well. As long as there was even a single student in class, a teacher must not be absent. Even if a student grew and left the place, it was enough for him to fulfill his role. And maybe Aemon sounded a little strange saying that. Thanks to him, he was able to recognize and accept things he'd never considered before. He was someone who could inspire not just the students of the school, but also of his own fellow teachers in the classroom. That was the kind of work an educator should have there. Mario was moved by his words. He never thought he was seen that way. But instead of shaking hands, Aemon grabbed his bottle and smashed it on the floor, telling him to stop stalling and get back to teaching already. And so Mario returned to his not-so-sober state and began teaching again, resulting in the creation of one of the greatest classes of all time. Boris and all the others nearly cried from so much emotion after everything, and they simply gave a round of applause with tears streaming down their faces. Meanwhile, Kai's loyalty to Aemon became even stronger than before. The protagonist acknowledged that he had worked hard over the past week, and he was probably getting used to the academy by now. Kai agreed since the food and everything was spectacular. The protagonist had to agree since it was something they could truly boast about. Still, Kai stated that they could be proud of having someone like Aemon, and the protagonist laughed full of pride knowing he could be trusted. That's when Mario and Sloth appeared, surprised by what they heard. It was the first time they had heard that Aemon was the academy's dean. Aemon was surprised that neither of them knew about it until now, and both agreed that they were hearing it for the first time. The protagonist then asked why he had received those snacks earlier, and realized it was because the two were totally out of it thanks to Kai. Either way, the protagonist said nothing had been confirmed yet, but the headmistress had mentioned he might receive the responsibilities of the dean. Kai was equally impressed as expected from such an incredible educator. Even though he had practically secured the position, he was still that humble. Power spared no one, and Aemon, as a newcomer, knew how hard it was. To rise even higher in rank than before, the others would resent him even more. When you look at them, it was clear the teachers were not too happy about it. In truth, Sloth was just tired from practice and Mario just wanted to drink. At that, Mario asked him to offer his condolences because he didn't even know what was coming. Aemon didn't understand what that meant since being the dean should be a good thing. He should have known that the preliminaries and plans were made under blessed initiatives. And Mario agreed, which left Aemon confused about what that implied. Seduced by the sweet scent of the Academy's third-in-command's power, he had forgotten. Performing the duties of what a retirement meant, he would be taking on the high-ranking paperwork. The vice director, Bless, only wanted to expand the cafeteria and increase the meals, while the headmistress was a lunatic addicted to gambling and things like that. Either way, Aemon needed to stop all of that immediately. Meanwhile, Anarel was finishing her tasks for the day. That's when Aemon barged into the room running, and the elf didn't understand what happened. After all, out of nowhere, he grabbed the paperwork to see exactly what was going on. He was worried she might be focused on investing in another crazy race. That's when he stopped to look and froze at what he found. For some reason, all the documents were intact. NRL didn't understand, and Aemon set aside his worries, asking if she was no longer interested in things like races and gambling, and the elf gave him an intense look because he certainly shouldn't think so little of her. Like an airheaded person who had only been the headmistress until now. Even so, NRL wanted to do her job properly, and Aemon replied that that wasn't really what he meant. For some reason, she was still sulking about it. However, NRL asked what brought him to her office this time. The protagonist asked if she didn't think she should hand those papers over to him. After all, he would eventually work as the dean once he received his certificate. The headmistress agreed that was true, but she had hesitated, because as someone who had until now been just an ordinary teacher, NRL worried if she should pass on such important tasks right now. Aemon was a bit surprised at how high her expectations were, but with that in mind, he said he'd like to take on those tasks now. That caught her off guard, and the protagonist continued explaining, because if a regular teacher would take such a position now, it could indeed be problematic. That's because Aemon realized something after this whole incident. Even if someone seemed hopeless, they could still be trained to improve. Just like Kai, who used to be wild, became a kind-hearted novice. It was the same with elves. If they prepared in advance, there'd be no trouble later. And so Aemon could take care of the tasks early and keep everything up to date. NRL said he wasn't even a member of the board committee yet, but still he was trying to take these duties for himself. Those words left the protagonist surprised because something felt off, but NRL just happily agreed to let him handle things, thanking him because he always dedicated himself so much to the academy. His proactive attitude was always ready to be a true model. Aemon thought she was indeed very easy to deal with after all. But he agreed because it really was good to be an inspiration to all the teachers. It was only natural for him to do so for that academy. Still, NRL asked if he knew this. Since the scope of operations had been small, she had done everything alone until now. Even if she filtered the matters and tasks of the vice director to this level, once the scope expanded, she would only be able to focus on a broader vision, so she wouldn't have time to deal with the smaller things. In the end, what would matter was that the lighter duties went to the vice director, and the heavier tasks would fall into the hands of the headmistress. Being the case, Aemon realized he would first have to deal with Bless. Now that the academy had officially resumed its operations, the meetings to manage funding, including the guaranteed funds, were underway. After intense discussions with Aemon involved, he ended up exhausted. But it was decided that the operation to manage the funds would be split in half. The headmistress could use it for the future of the academy as expected, and the vice director would handle the present of the academy as well. However, as expected, Bless ended up receiving a full-on scolding. Considering that the operation funds came from the royal family, the amount ended up being significant and couldn't be wasted on nonsense. And even so, thinking that half of it was spent on some idiotic oil infuriated Aemon. After receiving a knock on the head, the vice director asked what that was for. After working so hard and doing her best, was that what she got? And immediately, the protagonist asked where exactly that hard work was. After all, she funneled all the academy's funds directly into that thing, operating to support the King Wyvern's hunting squad when it was meant for the school, and she still had the nerve to call that hard work. Less stammer that a fool who knew one thing wouldn't know another. If he wanted to use the King Wyvern oil to make more delicious things, it was possible. That again made Aemon smack her to stop talking like an idiot. She dared to complain after making such a useless contract. It was quite the hole to fill at this point. That's when the protagonist paused, seeing that the contract was with the Silver Sword Company. That was a company renowned for its achievements during the Great War, as well as conquering numerous monsters and high-difficulty dungeons. But those idiot mercenaries probably couldn't even read. They likely just passed the contract along without even thinking about it. It was like a one-line insult, but not exactly wrong. The mercenary group had desperately banded together and acted like that, trying to close contracts with anyone to secure better operations. However, this was the commercial city of Amber. The one managing that contract was Count Debel. Bless said he was a noble of that city who supported that mercenary group. Suddenly, Aemon said they should head there, to the place he obviously meant. They set off for the office of the Silver Sword Mercenaries. The next day, the protagonist went to say that the King Wyvern was extremely dangerous, and he was worried about the mercenary group possibly being annihilated in the expedition, so he was advising them to drop this request. The man, the leader of the mercenaries named Mate, listened in silence. Then he started laughing, wondering what Aemon meant by trying to bargain. But it didn't seem like Aemon knew anything about the mercenary group, and he replied that actually he knew all about them, because they were a group of mercenaries that stood out during the Great War. They conquered the Great Labyrinth Azurai and defeated numerous monsters, like the Serpent and also the Kraken, which were their greatest feats. It was the kind of story everyone should know about this group. Mate grew curious because Aemon said they still wouldn't be able to win, and asked if he even knew anything about the King Wyvern. The protagonist retorted that of course he knew. It was from the Arma Mountain. Immediately, Mate said only a few dangerous monsters lived there, and the protagonist got irritated because it sounded like he was calling him and the others beasts. It just happened to be a place with many monsters. People lived there too, and quite well, for the record. Either way, the King Wyvern was a truly dangerous creature. It was comparable to the Great Drake, and Mate spit out his drink at that. When he started laughing loudly, Aemon didn't understand why. It was because the Great Drake was a legendary monster that only appeared in fairy tales. This was the first time he saw someone joke about breaking a contract. Now he understood, he would cancel the contract immediately. The others didn't understand why that had been easier than expected. Les asked him to wait, and Aemon wanted to know about the deposit that was made. Mate said that since it had been quite a while since the deposit was made, he couldn't return the full deposit at this point. But beyond that, there was a penalty and termination fee for breaking the contract. And the amount of money to be paid was so high Aemon screamed out loud, which made him smack Bless and called her a crazy vice director. All the operation funds, all the money, had been spent on that stupidity. Anyway, Mate said that if he still had objections, he was free to hire a lawyer. Ammon asked if they still intended to hunt the king wyvern. If their group ended up wiped out, no one could retrieve the funds. Mate laughed, saying the protagonist was underestimating them way too much. Mate stated that their mercenary group had hunted dozens of notorious drakes. Ammon replied that they were nothing more than prey in front of a king wyvern, which only made the leader more curious, asking if he had even seen one to begin with. And the protagonist replied that he was speaking because he truly knew what they were like. He saw several of them flying above his town every single day. But since he was so worried, Mate suggested he could join the group and help. Ammon considered that if the mercenary group got wiped out, the money would go with him too. In that case, the protagonist asked when they planned to depart, and Mate said it would be that night. They would camp near its nest, where the king wyverns rested, and attack at dawn with everything they had. Either way, Ammon stated that both he and Bless would join them. Mate laughed, hoping he wouldn't regret saying things like that. After all, it was going to be a pretty dangerous journey. Later, they regrouped, with Mate leading the entire group as they moved quickly. They raised the banner of the mercenary group and prepared to attack. On the way to their destination, they would encounter monsters of considerable strength. And above all, near the nest of king wyverns, they would be flying through the skies. They could take them down one by one and recover as many costs as possible. But even now, Bless was complaining that she was hungry. Ammon was in disbelief. She had just eaten a little over 10 minutes ago. And she complained that it was only a piece of bread, even if it had been several thinnings. Changing the subject, Ammon felt that their pace was a bit slow. Hearing this, Mate responded that it would take an entire day to reach the destination. Even if they ran without rest, it would still take a while. But with a mercenary group and their mobility, they could get there in half the time. Ammon replied that they would just proceed slowly if it would only take half a day. Though he smiled, Mate was growing increasingly furious inside. He was being looked down on more than ever before by the protagonist. Eventually, the group began to move to the rear and continued along the path. Ammon told the vice director that all of this was too frustrating. They could simply rush ahead and pass them, but Bless was low on energy from hunger. So the protagonist laughed. He didn't expect her to be so much weaker than the headmistress. And he asked if dark elves were really that inferior to regular elves. Right away, Bless told him not to compare her to that pale elf, and Ammon laughed because it was ridiculously easy to convince her otherwise in the blink of an eye. In the next instant, she took off running, and the protagonist couldn't even catch up to her. Even the other mercenaries were left confused, because the two of them ran so fast they looked like the wind. Ammon commented that she was impressive when running, and she laughed proudly. He was an ignorant human. Dark elves were a nocturnal clan to begin with, but Ammon proved to be faster, which forced her to push herself even harder. Bless was too hungry and ended up stumbling and falling to the ground. Meanwhile, a guild member told Mate that the visitors had vanished. They were supposed to be at the rear, but weren't, and they wanted to go look for them. Mate replied that they were probably just tired. He had already told them they'd be left behind if they didn't hurry, so they might as well leave them behind if that were the case. Suddenly, they stopped when they heard a noise and wondered if it was the king wyvern. Mate soon found Bless lying on the ground, unconscious after running. Meanwhile, Ammon had quickly arrived at the king wyvern's nest. With that size, it looked as tall as a watchtower. And above all, there was that potential fortune right before him. Every part of a wyvern could be sold for an enormous amount of money. Even in the Arma territory, they crafted gear using wyvern parts. But since there were so many monsters around, the gear would break easily. However, if you got a wyvern in a big city, you could sell every part of it. It involved the wings, head, horns, legs, and tails. There were many shops, so prices could be sold at any value desired. Now that they could capture regular wyverns, Ammon planned to make a fortune. Right away, he jumped and landed a punch square on a wyvern's head. The others screamed, irritating the protagonist, who was annoyed that they were laughing. This was his future, and Ammon started punching them with his bare hands. He took down 3 of them, while calling for the rest to come at him again. But to his surprise, none of them even moved to attack. And then the rest suddenly flew away quickly after the 3 were down, just running because he defeated 3 of them. They were all complete cowards. Ammon shouted that their loyalty was truly pathetic, calling them cowards. Meanwhile, Mate realized the wyverns seemed very close now. In fact, they were almost at the nest, and it was a good time to take a break. The mercenaries would eat some rice balls while that happened, and Bless lunged at them to eat in under a second. While that chaos was going on, the protagonist was completely lost. The wyverns he knew used to be extremely aggressive monsters, and they would relentlessly attack humans with full force. Even so, Ammon had only managed to take down 3 of them after being there all night. Suddenly, he heard shouts that they had arrived at the king wyvern's nest. The protagonist waved to Mate as soon as he saw the group arriving, and Mate was surprised because he saw him there, thinking he would have died already. And Ammon replied that he went ahead first, which caught him off guard, wondering who exactly that guy was to begin with. From what he could see, Ammon was neither a swordsman nor a mage, and still he was surprised to find he had taken down a wyvern too. Mate said they would prepare to camp and that Ammon should get some good rest. After giving a few members time to recover, they would get ready to attack as soon as dawn broke. Ammon understood and asked if they had seen the vice director, and they showed that they had tied up Bless after all the chaos she caused. It couldn't be helped. Bless even tried to eat one of their members. Ammon understood and wondered if dark elves normally did things like that. Either way, they decided to spend the night there until the king wyverns returned. And so many hours passed, they waited at the nest for almost an entire day. Suddenly, they heard the sound of a wyvern arriving after so long. But before they realized it, the wyverns grabbed Ammon and flew off with him. The protagonist screamed for someone to do something while the others just watched. But Mate just laughed, saying that, as he mentioned before, their mercenary group was the strongest in the Empire. Then they rescued Ammon and told him to leave everything in their hands now. The Silver Sword mercenary group would attack with all their might. Everyone charged at the king wyvern to bring it down once and for all. but then they were shocked when their spears shattered with just one hit. Aemon thought it was obvious. After all, the monster's teeth were the main ingredient. That shield could block almost anything. In that moment, they all started running and screaming for help, thinking they were going to die. And the protagonist wondered if they really were the best mercenary group in the Empire. They didn't even listen to his warnings, even though they were putting themselves at risk. Aemon was getting irritated, unsure whether he should just sit back and watch a little longer. Even so, he wondered when Bless would finally wake up after sleeping for so long. Suddenly, she woke up screaming about the oil, startling the protagonist. She shouted that she could smell the delicious oil, and broke free from the ropes that had tied her, laughing in a strange way. Aemon had no idea why she was acting so weird. Bless proclaimed that night was the time of the Great Lord, in the shadowy land where the sun set and he had to rise. Aemon thought Bless was losing her mind as she continued to make proclamations. She said she begged him to step upon this land in response to her call, as a humble servant who was about to sacrifice her blood. To the protagonist's shock, the sun suddenly vanished. There wasn't even a sunset. It instantly turned to night. Bless's power awakened and Aemon stood up slightly afraid. He was witnessing the use of dark magic by the vice-director for the first time. Meanwhile, Mate had been knocked down even with a sword crafted especially for this day. He couldn't even scratch the wyvern and was thrown far away. The king wyvern was exactly as dangerous as they had been warned, and he remembered Aemon's warnings about the king wyverns, realizing he should have listened. That's when everyone froze in shock upon seeing the wyvern bound by massive chains. Looking closely, Aemon was now charging the wyvern by himself. His attack brought the wyvern down, though it didn't kill it. It just left a crater in its head, and he commented to Mate that he should have listened from the start. Mate replied that he was just taking a break to rest, but the excuse made no sense, and the protagonist simply accepted it without arguing. Instead, he asked Bless if she could restrain the monster with her dark magic. She just growled, so he asked her again to do it now. Bless restrained it with more magic, impressing the protagonist, and he told her to squeeze tighter. Bless enjoyed the wyvern's noises. If it could offer oil, it would be even cuter in her eyes. When she tasted the oil on her tongue, she was thrilled by how sweet and delicious it was. And then she jumped forward to get more, prompting Aemon to shout at her not to. After all, the magic would be undone if she got too close and lost focus. But Bless was too fixated on the flavor of the sweet, addictive oil. To her, it was true paradise on Earth. This forced the protagonist to leap forward to try to save her. Thus, Aemon grabbed Bless as the monster fell, barely saving her from death. She really was something incredible when using those powers, and he asked why she had been so careless. He was seriously worried. He thought the king wyvern might actually end up dying from how dumb she was. After knocking her out with a headbutt, the protagonist sighed. Now there was no chance to rest at all. But he couldn't avoid it. He would borrow a sword and fight. He decided to grab a sword from Mate to face the king wyvern. Aemon wondered if he was the only one left there to do something useful, ignoring that Mate basically didn't exist anymore and was just lying useless on the ground. The protagonist saw the idiot wyvern screaming and crying, hurting his ears. But it seemed like it was just making noise to call for reinforcements. That was fine. He could catch it and still find a way to make a fortune. When he turned around, he saw they were all coming for him. But before he noticed, his attack passed right through. They ran away again. The protagonist plummeted from that height but landed on something soft. He wondered where they got a mattress to catch him like that. But when he looked, it wasn't exactly a mattress that he landed on. Aemon rolled off the thing with a face, still feeling his head hurt. Suddenly, a man approached and asked if he was all right. But the protagonist had never even seen that guy before in his life. The man asked if he didn't remember him and said he was Raymond's sponsor, the student who was currently at the academy, and Aemon was confused. After a moment, Aemon remembered that he was the man from the exhibition who had visited them. Exactly for that reason, he had been deeply moved after seeing Ray's creations. Even that quote where Aemon ended up falling was made of that. In fact, he had made his own private collection with Raymond's creations, and he received his permission to create such materials that became impressive. Then the man asks what brought the protagonist there, and he replies that there were some circumstances requiring his presence. He was working with a client to obtain wyvern oil in the contract, but on the way, since he was already there, he thought he could hunt some wyverns. The battle was actually far from easy. They all fled at once in fear. He didn't even understand the reason for all that to happen. The man laughs at Aemon because clearly he didn't know anything about wyverns. Wyverns were, by nature, very aggressive monsters. However, that only applied to wyverns that were independent. If there was a wyvern king leading the group, the others became passive, all to ensure their safe return home. So attacking the wyvern king didn't make any sense from the start. That made Aemon fall to the ground, remembering that he had taken down a wyvern with his own hands, and he wonders if he wasted a golden opportunity right in front of him. And that makes him scream in frustration after everything. Meanwhile, at that moment, among the wyverns, they had gathered elsewhere. In any case, Lord Devil felt that the incident was unfortunate. He knew it was a dangerous request, but they didn't expect it to be complete annihilation. He was practically crying until he saw Mate's shocked face. Even assuring he was alive, the Lord was quite surprised, because he thought they had all ended up dead after what happened. But Mate assures that no lives had been lost so far. It seemed the Wyvern King had only been playing with them until now. Mate asks why Devil was even there in the middle of the battle to begin with, and the others bow to the Lord, also the sponsor of Raymond. They apologize because they had received Devil's trust to complete the mission. They were supposed to hunt the Wyvern King, but they didn't even know how to apologize for the failure. Devil replies there was no need to say such things. He was just happy that the mercenary group ended up surviving, and Mate is moved by such knowledge and compassion he heard. Aemon just watches that, letting out discontented sighs. He was the one who suffered the whole time, but still Mate got all the recognition. Even so, Devil wanted to address the matters at hand, because the subjugation of the Wyvern King was considered a failure, and they had also failed in Amon's request from the Amonith Academy. In cases like that, it was customary for the mercenary group to pay a penalty, and after hearing so many accusations, Mate was forced to agree. Then Double asks if the mercenary group even had the funds for that, which enrages Amon. They had apparently been broke the whole time. They had no choice, so Devil would cover the payments and the penalty. Shocking, Mate. Why would the Lord do that? But it should have been obvious. To Devil, the mercenary group was more valuable than any money. The men all get emotional and celebrate their sponsor. Meanwhile, Amon goes to talk to the vice director to wake her up. After all, they would receive the payment and also the penalty back. When she heard about it, all Bless cared about was the Wyvern King oil. Without it, she couldn't make her delicious fried dishes. And so, with Amon fuming and Bless running off, everything came to an end. The Amonith Academy managed to recover and also secure its funds back. With that, they returned to their daily lives at the Amonith Academy. Sloth trained a lot until late into the night after everything. She laughed because her father and brother always told her not to get obsessed with her skills. But as a member of the Field family, she couldn't let go of her pride. She needed to become even stronger quickly to become a master swordswoman. But before that could happen, she would take a quick rest. Still, nothing compared to the comfort of her sleeping bag after everything. But before she could rest, everyone at the school heard a loud scream. The teachers gathered, wondering what exactly was that whole chaos. It sounded like a human voice, but it was too bizarre to be human. Sloth agrees it sounded more like a monster, and Mario knew he had heard it before. They all talk until they realized someone was missing. When they looked, Amon was collapsed on the ground in that weird way. Mario realizes that judging by the circumstances, he fainted after reading the letter. When he read it, he saw that Amon had failed the teaching certification exam. Kai comments that it was indeed the kind of exam that was very tough to deal with. However, Mario says it was for the second level, which was even more impressive. Kai couldn't believe that his incredible senior had failed the second level exam. But then they realized he really did end up failing. Yun Kai passed the second level teaching certification exam. This was the first time he had met someone dumb enough to fail it. They keep badmouthing Amon while he could hear them perfectly well. And at that very moment, he wakes up asking why they were all there. They say they heard screams coming from there and came to check what happened. Amon replies that he was fine, he had just had a horrible nightmare. That's when he rushes to grab the letter Mario had taken without permission. But Mario laughs, saying they were all classmates and should share secrets. Ignoring Amon's protests, Mario opens the letter with a huge smile on his face, because Amon passed all the other subjects but still failed the aptitude section. He asks what a teacher should do if a student makes a mistake, and Amon replies that the correct answer was to give a harsh scolding. Sloth says he's an idiot. In those exams, he should have given more polite answers. Still, the protagonist didn't see any sense in that. If someone did something wrong, they should be properly reprimanded for it. That way, they would learn not to repeat their mistakes. Mario responds that it wasn't like that. First, the teacher should calm the student, and then solve the issue and explain the mistake and help them reflect. That was the correct answer, but Amon is outraged. He didn't understand how being gentle would make someone realize and improve. In the middle of the chaos, Anarel shows up to check if something was wrong. Amon asks what brought her to his room so suddenly, and she replies she came because she heard a noise in the hallway, and that he failed the teaching certification exam from the looks of it. The protagonist agrees that was indeed the case, but still it wasn't like taking the position of headmaster was urgently needed. Amon agrees that was indeed true, but even so, he always called her dense and teased her whenever possible. In that case, she asks who was really the dense one now. Amon was completely caught by Anarel's comeback, and he faints again, which makes the teachers laugh at him. Amon had the worst case of teacher stress in history. The next day during history class, Kai was crying while telling the students, because Amon didn't intend to teach them anymore from that point on. It had been 3 days since then, and Kai hadn't even brought snacks. Chloe complains because Kai always insisted and never gave breaks in class. Boris hated how he kept forcing the lessons so intensely. They all thought Kai was the worst, until Kai showed up smiling, asking if it was really that bad. Raiden gets startled and apologizes to the teacher, saying he was just joking. And Kai replies that it's okay just to try harder from now on. But still, it was that frightening passion from Kai that was the real issue. Anyway, the children ask when Professor Amon would return, and Kai says that unfortunately he still wasn't feeling well. He had heard that Amon hadn't even left his own room recently. Still, Kai continued the lessons, even knowing it wasn't going well. The children wanted to help Amon recover quickly from his shock. Chloe decides they should visit him, and Ray agrees it was a good idea. Seeing his face would make Amon happy immediately. She replies that with that weird doll of his, he'd probably just get even sicker. Putting their fight aside, Boris mentions they should all visit him, and he suggests they could buy a gift to help. His mom always said it was rude to visit someone without bringing something. Clove asks how much money they all had if they pulled it together, until they realized they had a very small amount in total. But Clove says not to worry, she had money. It was all the money she got from the previous competition, 13 gold coins. Everyone celebrates, but Raymond seemed especially downcast. His grandfather said that money and fame could always corrupt the soul, and could be thrown in the river immediately. That's why he never kept wealth. They ask if Chloe intended to use her prize money to buy the gift, and she replies no, she wanted to multiply it. Amon could just wait. They knew Amon's room had to be somewhere nearby. Since he hadn't left his room, the kids believed he must still be inside. That's when they saw Mario being thrown out of the room with a scream. He saw the children approaching, asking what had happened. They all wanted to give Amon a gift, but didn't know his preferences. Mario asked them not to go in yet because Amon was very furious. Every time he saw someone, he threw punches, especially at Mario, who provoked him. All because he failed his teaching certification exam. All the children looked at Mario with the same thought. It was obvious that Mario would stress someone out after provoking them so much. Instead, Mario comments that it was touching how much they were thinking about him. Chloe asks if he knew what kind of thing Amon might like, and he replies he had no idea about his preferences. But he knew Amon wasn't the type to care about the price of a gift. They could think of something heartfelt, made with sincerity. In the end, Mario was completely useless saying those things. It didn't take long before they ended up in a strange place. They found themselves in a battle arena, and Mario went off to drink. He seemed against it, even though he looked happy with drink in hand. Chloe thought it was a good idea to bring Mario after all. He served as their entry into the bar and kept things discreet by drinking. The plan was perfect, and Boris asks what the next step was. Chloe says they would fight for money, just like Amon did last time. In a way, it meant getting involved in betting. There wasn't much else they could do. They'd suggest that Raymond could go first, but he wanted to finish eating. It didn't take long for Boris to suggest that Chloe should go first, because Boris hadn't been practicing much with his fencing lately. The girl agrees it makes sense and asks if he was scared. That caught him off guard, but Chloe was teasing him for being a coward. He stammers that it wasn't like that. He was never afraid of any of it. But Chloe tells him to prove it if that was really the case. If he wasn't scared, he could just go in and prove himself. Boris thought he was just lucky the last time he got involved in a competition. There was no way he could win against any of those adult fighters. Still, Chloe pressures him to choose between fighting or running away. And finally, he's forced to go in while she bets a gold coin on him. The adults were confused to see a child inside the arena, and she says she was at the table with Mario, who was just her excuse to get in. Her uncle was very drunk and asked her to place a bet on his behalf. That convinced them, but then one man gets confused because Viscount Rumdon was there. The name Boris also seems somewhat familiar to him. That clearly seemed like a high-risk individual to the man. He was worried and nearly ready to report all of them for being dangerous. In front of him, he was almost sure that the girl had to be Chloe. But she herself didn't understand why she was getting that much attention. Even so, he smiles and ends up letting them into the competition. Meanwhile, the man who was about to place a bet was very excited and tells Dexon to show them what they were made of in this fight. Dexon replies to his master that he wanted to avoid a duel with the boy Boris. The master asks if he was afraid of just a mere child, and he replies that it wasn't just any ordinary child actually, because Boris was the ball breaker, and all the fighters were terrified of him. Dexon still had nightmares about the day Boris defeated his opponent, and he wanted to have a happy family with a wife someday. That's why he would avoid fighting the boy at all costs, even if it broke him. Either way, a special duel was announced to take place. Dexon was sent in. They called him the Fixer because he handled things quickly. Dexon was to face Raymond, who was ready to teach the guy a lesson. If he interfered in adult matters, he'd make sure he learned from it. Raymond asks if it's okay to use a sword like that, and Dexon laughs. Usually the rule was no weapons, but this was a special match. In that case, he uses his sword too, even with an aura blade. And immediately, Dexon runs off in desperation because Raymond was a sword master. For some reason, there were far too many dangerous people in that place, and he ran away in a panic, screaming for help just to survive. Even the referee was confused why Dexon tried to flee for his life, and Raymond won before the battle could even begin. They all earn a lot of money, and Chloe is happy because she knew it would work. He knew it was smart to bet 10 gold coins on Raymond, and that guy was quite famous, so they paid 4 times more for him. Raymond asks why he was famous, but Chloe had no idea. Instead, they decide they should start thinking about a gift for Amon. Mario yells that it could be alcohol, but no one pays attention to that. Boris suggests that a new history book for the class might be good. Chloe replies that Boris really worried her talking like that. Even though they were the same age, she was acting more mature. But thinking about it more, Chloe says it was actually pretty obvious. If a sick farmer were given a sack of potatoes, they feel bad. It would feel like they were being rushed back to work before they recovered. Boris better understood what Chloe was trying to say at that point. They should give Amon something that wouldn't make him feel bad about his job. But Chloe counters that the gift should be truly expensive. A history book didn't cost much, and if it was something like that, it wouldn't be worth it. For adults, the value of the gift was what really mattered. Even Mario didn't know where she got such harsh words from. Chloe simply asks him to leave because she didn't want to hear any more bad advice. Then she asks Raymond what he thought would be a good visit gift. She immediately regrets it when he suggests giving a doll. Chloe gets worried because none of them were even remotely useful in making it work. It seemed like she had no other choice at this point. She would have to show them how to make a proper gift decision. Time passes, but Amon was still trapped in his dreams. He dreamed of being recognized for fully serving the academy. He nurtured the Empire's future and overcame many difficulties with good results. As a reward, they were going to bestow him with a new honor and title. From now on, his title would be Idiot, and suddenly all of his coworkers appeared, calling him that over and over. Even Anarel showed up with that mocking face, calling him an idiot. And Amon woke up screaming in rage, wanting to kill them all with his own hands. When he saw the door open, he asked who it was and saw his students. They asked if they could have a moment to talk. Amon agreed, then looked on, somewhat shocked to see they'd brought a well-made gift. Actually, it was wrapped by Raymond, with that creepy doll face of his. It didn't even need to be said. Amon could tell just by looking. Anyway, Boris says they all bought it together, and Chloe paid for most of it at once. But to their surprise, Amon was impressed by the gift. A premium pen, a model known to be worth 30 gold per piece. It was known as the Golden Horizon, said to be firm and durable. As strong as the teeth of a wyvern king and able to last a long time. It was truly a thoughtful and impressive gift. Eamon hugs the children, deeply grateful for the gift. He loved it. Raymond says he just needed to get better already. Amon agrees, saying he'd recover quickly so he could teach again. The children knew he must be tired and left him to rest in his room. Amon had never thought he'd receive a pen like that in his life. In the end, the only ones he could truly count on were his students. That's when he froze, seeing his pen break right before his eyes. When he looked closer, he realized the pen was actually a fake. Even the writing was coming off in his fingers, which meant those kids had done all that, even with the fake gift. Amon was in disbelief, having put his faith in them only for this to happen. Kai never expected his senior to be acting like this for so long, but it's not like he could interfere in the outcome of the exam. While wondering what to do, Raymond shows up to see what he was doing. He had seen Kai sighing deeply nonstop until now, and Kai says he was worried about Amon actually. Raymond agrees. Amon had been bedridden for several days since then, so Kai had been teaching history in his place for a few days. But seeing how the students were acting, he felt it wasn't right. Even Raymond could tell the kids were exhausted. Kai asks if there might be a way to help Amon regain his energy. Then Raymond mentions that when he offered to take Amon as his disciple, Amon seemed really happy and volunteered to work immediately. He showed his aspirations as a martial artist and smiled brightly. As a crown prince, Kai should learn a variety of fencing styles, so he suggests that he give Amon a few fencing lessons now. That made him ask about Raymond's own style of teaching he could offer, and he agrees that being a teacher was essentially about giving academic lessons. His love for knowledge surpassed that of any ordinary person. If Amon embarked on an unfamiliar path, his motivation would naturally return. Still, Raymond couldn't say it was part of his own teaching method. Kai was confused as to why he couldn't do that, and Raymond replies with a smile that it was because he didn't want to pressure Amon. Kai was touched, realizing Raymond was truly that noble despite his reputation. And the man laughs, saying he felt complimented by the praise. In truth, he just wanted Kai to grow closer to his disciple. That's how Kai ended up asking Amon if he wanted to learn fencing from him. The protagonist didn't understand anything, as it was all so sudden. But Kai insisted, saying a teaching license wasn't everything for a teacher. Ignoring those words, Amon just told him to leave his room with an irritated look. Kai stayed outside when Raymond approached, asking him not to get so discouraged. It seemed Amon just needed a bit more time to recover. But what made Kai happiest was seeing Amon smile. And he thanks Raymond for that, thinking Amon must be feeling better, even if it was obviously a fake smile, which confused Raymond. The next day, they apologized to Amon for their mistake. The store had delivered a pen that was too easy to fake, but they guaranteed this one was genuinely authentic. After so much teasing, the protagonist was lost in his thoughts, to the point that neither Chloe nor any of the children could get his attention. Raymond appeared to inform him that a letter had arrived, but again, Amon just wanted to leave right away. That's when he saw that inside the sack was a huge amount of gold. Sloth and Mario also showed up, yelling at him to hand over the gold. However, Amon asks how they could be so cruel trying to rob him. Sloth replies that he seemed better now that he had the money. Mario says that actually this was a reward from the Empire's Minister of Education. Apparently, it was all written in that letter. The letter stated that the minister was informing all teachers of Amonith Academy, based on the value of the school's educational system, which had been run under strict secrecy and careful monitoring. They planned to announce that they had rewarded the Academy's teachers. Amon wonders what exactly this evaluation and reward system was. He realizes it must have been under review since the Academy's last exam, when Aspedal, the royal family's supervisor, had been observing the schools. Amon couldn't understand what kind of nonsense that was. Mario asks if he finished reading, and Sloth simply says to return the money. Still, the protagonist knew those two were complete incompetents, full of flaws and issues as people and as teachers, yet they were still rewarded with 300 gold coins. Amon had a good educational philosophy and guided students with strong conviction. Even so, he asks if the teachers thought it was acceptable to receive rewards now, and they reply yes, pointing at the things written in the letter, because it was 300 gold coins for all teachers, and the gold should be divided equally among everyone. Still, the teachers desperately wanted the money. If he didn't hand it over now, he would only suffer. Alman melted on the spot after losing 200 gold coins. Yet there were other rewards besides the coins. There was also a pocket watch with the imperial symbol that looked expensive. That he planned to show off proudly in his pocket, until Kai suddenly appeared at his door, which made him scream in fright, and Kai apologizes for showing up so suddenly. Emma knew he must have come hoping to get some gold coins, saying the minister had sent rewards to the Academy's teachers. He wasn't even properly hired, so it might be a little unfair. The protagonist shamelessly offers him just 3 gold coins. Kai stares at his hand while Ammon asks if it wasn't enough. But Kai thanks him anyway, thinking that, as expected of him, his thoughtfulness and warm heart were truly wonderful. Ammon agrees, unable to believe he ended up being polite so he wouldn't be refused. Still, Kai was happy enough because he was feeling better. He also compliments the pocket watch, saying it really was nice. Then he leaves, leaving Ammon a little confused, because in the end, Kai was all smug even though he hadn't done anything special. The more Ammon looked at the pocket watch, the more he liked it. Plus, he managed to protect 95 gold coins from those other guys. If he could combine that with the money he had been saving, it would be great. So with 100 gold coins, his parents would probably be satisfied. And Errol asked Ammon if he intended to go back home during summer break, and he agrees, asking if there was still no way to do that. The headmistress knew he was just grumbling and putting on an act at this point. She wanted him to feel excited again and asked if they were all going to travel together. But Ammon replies that this time it was fine. This time he had to see his siblings and help with chores at home, and questions why they needed to go on a field trip at all. Errol pauses to look at the leftover tasks and denies his question. While he was away, the academy could easily turn into a restaurant at that pace. At that, Ammon gets up, saying he'd go have a word with someone. pointing out that Bless should take care of her own ears first of all, because she was the one making proposals to turn the school into a restaurant. It seemed she was only thinking about all the high-quality ingredients, expanding the cafeteria and even hiring a new chef while he was away. Les asks how he even knew all that, and Aemon replies it was obvious. He knew everything she was planning to do. Anyway, he promises that if they could take care of things while he's gone, he'd return with 3 sacks of potatoes from his territory, and that convinces Bless. Annarelle had prepared the teleportation portal and spoke to the vice director. She thanks Aemon for handling everything before the trip. They'd see each other again in a week before his return. She watches Aemon head to the portal, thinking she couldn't let him do everything alone for the academy, and he'd certainly be surprised when he returned to see the business proposal she had prepared. Later, the protagonist returned home and greeted his mother. Amon was surprised because she was fiddling with his stored weapon. She says the blade seemed to be having some problems lately. He also checks on the potato field, which seemed to be doing well. His mother says the crops had been doing fine since they last parted. Monsters had also become more scarce recently. That's when they hear noises, probably from monsters attacking again after some time. Aemon sulks, wondering why they return just as he arrives. And right away, his mother offers him the weapon so he can fight. But when he gets there, the fight is already over before he could do anything. Standing there was Aemon's older brother, Drake. Asks if he hadn't visited the territory just recently, and Aemon agrees but says he didn't meet them because he was with other company at the time. The older brother replies it's all right, they had all been busy after all. But now that they were free, they could all go eat together. Aemon is surprised because his brother was supposed to be working in town. Then their younger sister, Amy Drake, says they had been fired. Amon gets irritated, asking what they meant by that. That makes him argue with Amy, who says there was a reason. But Aemon just wanted to fight because she always had that bad attitude. She says Em had worked at the factory store and she at the greengrocer's, but the owner would sometimes offer her fruit to eat. When that happened, she always ate happily, until he suddenly got angry. Then they argued and the situation ended with both being fired. Aemon asks Em if she wasn't caught stealing food, and he agrees, which makes the protagonist sigh. Because the greengrocer should have known better. He owned the store after all. In the end, both Amy and Im were fired from their respective jobs. Aemon stares at Amy before giving her a knock on the head, asking if it made any sense to steal food from her own workplace. She complains about the pain and argues that Aemon used to do the same. The protagonist retorts that she at least shouldn't get caught stealing to begin with. Im quickly asks them to calm down and return, since their parents would be worried. That's when they hear the sound of stones falling from somewhere. It was the kind of thing that only happened when the Drakes were coming. Meanwhile, Cain was downcast because the potato field had just been restored. But now it would take even longer if something happened again. As long as it wasn't the work of a Drake, it could still manage the field. It didn't take long for them to see it was the same Drake as before, and it was charging straight for the potato field. Aemon's axe had been damaged since the last battle. If he could just buy a little time, maybe he could handle the situation. But it didn't take long for his axe to be completely destroyed. He saw the weapon he had cherished and kept at home break in two. Aemon cried over his lost weapon, then charged at the Drake with his bare hands. But really, it wasn't even the Drake's fault the weapon broke. It just became the target. Before anyone could react, Casella appeared. She tossed the protagonist the weapon she had mentioned last time. Aemon didn't understand where that gift came from at first. Then he remembered it was that thing she had talked about before. It was a sword, but for some reason, it felt incredibly heavy. Casella explained that it was a sword made of adamant. Adamant was a very heavy, but also extremely durable material. A mythical metal said to symbolize immortality and eternity. But maybe, if he could attack with it, things might work out. At that, Aemon shouted at the Drake, calling it a potato thief and charging in. Everyone was shocked, including Aemon, when his attack actually affected the Drake. Its scales were harmed by the sword, and in that moment he knew. He used the Drake as fertilizer for the potato field and just eaten from. But before he could, Casella stepped in and asked him to wait, because the old Drake had a life too. Aemon stopped, not understanding what she was suddenly talking about. He asked if he was just supposed to let the creature that caused so much damage go free. She sighed. It was only trying to survive as well. They were also growing potatoes to live on. But if that was the case, Aemon didn't want to back down and let the Drake go. Casella kept insisting he let it go this time. She would make sure it didn't return, and she'd speak with it. Aemon realized that Casella had always been close to his father for a long time. And besides, Casella was a dragon and could communicate with the Drake. It wouldn't be wise to go against her request too stubbornly, so Aemon sighed and finally agreed to her request. Casella immediately ordered the Drake to disappear and never show up again. The Drake grumbled and Casella was shocked it even dared to talk back. She then threatened that if it returned, it'd be eating dirt instead of potatoes. That was enough to make it leave, while Casella asked Aemon to understand its situation too. Aemon wondered what kind of situation a monster could possibly have. Casella replied that they could talk about it while walking. As he should know, Drakes were a race that had fallen from an ancient competition. They once competed with dragons, but were ultimately defeated and cast out. Though they lost their intellect and became mere monsters, the fact that they once rivaled dragons in ancient times hadn't changed. That Drake had lost its mother when it was still very young. Casella had found it crying alone after that loss. Maybe that's why it had been following her for so long. Recently, it had grown from a common Drake into an old Drake. At the very least, she wanted to prevent it from losing its life. Aemon asked if it wouldn't make more sense to raise and take care of it. She replied that she'd love to, but she already had countless blood relatives to care for. Besides, she had a friend keeping an eye on it recently. He was from the Amaranth family. Though young, he was very intelligent. His future was full of promise and potential. The protagonist could understand. She spoke with such detail. Then Casella said she was planning to entrust it to a Monolith Academy. Aemon froze, not understanding what she meant, and questioned her decision. Was she really placing a dragon at the academy? But Casella was confident in what she was saying. After all, a Monith Academy was a prestigious institution in Imperial history. Even for a dragon to study there, it was a worthy environment. Elman pointed out that it was still an academy exclusively for humans, to which Casella countered that the headmistress was an elf, and Ammon explained about the students. That's when she explained that the dragon usually took human form too, so there was no reason to worry about that now. If it hid its dragon aura, it could keep its identity safe. The place was already chaotic enough being full of humans, but now putting a dragon into that mix just made Ammon sigh. Even for a young dragon, one mistake could accidentally destroy the academy. Still, when he reflected on it, it wasn't such a bad idea. So he agreed to let the dragon be enrolled, which made Casella pleased. That was the answer she had wanted from the start. Anyway, Amon remembers that to enter the academy it was necessary to pay. She replies that she didn't have a hobby of keeping human gold. But with a snap of her fingers, a giant gold stone appears. When the protagonist thinks about it, it seemed more than enough. Inside, he wanted much more than that, and Casella snaps her fingers to give more gold. Now it should be more than enough, and Ammon immediately agrees. He would take responsibility and prepare the dragon's emission procedure. Now that it was vacation time, he could teach him around the end of summer. Watching in secret, Amy was listening to the entire conversation. That night, the protagonist was all happy finishing marking the gold he received. Their territory had finally secured enough goods to prosper. But then the protagonist screamed in fright when Amy appeared. Ammon remembers that she should be asleep at that hour so she could grow. However, she wanted to know what he was doing in the middle of the night. She nervously smiles, saying she had something to tell him. But Ammon immediately refuses, even though Amy had barely said anything. And she asks if she could enter the academy where he was a teacher. Ammon turns away, denying it because she should find a different academy. Amy doesn't understand why it would be easier to go to the Amonith Academy. He replies that it was a place full of idiots and didn't need one more there. But for some reason, Amy was still determined to insist on the matter. Then Ammon sighs, commenting that he was just joking. It was because he knew she would struggle in class, but he didn't say it because it was confidential. She doesn't understand why, if Ammon was a teacher, she thought she could get good grades. The protagonist wonders when she became even smarter than that. Amy thinks that even though he's her brother, Ammon is painfully ugly. But she keeps talking so her brother would allow it because she wouldn't be a bother. She really wanted to do well in class and would pretend she didn't even know him. After thinking for a bit, Ammon considers that she would have plenty of free time, especially since she had been fired and he, the second son, had no inheritance rights. So he entered the academy as a teacher looking for work. Meanwhile, his sister was never devoted to her studies before. Everything she did always ended up going wrong, but having a diploma could help her in the future. For now, Ammon replies that they could think positively about it, but they needed to ask their parents for permission first, and she smiles happily. Thinking about it, the protagonist feels that maybe there's hope for the academy. And so Amy's admission to the academy was duly approved. Their parents were very happy about it because she would be studying at such a school. While helping with the territory's affairs, Ammon had a decent job, and the day to return from their summer vacation finally arrived. But when he returned, he found the doors locked and tightly shut. No wonder the principal didn't come to pick them up, and Ammon had to ask Casella for help. Still, that situation didn't feel very familiar to him. When he turned around, he found the guy who used to fix the school at the very beginning. Then Ammon asks why it's closed, maybe a remodeling. But then the man looks confused and the protagonist freezes in shock, because the academy with its investments lost all its money and went bankrupt. The protagonist ran to the principal's office to ask what happened, wanting to know from Anarol what kind of bet she made to lose everything this time. Then she shows the project she had been invested in recently. But then Ammon realizes it was the document related to the king's mango farm, even though that place had already been ruined some time ago. Then she shows the Belslime project and the reclamation lands, also commonly known as the lands of the unknown frontier. It was a remote area comparable to the Arma Mountains, and even there, where there were many monsters, there was fertile land, being a region with enough development and value. Beyond that, the project was led by the imperial family of Amonith, and even by the elite forces that were involved. Anarol says that Antonio was the one who guaranteed that this project would be a success, so they invested all the academy's operating funds and the guild's money there. Alman was in disbelief at how stupid that woman was, but above all, he couldn't understand how it ended up failing. After all, it didn't seem like a project that should fail so quickly, and she says that in fact a meteor fell in the region and it was annihilated. The lands were devastated and became unusable. Antonio also fell ill. After hearing that the business failed, the Merchants Association came and took everything. The protagonist approaches and Anarol shrinks in fear, thinking she would get a flick on the head. But instead, he asks her to calm down. As the pillar of the academy, the principal couldn't break so easily. She gets a bit emotional from hearing that kind of thing from him. But Amon shifts his attention and asks where the others are. Mario was summoned to the Mage Tower and Rainbent by the Empire of the Four Great Knights. Sloth evacuated with the children to the Field family, where they could care for them. Kai also had urgent business and withdrew. Amon was impressed. Les said she would cook something for herself since the boss was gone, and then would return after things were sorted out. As always, that dark elf was completely useless as vice principal. It had only been 2 weeks since Amon left for his summer vacation. They needed to revive the academy somehow for the new students. When no solution seemed possible, Anarol thanks him for his help with the academy. But she was wrong. Doing that would end the opposite without penalties. Before she could tear up the contract, Amon approaches and grabs her hand, asking her to wait. Then the protagonist goes to meet with Delmans, the merchant manager. He was happy to take the gold offered, but Amon stopped him, because that was for collateral repair of the loan. When Delmans got confused, the protagonist explains that since the Belslime project failed, they must have assumed the academy couldn't repay the loan. But as he could see, they had enough money to pay off the debt, and with the gold as a down payment, Amon promises they would pay everything they owed. Delmans then agrees, asking how he intended to do that. And Ammon smiles, saying he had a certain business he was preparing. Now he just needed to buy some time, and Anarel came to speak with him after the deal, wanting to know if he was okay with using his personal gold for the school. Ammon replies that obviously he wasn't. He just needed to wrap up the business he was doing. That's why he would need the principal's help to make it work. So the two went to work on the land using Anarel's magic. She ended up drying the land too much with her magic, and Ammon asked her to water it again. Otherwise, the worms and living creatures would die along the way. The two continued working the land while the Mango King watched. He never thought he'd see his farm being rebuilt this way. It had been a few months since the farm had been destroyed by a flood, and it was all because of that stupid elf's magic. The farmer was still furious until he saw her and Ammon suddenly appear. He was ready to make them pay for everything he had lost. Then the protagonists said they came to rebuild the mango farm. But the man refused at all costs and called them ridiculous. The farm had turned into a muddy puddle because of them, and everything was destroyed. They couldn't even hire workers to clean it up. Ammon asks about his assets, and the farmer replies that he had nothing. After paying his debts, he used everything to expand the farm. The protagonist saw that he still had some seedlings and seeds stored, saying that since the flood was so severe, the organic products mattered and mixed into the soil, and everything should have been properly distributed afterward. As a result, just fixing the soil could improve its quality again. The farmer was surprised to see the protagonist carrying 10-kilogram seedlings in each hand. But he prepared to plant, and so a week later, the farmer witnessed the unbelievable. That was the reform of the king's mango farm. Even Delmans had heard that the farm had been ruined by a flood, and the farmer greets the manager when they met again after so long. Delmans asks where they got the funds, and Ammon replies from the academy. In return, Farmer A's promised to share 20% of the profits, and would transfer 10% to the manager, thus allowing the academy's debts to be paid off. Delmans was quite happy because that was actually not bad at all. Even if it was only 10%, it was a fairly considerable amount in the long term. Based on profit sharing, they could get even more money at the cost of the mangoes. They finished the negotiation, and Anarel sighs after being so tired from working. The academy's life was extended again thanks to Ammon. The urgent matters were resolved, and he decided to call his companions. But this time, they didn't intend to let what Ammon had done go unpunished. During the summer vacation, the Amonith Academy was barely clinging to life. It was much emptier and more deserted than usual, just like Ammon's head. Anyway, the protagonist still hadn't received replies to the letters he had sent. It had been 2 days, and none of the students or teachers had shown any sign of life. He was actually quite disappointed, and Ammon went to complain to the principal, even though he had written in the letters that he would return before the end of summer. Maybe they would come back on their own eventually too. What he was saying was that there was no need to chase after anyone. There was only one person who couldn't send letters because they didn't know where she was. That person was Vice Principal Bless, and it all started a few days ago. Bless found Anarel desperate and heard about the academy's collapse. Then the principal thought it would be a good opportunity to work and find a solution. It didn't take long for Bless to grab her things and leave, ignoring that Anarel was asking for help in that situation. She had no interest in anything but the food and her time there. After hearing what had happened, the protagonist was surprised. If using magic now was difficult, he intended to investigate Bless's whereabouts himself. Anarel replies that there was no need to worry. She could push her own body to the limit and still use magic. If it was for Vice Principal Bless, she could make things work. It didn't take long for them to discover Bless's location. She was in the Amber Forest just to the south, and they should go find her. Ammon headed to the place, even though it was his first time making the trip. There was a place where one could easily get lost, but then he was guided by the smell of meat. When he ran in that direction, he was sure it was the vice principal. But instead of finding Bless, he found an unknown man. The man comments that he was startled, and Ammon apologizes. He was actually looking for someone else, a dark elf. The man was surprised they were looking for someone in those mountains. Then the man says he didn't know if it was the person he was searching for, but he had seen a dark elf while walking recently in the mountains. Ammon stood up abruptly, looking very surprised, and the man pointed for him to follow a certain direction while being careful on his way. The protagonist decided to go in that direction and then noticed it suddenly started to rain. He decides to enter a cave to take shelter from the rain for a while. Maybe because he had smelled meat earlier, he still sensed its scent nearby. And inside the cave, Ammon found Bless eating meat. The two stare at each other, and the protagonist yells at her again. He remembers that Anarel told him to be careful with the vice principal, because she might not seem like the same person he remembered before. After all, she was the violent type, a fierce dark elf. And at that moment, Ammon saw the change in Bless, who looked wild. It was a good thing he had prepared for this moment. Then he took one of the potatoes from his territory and threw it outside the cave. This product wasn't for hunting, but for cultivation, and Bless ran out after it. After she ate it, she twisted in pain, feeling it in her head. Ammon tells her to remember when she ate those potatoes back in their territory. Then she slowly begins to recover her memories from those days. The protagonist approached her asking if she was okay, and Bless finally recognized him, to Ammon's relief, as she regained her memories. She thanks him because it was all thanks to him, but even as the protagonist smiled, he was still furious when he came after her, wanting to give her a flick on the head. Bless complains because she was suddenly being followed by that crazy human, and Ammon keeps scolding her for abandoning her duties and the academy. It didn't take long for them to bring her back to the academy. Dark elves were like that. It was called regression to origin. Without external interference, they reverted to the past. But Ammon never expected her to regress all the way to the Paleolithic era. Anyway, everything was fine as long as they brought Bless back. Still, he asks if they had received any letters from anyone else. NRL says they actually received a letter from Sloth. She said she received his letter and thanked him for the kind words. But still, as mentioned, it was a reward as a teacher. It meant that Sloth had been teaching the children very well, and she asked if everything was going well at the academy. Maybe there were donations or items from her family that had been sent to the academy. Sloth didn't think she could take care of everything alone and suggests Amon stop by. The protagonist throws the letter in the trash, knowing it was a trap. There was no way a kind response like that could come from someone like her. They were probably missing him terribly after those nights. The students in the Marquesade's territory must also be going through something. Actually, they were doing just fine, enjoying the summer vacation. They hoped it would never end, but Chloe was bored. Then Chloe sent a message to the protagonist via letter. She wanted to know how he was feeling, because she was doing well. But Boris and Raymond weren't doing so well. They hadn't brandished their swords or even read once since then. So she was hoping he could go to the Marquesate and asked him to give Raymond and Boris a good scolding. Chloe really missed Ammon unlike everyone else. He never expected to be called back to that place again. Still, they had cleared up the misunderstanding about the marriage from last time. He hoped he wouldn't be treated badly like before. But Aemon was welcomed with pure rage by Sloth's father and her brothers. Chloe tried to tell the others that summer vacation was ending, and they could review the things they had learned the previous semester. Raymond replies that with his swordsmanship, he could do just fine there. He could play all day and eat delicious food, really. He had gained a good few kilos since that happened. Not just Raymond, but Boris too. He was eating chocolate non-stop. Now she didn't even know what to do. Those two were completely out of shape. Since the position was so high, the greater the pride, the greater the fall. But the idiots weren't doing anything properly. The two were just wasting time enjoying their days at the academy. She was just hoping Ammon would arrive quickly. But little did she know that the protagonist was being cornered by the few family members. Ammon had no idea what that moment of deja vu was, because all of them were furious with the protagonist for some reason. Sloth's father was angry with the protagonist again, calling him vile for insulting his beloved daughter and still having the audacity to speak. Ammon says he saw her just a few weeks ago. There was no way he could have insulted her. Then her father shows a letter questioning what this was. The letter he sent to the teacher a few days ago was written, asking if she was doing well and saying it seemed Chloe would soon surpass her in skill. The protagonist was questioned about how he could still be so ignorant. Ammon realized he was indeed in trouble after teasing her by letter. He had written it to provoke a little, but after all that, this was what he got. Actually, there had to be a way to fix all of this, and he replies that the letter was a way to praise Sloth's beauty. Sloth herself appears, not understanding anything that was going on, and she asks her family what exactly was happening. Everyone was too quiet, and even she didn't know why Aemon was there. He says he sent a letter, but before that, she had contacted him. She had even mentioned donations from her family and other things, but Sloth didn't remember any of that, to be honest. Sloth asks if, by chance, her father took the letter before she did and replied in her place, not knowing the reason why they would do such things after all. But she could understand their concern and asked to be the one to reply next time. Anyway, Ammon found himself off the hook while Sloth wondered what he had written to her. But when she opened the letter to read it, she immediately became furious. She couldn't believe he sent something like that to her. Ammon stammers that he sent a letter before but didn't get a reply, so he deliberately sent a provoking one, to be honest. She immediately pressed him with her sword, which shocked Ammon. Sloth assures that she wasn't attacking. There was something she wanted to show. And she shows that she had finally become a sword master, in fact. He said she would be surpassed by Chloe, but that wasn't going to happen. Even Raymond, who became a sword master, was about to be surpassed by Chloe. Anyway, Ammon congratulates her because, as expected, she had grown even stronger, and Sloth is all proud after being praised. Ammon asks about the students, and she says they were in the nearby annex. He had received a report that the students were being lazy due to summer, and she replies she had been very busy lately, so she hadn't even checked on them. He sighs because hearing that from a teacher didn't make any sense. Anyway, Sloth decides to guide him toward the room they were in, and the two were shocked by what they saw. The two boys were eating sweets non-stop in that condition. Ammon yells at those two idiots for wasting so much of their time. Boris and Raymond were immediately startled by the arrival of their teacher. Chloe was there too, visibly furious with the state of things. Still, Ammon tells the three of them to go immediately to the training area. It didn't take long for the protagonist to see the boxes of chocolate. He hadn't eaten anything like that since he was a child. And yet those two were piling up boxes of chocolate non-stop. When he tasted the chocolate, Ammon was moved by how delicious it was. Even Sloth questioned whether he didn't plan to head to the training arena too. But he seemed more distracted by the chocolates before remembering that. His students were truly a mess. Those countless training sessions had ended up making the two of them useless. Now they were forced to start over from scratch with every bit of their efforts. Ammon keeps yelling at Raymond to hit with his sword, not with his belly. He couldn't believe those two had ended up in such a state. Sloth asks him not to be so harsh. She knew they were on the path to success. He didn't need to pressure the kids that much. Ammon couldn't understand why he was the one suffering in those recent days. After all, Sloth had heard that he had become Rainbent's disciple. The truth was he had never even heard of that in his life. But Rainbent was quite convinced of it now. The protagonist was confused because even though he had sent a letter, it wasn't about that. The truth was he hadn't even mentioned anything about being a disciple in Rainbent's letter. But even Sloth says that Rainbent himself claimed Ammon became his student, and now wanted him to go meet him at the Tower of the Four Great Knights. Since her father was there too, he said he would accompany them as well. Even Ammon didn't intend to let this slide at that point. While he was still shaken, at least she offered him more chocolates. Ammon thinks that if he ends up becoming that old man's disciple, he might never be able to touch those sweets again in his life. The empire of the four great knights had its pillars that symbolized immense power. Each knight had military strength that surpassed an entire legion. A meeting of such powerful individuals should have had a heavy atmosphere. But when he arrived at the palace, all Ammon found was a friendly vibe. It wasn't any different from a gathering of old men from his own territory. Rainbit was even proudly introducing his newest disciple. Ammon just smiled, clearly uncomfortable with the mood there. He said it was a great pleasure to meet everyone else there. His dream was to receive a title and restore his family's fortunes. And the things he wanted to do were obviously money, gold, and power. Ammon's answers left the old swordsman completely confused. Even so, the other elders recognized that Ammon had a strong voice. But Rainbit was worried because his letter saying he'd abandoned the material world to focus on the sword might have been a lie. Ammon responds that he just wanted to learn swordsmanship to improve his stamina. He never said anything about becoming someone's disciple. Raymond still hoped he could strengthen his skills, but even the protagonist wasn't interested in learning too many things, which immediately turned the friendly old men into frightening ones. They thought Ammon was going to treat all this like a joke instead of seriously. He was quite anxious to see which sword would reach his neck. Ammon stammers, agreeing that it would be splendid to learn such swordsmanship, and so he won back the hearts of the friendly old men. Anyway, they asked if Ammon was truly skilled enough to dedicate his training time. When the protagonist showed his sword skills, they were impressed. They couldn't even see his sword movements, and he could cut perfectly. Even the other elders wanted to steal the new disciple for themselves. In the middle of the argument, the protagonist asked them all to calm down a bit. They could at least hear the conditions for becoming someone else's disciple. Raymond says that if he became his disciple, he knew a great place to grow vegetables. And Ammon immediately rejected that idea without hesitation. Then another one. Sloth's father decides to offer a different proposal. He would allow Ammon to marry his only daughter, immediately rejected as well. Then another man suggests the protagonist could learn a different sword style. It was the sword demon style created by the greatest swordsman of all. It was the Great Red, and Ammon recognizes the name. He was the loyal servant of the fourth emperor of the empire who pacified the world with a single word, and he wonders if it was truly the legendary swordsman who even defeated a dragon. The man says that this technique was even harder and deeper master. That's because it could deepen one's madness to the core of their being. That old man was kind of crazy too, to the point he pulled out 5 of his own perfect teeth, and now he was using dentures. Ammon immediately rejected that. Owen approaches, remembering that he wanted money and power, and says she was from the Pandorian family. It was a ducal family that began with the 7th trustworthy emperor. They were one of the most prestigious and famous families. Moreover, it was expected that they would be promoted to a grand duchy soon. There was a rumor that they might even rule over a true duchy. She promised that if he became her disciple, she could even offer him a mountain. It would be entirely full of vegetables, and he could harvest and eat as much as he wanted. If he wanted marriage, her granddaughter was at a suitable age, and she could arrange that. And her family's swordsmanship didn't require perfection or absurd madness. With that, the woman's proposal seemed perfect for Ammon, and he agreed. Then the woman formally asked if he would become the disciple of Diana Pandoria and devote his life to the sword from that moment on. Ammon agreed immediately. Beyond that, she asked if he would eliminate the enemies of the Pandoria family and become deeply loyal as a servant of the empire. Ammon assumed that the enemies of the family were his own enemies too. He would become a mule to carry the burdens of the empire. With that, Diana declared that he would now be her new disciple, and from now on, he would be under the care of the Pandoria family name. As proof of this, she offered him that sword. The protagonist thanked her while the others murmured in anger. The king also showed up in the middle of all this, clearly in a bad mood. He himself wanted to become a disciple of Diana's duchy. No one understood why he was involving himself in that chaos, but even Ammon let out a sigh seeing that mess. Back in his room, the protagonist wondered why things were always like this. Raymond ended up needing to console Ammon after everything, because the Pandoria family had been a loyal vassal to the empire for generations. But even so, he refused to become his disciple again. Considering his bad blood and the history with the Amanith family, through his involvement with the emperor, there was no hope at all. So he tried to become Diana's disciple or someone with good rewards. However, instead of that, he ended up trapped in even worse situations. And even the brats who spent their summer vacation wasting time only confirmed his worries. They would end up going through hell when classes resumed. Meanwhile, they were running in the cold trying to recover. Ammon noticed a heavy energy coming from somewhere for a while. When he approached, he saw that the strange aura came from a letter on the table. It was a letter from none other than Mario, and it warned that he would be dead once he returned to the academy. Ammon realized that his provocations had really been a great success. He had sent a letter mocking him for being a drunken old man, saying there were only 10 days left until returning to the academy, and yet Mario had responded to any of his letters until now. He asked if maybe he had become so decrepit, he stopped writing and reading. If that were the case, Ammon said he'd even prepare a coffin in advance for him, so there was no need to worry. He'd just get things ready ahead of time. And to finish the provocation, Ammon said he drank the alcohol in his room, which enraged Mario enough to write a reply filled with pure hatred. As soon as Mario heard Ammon was visiting the tower, he rushed out. He was completely mad with rage, and not even because he was drunk. The sacred grounds for intellectuals to explore the limits of magic were managed with neutrality, not belonging to any specific faction. A group dedicated solely to discovering the secrets of magic. Among them was the tower mage, who was also known as the hero Mario. He was bound by a prohibition far greater than the other mages of the tower. Now the protagonist was at the mage tower for the first time. It didn't take long for a terrifying Mario to appear, smiling. and immediately lunged at Aemon, asking if he really drank the stuff in his room. He tries to explain it was a misunderstanding. He exaggerated in the letter to get a response. He didn't even touch anything he kept secretly in his room. But even mentioning it proved he had been in his room. Aemon confesses that he at least left one behind, and Mario gets even angrier. After all, it was only half of what he originally had. The protagonist offers him something to hold, saying it was more important. Mario almost wanted to take it and smack Aemon with it, until he saw it was actually a bottle of alcohol. And Aemon offers it to drink, and of course, Mario accepts the new drink. But before he could drink it, Aemon takes it back because he won a promise first, that all the drinking from his room would be forgotten. As the protagonist argued with him, even furious, Mario accepted the deal. And Aemon laughed smugly because he would finally apologize for what happened before. A little later, the master of the tower appeared to ask where all the noise had come from. And both of them froze when the master appeared, shocked at what he was seeing. The master commented that Mario had a face full of blessings on him now. Immediately, he ordered Aemon to follow him. The man said that magic was dangerous, a perilous concept to understand, a discipline that had to be handled with great care. That was precisely why the mages in the tower practiced abstinence, and yet the master caught him drinking. Inside the mage tower, no less. Mario blamed Aemon, saying he was forced to drink, and the protagonist threw that right back at him. The master told them to stop bothering him, that he preferred they just shut up. He would appreciate it if they were more considerate of his preferences. Even if Mario no longer belonged to the tower, he was still a mage of renown. Therefore, such disrespect could not be tolerated. Even with Mario apologizing, the master ignored him. He then asked Aemon if he was aware that alcohol was prohibited in the mage tower. Aemon bowed deeply in apology, saying he didn't know it was such a serious matter, and promised never to let such a mistake happen again. Mario was furious because he knew the protagonist was blatantly lying. When Aemon stood up after the scolding, the master asked if he knew about Came Drake. And when it was revealed he was Aemon's father, the master paused to think. Kingdom had suddenly appeared the previous year. He submitted improvements for the Mana Reinforcement Circle at the World Academy. After that, he vanished. Since it was clearly a first-rate theory, it was reported to the Empire, which only enraged Sandro further because the Drakes were always getting involved. In the end, Kame didn't receive any notable reward. If Aemon had known about this, that guy could have walked a path to success too. The protagonist was just happy enough that the great tower mage knew his name. It was a good sign, maybe his path to success could move forward. Meanwhile, the master simply wanted to recruit Aemon's father to the tower, nothing more. So he decided to get straight to the point. He asked everyone to sit. There was something important to discuss. Aemon ended up being ignored in the conversation since he no longer held relevance. Before getting to the main point, they needed to understand the Empire's current situation. He asked Aemon if he knew the Velsline land project had failed. Aemon agreed, as he could never forget something like that. The elf ended up spending her entire fortune on a wasted project, ultimately ruining the academy twice in a row. The protagonist mentioned that apparently a meteor had fallen on the land, and the master confirmed it as the meteor in question wiped out an entire battalion. The elite mages and troops were all completely annihilated. Because of that, the Empire's operational forces were drastically reduced. The Emperor collapsed from the shock and ended up bedridden. It had only been a few years since the end of the Great War. Although an entire continent had signed a 100-year non-aggression pact, if the Empire, the main signatory, lost its strength, Aemon could understand that spies were probably being sent to infiltrate the Empire. And the master agreed, but said infiltration of the palace was nearly impossible. Knights and military were ordered to tighten security, all due to the most recent incident. So when putting the pieces together properly, they could say that educational institutions might be the primary targets. Realistically, they asked if spies could enter the academy, an academy with only 3 students and 7 staff members. Mario agreed with the protagonist on that point. There was too much room for espionage with so few people in place. Then the master asked Aemon if the principal knew he had returned. He still wanted to drink what he'd missed before telling NRL. The protagonist agreed to let Mario go. It had been a long time, but thankfully everyone had returned safely. Now, if only that arrogant one had returned from the start. Suddenly, Aemon bumped into someone he hadn't seen before. And when he realized the person who appeared in front of him was none other than Kai. He had gained quite a bit of weight, but he still recognized Aemon. His figure, despite the shock, made him compliment Aemon. He barely recognized him. Something good must have happened during his summer travels. Kai wondered if it had really been something so good. Because the king was bedridden, he had been dealing with the duties nonstop, and only when he returned did he finally manage to breathe. Kai had been holding in a lot of stress and had changed because of it. He laughed, saying he didn't even need to mention that he gained weight. Aemon retorted that it was nothing. He used to be slim, and now he just expanded a little. Kai really wanted to hit him for pretending so blatantly. Plus, Aemon hadn't even contacted him once during the entire summer vacation. The protagonist says he was quite busy, even with his irritation. Anyway, it was good to see that Kai was back. If he planned to run away again, he would chase him to the ends of the earth. Kai takes a deep breath to avoid lashing out at the protagonist, and he just smiles when they hear voices coming from behind. Annarelle was accompanied by a man as she approached. She said this was the new teacher who had joined, named Pays. Aemon wonders how much time had passed since Kai arrived, and remembers the master warning them to be careful about possible spies. The timing was just too perfect, but there was no way to suspect him now. Aemon introduces himself to Pays, but he was ready to keep a close eye on him. When they were alone, the protagonist had to silence the headmistress. After all, hearing about spies made her scream in shock. That's because Professor Pays had been teaching in the kingdom of Oslan for 10 years, and she had heard that he was quite passionate about education. Ammon responds that lying wouldn't make someone seem ambitious, and at that moment, he spits out the apple he was eating when he hears what Pais brought, complaining because she was carrying disgusting things from someone like that. But Anaril retorts that it was sinful to throw away fruits that cost 5 gold each. Hiring a teacher in this situation just because he brought fruit was too much. Pais was blatantly listening to the argument but said nothing. Even so, Ammon intended to keep an eye on him to make sure he wasn't a spy. It didn't take long for Pais to try to talk to the protagonist. He invites him to go out for drinks, and he refuses because he had things to do. Wondering if that guy was blatantly trying to extract information from him, it didn't take long for Ammon to fall for his smooth talk. After all, Pais decided to pay for the food and drinks in the end, and asked him to speak more informally since he should have more experience than him. But Pais didn't think so, since Ammon had been at the school longer. The protagonist ended up falling for the new teacher's easy compliments. In fact, he considered that he might actually be a decent person. He deduced it was Pais' first time in the neighborhood and would guide him. But when Pais thought it would be that easy, he was surprised. Ammon showed him the place where teachers usually ate, and found a real wild jungle in front of him, inviting him to sit next to him, and Pais wonders if he was being intimidated. The protagonist really felt like he had let the first impression slip. After all, that school only had incompetent idiots, so having Pais by his side calmed his heart because he was someone different. He was older than Ammon, but his attitude was much more respectful, and all of his impressions were very good. He could tell he was trustworthy. Anyway, the protagonist was glad to have a good person at that academy. But Pais was frightened because he couldn't even read his smiling expression. Ammon hoped he knew how to deal with students too. Meanwhile, Pais wonders if they had noticed he was a spy from the kingdom. He was almost ready to eliminate Ammon because he was more than suspicious in his actions. But it could be a problem since it was still his first day. Seeing that he was brought to such a place, Pais grew concerned. After all, it seemed like Ammon was threatening him indirectly. He asks if the protagonist knew about his background and history. Ammon agrees because he heard about it from the headmistress. Pais says that he recently defected from the Amanith Empire. That's because the internal situation in the kingdom of Oslan was quite serious. He even wonders why he was talking about all of this. Even though Pais was worried, Ammon was bored by the political talk. He had followed Pais because he thought he was going to buy something to drink. So far, he had only offered 1 or 2 light drinks. But soon he was bought again, this time with an expensive and fancy drink. It was a classic, expensive alcoholic drink. Ammon felt like he was in a dream. The protagonist offers the drink to Pais too so they could forget everything. And Pais thanks him, wondering if he was blatantly trying to please him. He had decided to get that information out of him while he was drunk, probably. Pais didn't intend to let himself be swayed. He would mix truths and lies to deceive him. Meanwhile, Ammon was just happily enjoying his drinks. It didn't take long for Pais to be shocked because Ammon wouldn't stop drinking. He couldn't handle another glass, but the protagonist kept drinking non-stop. Ammon was even ready for his second round since Pais was paying. In the end, Pais simply believed he was trying to have information extracted from him. But he couldn't stop there. He would make Ammon drunk enough and take him down. The two continued drinking while the vendor was all smiles. After all, he was selling more alcohol than water. Before he realized it, Pais had spent half of the money he had on that. This time, when they left the bar, Pais was determined. He was going to get information out of Ammon this time. The protagonist was more focused because the expensive drinks were good, but not as good as expected. He was used to cheap stuff. It didn't take long for the two to go to a cheap bar this time. And Ammon was drinking again, this time with Mario. The two were laughing and teasing each other while Pais watched the catastrophic scene. It was the perfect timing to extract information from those two. He starts talking about how he was originally from the kingdom of Oslan, but ended up being cast out from the empire, and the two complained that they couldn't care less. Pais says the reason for that was because the kingdom was in chaos. And once again, Ammon grumbles because he's heard it before and didn't want to listen. The spy screams at the idiots who wouldn't shut up, or rather, he wanted to, but struggled to keep his calm facade. Then he mentions that the reason for the chaos was a spy, and asks the teachers about it to see if they knew anything. Most spies wouldn't even mention the word spy. If someone brings it up first, they're either desperate for attention, or they're just civilians completely unrelated to the case. Ammon yells and points at Pais, saying he was a suspicious spy from the start, and gets confused because he was suddenly accused even though he didn't say anything outrageous. That's when Ammon says it wasn't about Pais, but about Kai. And Pais remembers that Kai was the other teacher he had met before. A spy was a suspicious person who didn't even make contact and just vanished. And obviously, Kai fit every definition of that. Meanwhile, Raiment went to talk to Kai, who was startled when he was spotted. Children usually went to bed early in that nation, and Kai complains about being bluntly called a child. He was just exercising at night and wanted to get in shape, and asks Raiment why he was up so late. He replies that he's been losing sleep as he gets older. Then he asks if Kai had heard about the new teacher who joined the staff. He heard he was from the kingdom of Oslan, and that they had only one hair. Raiment didn't understand how a noble like Pais would come to suffer at that academy. Kai wonders if this guy was really from the royal family in Oslan, because the hair of that family was supposed to be dead. Meanwhile, the two drunkards were grumbling on their own about spies. Pais then discovers that one of them was the famous Mario, the great hero of the empire. He was a battle mage who burned his empire's enemies to death. When Pais mentions the name Red Demon, Mario gets irritated. He didn't think there were still people calling him by that nickname. That's because Pais didn't even see him appear behind him. And to begin with, he wonders why he's working at that school. Pais wonders if Ammon intentionally made him meet him, pretending to be drunk while talking about these things. He really was detestable. Then Pais smiles and says it was a curious nickname. It was a term he knew for great heroes of the Amanith Empire. Pais kept coming up with a justification to ask about these things, hoping Mario would fall for his deception and excuses. It didn't take long before he actually fell for it, laughing happily. Paz was shocked because they kept drinking without getting sick. The two kept pestering Paz the whole time, even though he was suspicious. But little did he know that those two were just a couple of idiotic drunkards at that moment. Much later, the trio left after drinking so much and Pace tried to join them, but ended up unable to walk and the others had to help him. Aemon apologizes because he ended up forcing something like that to happen. It didn't take long before they ran into Kai, who asked what was going on. Pais learned that Kai was the new teacher they suspected of being a spy. He actually looked more like a rich kid from a noble family. But it didn't take more than a second for Aemon to shout at Kai, calling him a spy and telling him to confess his sins. Kai didn't understand anything because he was suddenly forced to talk about something. Pais thinks he could use this to his advantage and asked Aemon to calm down. But before he could expect it, he took a punch to the face from him. Knocking Pais down, the three stood looking at him on the ground, half shocked. The next morning, on just the second day, Pace decided to resign from his job. Anarel was shocked that something like that happened so quickly. That's because he realized something after the events of the previous day, and asks if she would enter a cage with a tiger if ordered to. After all, that's exactly how she felt when she was with Aemon. Anarel tells Aemon to get up because an incident like that happened because of him, warning that if he does something like that again, his position at the academy would be revoked. After everything, it was the academy's fault, and the headmistress agrees to remove Pace. That's when he remembered he had spent all his money on drinks before, and asked the headmistress if it would be possible to reduce the penalty a little. Anarel refuses. She wouldn't offer even a single coin in discount. Then she turns to Aemon, thinking about something. It could be that Guy intentionally made him drink all that the day before, all to keep him stuck at the academy and get evidence that he was a spy. The protagonist just smiles, laughing at Pace and his inability to pay the penalty. It was thanks to that Pace couldn't leave the academy for the following time. With a new teacher in charge of the science subject, they had a new base curriculum. Aemon says they can make new advertisements to attract new students. If the academy flourished quickly, then the dragon could rest in peace, and his sister wouldn't have trouble getting a diploma. Anarel asked Aemon to make sure nothing like that ever happens again. Professor Paz was generous enough to let it all go, but she didn't intend to cover the same mistakes happening again. The protagonist agrees, not expecting her to be so strict. Anyway, they could finally restore the glory of the Amonith Academy. Meanwhile, Pace sighed in relief because he had no choice. He would be able to cover the exit penalty within a month or two, so he just had to work to endure things for a while. Even if the academy's decline so far had been a long story, he should be able to get some useful information to help him. Kai ended up meeting Pace and introduced himself as the math teacher. They briefly met the day before, but he had seemed disoriented. Pace apologizes, his appearance had changed a lot and he hadn't recognized him. Kai laughs because his weight could fluctuate rapidly. Seeing that, Pace thinks that Guy was really suspicious. It was obvious that others would think he was a spy. Kai had to use magic to hide his appearance. He couldn't show himself to others. In the end, Pace thought he was his colleague and rival, even if he still didn't know transformation magic. A young spy would inevitably reveal himself through small actions and words. Then he asks Kai where he was from. Usually, spies avoid revealing their country or origins. If they encounter someone who knows their background, their weakness would be exposed. That's how they usually pretend to be from another country. Pais knew he had to press him a bit to learn more, and comments that the current emperor was a very wise ruler. That's because he came from the kingdom of Oslam and hadn't heard about his reputation. He had simply defected from the empire and was unaware of many things, and asks if Kai could talk more about the emperor's achievements. That's how Kai rambled on for hours non-stop about Sandro, about his achievements and efforts for his empire. Pais couldn't stand listening anymore. No wonder people found him annoying. Either that idiot was obsessed with the emperor or he was faking loyalty. Kai says that Sandro created mana just to make fireworks. His loyalty was obvious by the way he spoke. Maybe Kai was a newly defected rookie spy. Now that he roughly understood the situation, it was time to withdraw. He decided to leave on his own since it was getting late. He thanks him for sharing his interests and stories. It wasn't much, but he offers a token as appreciation for his time. Paz left thinking he should be careful around that lunatic. Meanwhile, Kai threw away the token he received from the spy. Time passed, but Pais couldn't gather enough information. Even after researching so much, he hadn't found a single hidden document. It seemed he had no choice but to get information directly from people. But avoiding the eyes of a beast like Aemon would be complicated. To his shock, however, the first to appear was Kai. He wanted to know what he was doing so immersed in books, and Pace stammers that he wanted to learn more about the Academy's history, to which Kai comments on how focused he seemed in his studies. After all, enough to be so deeply involved in it in the middle of the night. He seemed to have a good sense of direction to know where things were. Then Pace was caught by the guards, not knowing what was happening. Kai says he heard about how he came from the kingdom of Oslam and the royal family. Borrow the name of a ruined family might have been a good idea. But the name Pace Payton already belonged to a dead man. He should have been more careful before taking on such identities. He tries to come up with an excuse, but Kai retorts that this wasn't the only suspicious thing. Not only did he sit there listening to Kai praise the emperor for hours, he also suddenly changed the topic back to his original subject halfway through. It was obvious that he was actually from the kingdom of Martel. At this point, Pace grows tense because he knew he couldn't escape the accusations. So he bites the poison hidden in his mouth in an attempt to escape the charge. But to his shock, Kai used healing magic and treated him before it could take effect. Kai warns him not to mess around or try to flee while on duty. He should just follow him silently, and thus, Pace was dragged out of the academy. Meanwhile, Aemon and Anarel were distracted, working toward the school's success. As expected of Aemon, his love for the academy was still strong. At least that's what the headmistress saw in the way he acted. Then Kai came running in to report the events regarding the spy. He froze upon seeing the amount of paperwork in the room and was confused. The two were happy to have him help distribute the advertisements. Aemon hands him several to get some exercise while delivering them. Now with the new teacher, they could finally promote the academy. Finally, Kai reports that Pace was captured as a spy. Aemon asks if he might have accidentally accused an innocent person after all that chaos. And Kai responds no. Pace confessed everything quickly once pressured. Immediately, the protagonist was disappointed by the new loss they had suffered. Now they once again had a vacant teaching position. Anarel and Aemon grow furious and begin throwing away the fruits they had received as gifts. Kai pleads with them to calm down and not waste food. But they were angry enough not to care about anything, and were even about to throw the fruits at someone just to vent their frustration. Their new target was Rainbin, who was peacefully sweeping the ground outside. Before that could happen, however,